Welcome back to the channel. This is 20 Storm and you are watching first part of What If Naruto Left the Village with Executioner Blade. If you enjoy this video, please like, share and subscribe to this channel. Now wasting no more time, let's start the story.
The wind blew steadily over the treetops, and the night was cold. A lone figure stood on the wall, staring into the forest's darkness while memories tormented his thoughts. He had not succeeded. Failed to fulfill his pledge to Sakura and to save his friend. If he couldn't even save the few people he cared about, what good was his way of the ninja? What was the number of days? He didn't know. His nights were spent just as he was now, staring into the forest, searching for answers, while his days were spent in fits of sleep plagued by nightmares. He allowed himself to stray, thinking back on everything that had transpired since passing the Genin exam, searching for some area where he had failed. He wouldn't let himself believe that there wasn't a chance to save Sasuke. Kakashi and Iruka, who had attempted to teach him everything there was to know about being a ninja, came to mind. He considered the different people he had had the occasional pleasure of knowing, as well as Sakura, who he now understood would only ever have eyes for the bastard. Neji Sandaime, Tsunade, Jiraiya, Shikamaru, Choji, Hinata, Kiba, Konohamaru, Lee, and Neji Sandaime. He lost himself in recollections. Naruto felt a drop of water on his face as he blinked and glanced up at the sky. Konoha was covered in a light rain in a matter of minutes. More painful memories came flooding back, and he laughed bitterly to himself. Recollections of their time spent in the forest joking around with Haku, of their inevitable altercation just because they were on opposing sides, and some of the final words the boys had said. "Please hurry and kill me, I'm sorry that you had to stain your hands, please fulfill your dreams." Naruto collapsed to his knees and let his tears mix with the rain as he said, my dream to become Hokage, to gain everyone's respect, and to never take back my words, my dreams are a joke. I've been wasting my time, what would Zabuza and Haku think of me now? I once thought they were evil, but they both died in contentment, fighting for those they loved most. He thought that to be true above all else, and at times, it was the only thing that kept him going. When he appeared to be doomed, he tried to recall the expression on Zabuza's face when he had fought to exact revenge on Haku while holding only a kunai in his mouth, tears streaming down his cheeks. Love, desperation, and rage had all been present. Killer of 100 and demon of the hidden mist, Zabuza had adored Haku as a son and received more love and devotion than anyone else. Naruto felt the urge to flee as he gazed up at the sky and pondered whether he would ever be able to comprehend those emotions. He leapt from the wall onto the forest floor, which was a little damp, and ran into the night. People would always laugh and say that it was also one of the best, even though he would later view this as one of the most illogical choices he had ever made. At first, Naruto simply felt the need to run without knowing where he was going. He overexerted himself in an attempt to break free from the past. Memories tore at him as he ran for what seemed like hours, the rain splashing on his face. As dawn broke, he collapsed beneath a tree and fell into a blissfully dreamless sleep, but he kept running long into the night. Birds chirping roused Naruto from his sleep. He leaned against the tree and looked at the sun while using one hand to shade his face. The sun was high and the puddles of water from the previous night's rain were already beginning to dry up, giving the impression that it was late afternoon. He got to his feet, stretched, and yawned long and studied his surroundings. When he realized where he was, all the tranquility that his previous night's efforts had brought him was gone. His first encounter with enemy shinobi had taken place here. Under this same tree, he had sworn an oath on pain while jabbing a kunai into his hand to bleed out poison after he and his team had battled the demon brothers here. The irony of it all made him laugh. He had stumbled into the very situations he had been trying to avoid. He wondered absently if anyone in Konoha was concerned about him, but he dismissed the thought right away, reasoning that even if he vanished from right in front of them, no one would notice. This thought caused him to freeze, and he looked at the path leading to Wave Country. There was a genuine smile on his face for the first time in weeks as he turned in a circle and took in the surroundings. Why not, he said to the barren landscape. I could use a vacation, and it's been far too long since I did anything for myself, and it will be nice to see how that brat Inari has grown. Naruto eagerly rushed down the long road to Wave Country after fully persuading himself and carrying only the clothes on his back and 13 shuriken. Naruto was excited at first, but hours of walking had depressed him. He concluded that traveling long distances alone is one of the most boring things there is. He quickly began to play games with himself, such as attempting to jump a certain distance from one tree to another or posing as a potential adversary. However, these were merely short-term diversion, and he soon made the decision to simply run once more. It only took 4 days to get to the boundaries of Wave Country, and it was a huge relief when a depleted Naruto flopped against the side of the bridge that had permanently changed his life. He waited to regain some of his stamina while watching the people pass. The capital of Wave Country was a comparatively small city, and Naruto wandered around it in wonder. It was entirely different from what it had been only moments before. Fresh produce from around the world filled produce carts, and vendors called out into the crowded marketplaces. The city now seemed to be a major trading center. Eventually, Naruto's explorations brought him to the town center, where he was astonished to see a massive stone monument in the middle of a tiny park. It was roughly 6 feet high and shaped like a simple pyramid. The hidden leaf symbol was engraved on each side. Naruto knew he needed to stop stalling after a brief prayer at the monument. He was broke, exhausted, and without clothes or food. He was understandably anxious because he hadn't exactly given Tazuna and his family any warning, even though he knew rationally that there was no reason to be afraid of them because they were his friends. Eventually, he worked up the courage to go to Tazuna's house, only to discover that it had vanished. Naruto sighed and went to knock on a neighbor's door. "Yeah, what I want?" a voice from inside the house said, sounding rather irritated. I was wondering if you knew where Tazuna the bridge builder is living." Tazuna. A middle-aged man appeared as the door opened slightly. He moved out a month ago, got into the trade business, and got himself and his daughter a better house near the market. "Who wants to know?" he said. Naruto used a lot of the truth in his improvisation. "I'm an old friend of Inari, the grandson, and figured I'd visit as I passed through the country." With a shrug, the man handed Naruto the address. When Naruto got to the address, he was a little upset because he had already passed the house earlier that day. Nevertheless, he was impressed enough because it appeared that the old man had done well for himself after the bridge was completed. The three-story house appeared brand new, but it was by no means a mansion. He trudged up to the door and knocked 3 times sharply, now exhausted from traveling. Shortly afterward, Naruto heard a voice from inside the house that he knew to be Tsunami's. "Be there in a minute, Inari. Stop throwing those knives." The sounds of a struggle came from inside the house, and Naruto started to perspire. A moment later, a somewhat agitated-looking Tsunami opened the door. "I'm very sorry, sir, my son likes to play ninja with kitchen knives and Naruto." As Tsunami whirled around and shouted back into the house, Naruto started to perspire once more. "Dad. Inari. It's Naruto at the front door." There was the sound of pounding feet, and Tsunami moved aside as Naruto flew backwards after being tackled and landing rather firmly on his behind. From his seat on Naruto's stomach, he saw a slightly larger than. He remembered Inari smiling at him. After 2 tackling houseguest lectures and 20 minutes, they were all seated in the dining room for a late-night snack of instant ramen. "So, Naruto, what brings you all the way out here?" Tazuna asked. "Not that I'm not happy to see you, but I would expect that you'd be with your team." Naruto once more employed his improvisational skills because he lacked the courage to inform them that Sasuke had betrayed the leaf. He emphasized this with his signature fox grin. "I just had some personal vacation time, and decided I'd come see how you were all doing." Tsunami appeared to believe him when Inari smiled back at him, but Tazuna arched an eyebrow. "Well," Tazuna replied, "you're welcome to stay here as long as you like. As you can see," he was indicating around, "my trade business is booming, so don't hesitate to ask if you need anything." "Thanks for the offer, Tazuna-san," said Naruto, "but right now, I want nothing more than a soft bed." "Tsunami, if you would be so kind as to show our guest to his soft bed," Tazuna chuckled, "we'll let him get some sleep." Naruto was more than pleased to find that the bed was significantly softer than the used junk he had at home when Tsunami escorted him upstairs to what looked to be a guest room on the 3rd floor. "Maybe I should consider staying here for a while," was his final thought before he fell asleep. The following morning, Naruto sat against the wall after waking up before dawn. He hadn't been spotted in Konoha for nearly 6 days. He had returned from his unsuccessful mission 10 days earlier. 16 days. The spot where Sakura had slapped him still hurt. Was she really to blame? It wasn't like she owed him anything, and he had made a commitment he couldn't fulfill. It's not as if she had previously benefited. After all, wasn't it Sasuke who had rescued her ungrateful ass from Gaara, who had fought Haku to defend his friend, and who had kept them safe in the Forest of Death? Where his previous thought had led him, Naruto blinked. He had been abused for years, so it was unusual for him to be this resentful. The more he considered it, the more he understood that if he never returned, no one would weep for him. Tsunade would undoubtedly be depressed, but she would soon forget him as her responsibilities took over her life. He might not even realize Naruto was gone for years because Jiraiya had left Konoha once more. Now he was just being gloomy, damn it. After jumping out of bed, Naruto turned to see his clean, folded clothes on a table by the door. As he hurried to dress, he silently blessed Tsunami. Tazuna remained calm. Since he was the only one up this early, he drank green tea and reflected in meditation. He was at peace, at one with his environment and himself. Naruto then appeared. Naruto sprang into the kitchen like an orange bullet. He called out, "Good morning, Tazuna-san," which made Tazuna spit out his mouthful of green tea and give the boy who had the audacity to be so energized at such an early hour a savage glare. While Tazuna said, "Good morning Naruto, would you care for some tea?" Naruto waved him away. Tazuna blinked and asked, "So old man, where do you keep your instant ramen?" "Ramen? There isn't any here. I don't like the instant stuff and my daughter won't let Inari touch the stuff, she says it causes insanity." "Insanity? I eat ramen 2 or 3 meals a day, and look at me," Naruto chuckled. "Actually," Tazuna said, "I think you're where she got the idea in the first place." Watching Naruto complain, Tazuna grinned to himself. "But," he said, "I hear there's a great 24-hour ramen stand on the corner of 18th and Swordfish." "Well see, I didn't actually bring any money with me, so," blushed Naruto. After giving him a brief glance, Tazuna threw him some cash. 1,000 yen, knock yourself out kid. With a smile on his face, Naruto hurried out the door while calling back over his shoulder. "Thanks many have something to do this morning, not sure when'll back." The door slammed. Tazuna returned to his cup of tea. The ramen stand was located precisely where the old man had predicted after Naruto ran through the town. Since he didn't have time for a full meal, he hopped onto a stool and ordered 3 bowls of beef ramen. As he waited, he wondered why all ramen stands were run by nice old men with adorable daughters to take orders. His thoughts were brief because his adorable daughter promptly brought out his ramen. He wasted no time, and by the time he was done eating, a small group of people who were on their way to work had gathered to watch him. He thought he had only about 12 minutes left before the sun rose, so he ignored his admirers and jumped over the crowd to begin running once more. Just as the sun was beginning to peak over the horizon, he reached his destination. It seemed as though time had not touched this place, as everything was nearly exactly as he remembered. It was one of Naruto's most significant locations, but it was really just a little clearing in the forest. He was covered in tears and blood, and it felt like only yesterday that he had carried Haku's body all the way here from the bridge. Because Sakura was so upset about Sasuke's wounds, he and Kakashi dug 2 graves, carefully positioned the bodies inside, filled them in, and marked the location with 2 bound wood crosses. Then, using all of his strength, Naruto had slashed Zabuza's great sword into the ground. 2 weeks later, he had also made a vow to never follow his heart instead of following his village's instructions. Some of the most innocent words he had ever spoken. When he told him that everyone he loved had perished because they prioritized the mission, Kakashi had reason to believe in his village because it was his only remaining home and a place of belonging. The village had to come first as long as a shinobi had won. Given Konoha's treatment of him, Naruto wasn't sure he could handle that. His breath left him as he got closer to the graves. Dawn was well underway, and his thoughts had slowed him down. Zabuza's sword was there, exactly where he had placed it, but the sun's rays had set the sky and clouds on fire, giving the impression that a halo of fire surrounded the sword. He was drawn to it by some invisible force, and he reached instinctively for the handle as the light reflected redly off the exposed portion of the blade. For him, this was the spirit of Zabuza, everything that the mist demon had felt or done with this very blade by his side. A part of Naruto begged him to let go, turn around, and flee back to Konoha, but he had already made up his mind long before he realized it. He uttered the words, "Nukanen Uzumaki Naruto," as though introducing himself to the sword, and then he pulled it sharply from the ground. Despite being much taller than Naruto, the sword was surprisingly light, and he held it up with his right hand. He looked at the blade, resting its back on his other hand. He had typically been attempting to avoid the sword, so he had never really looked at it closely before. The handle was roughly half as long as the blade, wrapped in some rough material, and had ridges every 6 inches or so. The blade was primarily straight with a slight curve at the end. Both were there to help hold it, Naruto thought. He calculated that the sword was roughly 7.5 feet long overall. Upon closer inspection, he noticed an inscription. Kabikari Hucho was engraved directly above the handle on the blade. It would be like Zabuza naming his sword, Naruto chuckled. However, he assumed that it was also similar to him. After just a few minutes of his examination, The sun had risen above the horizon, and Naruto hastily concluded that he would require a means of concealing the sword before most of the people began to go about their daily lives. He took another look around the clearing, and after saying a brief prayer and promising to come back, he hurried back to the town's edge, Kabikari following him. When he reached the outskirts of town, he saw people rising and beginning to swarm the streets, just as he had feared. He hurried inside the clothing store he saw first, taking care not to cut the top of the doorframe, and took a quick look around. His sword had caught the piercing gaze of a young woman who had been operating a sewing machine. "Hey lady, I have..." Naruto took his change from breakfast out of his pocket, 508 yen, "and I need a 7-foot by 4-foot piece of fabric. What can you give me?" In a moment, the young woman thought, "Do you care about quality? I could give you a piece from the end of a roll, but ends are always frayed on one edge," and quickly recovered. Naruto said uneasily, "I would like it soon, but I don't care about quality or color." The risk increased with every second, and he hoped no one had noticed the sword. After disappearing into a back room, the woman reappeared shortly after carrying the requested cloth. It was white, thick, and nearly the right size for him. Grabbing the cloth, Naruto pushed the cash into her hand, laid the cloth across the table, placed Kabikari on it, and then just stared. He hadn't really realized that he didn't know how to wrap it. The woman, whose name tag read, Rio, and whom Naruto now noticed, chuckled a little at the shocked expression on his face. She continued to giggle as she said, "Would you like some help with that?" "Yeah," Naruto said uneasily, "it really wouldn't be good if the cloth fell off in the middle of the city, and I've never wrapped anything before." He had the grace to blush. Rio moved to the opposite side of the table after laughing once more. She showed him how to wrap the sword in a matter of minutes, tucking the cloth at the ends to prevent it from coming loose. Naruto was simply amazed that he had entered a random store with his 7-foot blade and was receiving only good treatment during this entire period. He took his freshly wrapped sword and grinned at her. He called back, "Thanks, Rio-san," and walked out of the store. Rio sighed and went back into the shop. The owner was going to be furious because she had just sold a high-quality piece of clothing worth 2,500 yen for 508 yen because the boy was so adorable. With his new bundle wrapped in cloth, Naruto was strolling down the street with joy. Although he was receiving strange looks, he had made the decision that appearing strange was far preferable to appearing dangerous. The fact that he was now a self-declared missing nin was only beginning to sink in after his brief panic attack. He felt much more at ease after deciding to leave the village, but he still had a lot of work ahead of him. He began creating a mental to-do list. He had to alter his appearance first. Naruto had to hide from them so that no one would ever recognize him because he was not so conceited as to believe he could defeat the Konoha hunter. Nin. He was also somewhat saddened to learn that he would need to change his last name. Second, he needed to practice wielding his new blade. Although Naruto wanted to learn some of the ninjutsu that Zabuza had employed so successfully, particularly Kirigakure no Jutsu, this would primarily consist of basic taijutsu training. Thirdly, in addition to the wooden crosses he had nailed together, he had determined that Haku and Zabuza needed real gravestones. This would mean staying in Wave Country, possibly for as long as 2 months, which would be a lot of work, but it would also require him to make some money, which he obviously needed to do anyhow. Fourth and lastly, he needed to communicate with Konoha in some way. Since he wanted to appear to be dead, a suicide note would be suitable. That would work out well because everyone would celebrate and no one who cared about him would find it difficult to understand why he would kill himself. The only issue would be that he would need to consider the fact that the note would need to originate from a distant location outside of Wave Country. As he went down the street, Naruto saw 2 sailors glaring at his forehead. He cursed himself, realizing that he was wearing a forehead protector. Angry at his own folly, but glad that he had at least some hazy plans, he hurried into a side street and stuffed it in his pocket before racing back to Tazuna's house. The house was now eerily quiet when he opened the door and entered. Even though he was aware that Tazuna had to manage his business and Inari had school, their absence still bothered him. He was a little less uneasy when he heard the humming and running of water in the kitchen. Tsunami washed the breakfast dishes when he peered in. He hurried to his room, climbed out the window onto the roof, and hid Kabikari in a remote location that was not facing the road. Then he went back inside and slipped behind Tsunami into the kitchen. She jumped and spun around when he cleared his throat, but she smiled when she saw who it was. She said shakily, "Naruto, you've got to learn to make sound when you move. You scared me half to death." Naruto paused to reflect as she gathered herself. He didn't want to leave a trace, but he also didn't want to lie to Tazuna's family. Because he was more terrified of Hunter.Nin than he was of Tazuna figuring out his lie, he made the decision to keep his truth to himself. "Nay, Tsunami-san," he said, trying to appear ashamed, "I really don't mean to impose, but I kind of lost my pack on the way here." "Stop," Tsunami interrupted, grinning at him. "Your shopping expenses wouldn't even register on the books. Father earns enough money to buy a new house every week." Naruto was hoping she would because he had seen the excellent stonework and thought he might be able to hire someone to carve the 2 gravestones he needed. "Thanks Tsunami-san, and by the way, I noticed the monument in that park near the market. Do you know who made it?" "I think it was Soba Akira. He runs a stone and metal workshop near the north end of the city." "Why?" Tsunami pondered for a moment. Naruto needed a reason, and then he had the brilliant idea. "I thought that any guy who made such an amazing monument to Konoha would be the kind of guy I'd want to work for. I was thinking I might stay in the city for a while, and figured I'd need to get a job." The irony of his words made Naruto laugh inwardly once more, but he had achieved his goal. So, Naruto began once more, "Will you accompany me on my clothes shopping or am I on my own in this?" Tsunami, looking a little stressed, looked around the house. She apologetically reached into her purse and added, "Would it be okay if you shopped on your own, Naruto-kun? I really have a lot of work to do today. Will 40,000 yen be enough?" she asked. Naruto was thrilled, but he made an effort to hide it because he was determined to save a significant amount of the money, which would typically last him 2 weeks. In an attempt to reply, he took the money after realizing she had been holding it out for 30 seconds, 40,000 yen. "That will be more than enough, but I'm not sure how long it will take and really don't know where to go. My cloths have always been ordered and paid for by the Hokage. Here, Naruto-kun. Start at this shop. The lady who runs it is a friend of mine. If you don't find anything you like there, she'll help direct you." Tsunami wrote down on a pad of paper, looking as if she were shocked that someone had never gone clothes shopping. After giving her a heartfelt thank you for the money and the advice, Naruto quickly returned to the busy streets. Following the paper's instructions, he became suspicious when the streets began to resemble familiar ones. When he reached the address Tsunami had provided, he began pounding his head against the closest lamppost. Apart from the adorable boy with the sword this morning, Rio sat in her chair and stared at the ceiling. The day had been incredibly boring. After helping an elderly woman choose some socks and completing 3 small adjustments, she was now trying to count the bumps on the stucco ceiling. All of this basically meant that when she saw the adorable sword boy outside the store smashing his head against a lamppost, she was more than grateful for the diversion. She shouted, "Hey, can I help you with anything?" as she approached the door. After looking around, Naruto hurried into the store after realizing he had once again attracted attention to himself. "Yeah, see, I'm looking for some cloths." Rio looked up. "This is a clothing store, care to be more specific?" I really can't be more specific, I've never really shopped for clothes before," said Naruto, feeling ashamed once more. Now that she was interested, Rio looked at his orange jumpsuit and asked, "Never shopped before?" She didn't find that hard to believe. "Did you at least have something in mind?" Having never had a choice in his attire, Naruto discovered that he did have some ideas if he gave it some thought and looked around the store. He started removing items from the rack after wandering over to the pants. "Nay, Rio-san," he said as he looked around, "do you know of any good barbers nearby, particularly any who specialize dyeing hair?" Rio showed no signs of being perplexed by the question. "There's an old man who uses some weird technique to make his own dyes. He can supposedly make dyes that alter the roots themselves, but I don't really believe that." After 40 minutes, Naruto had chosen what he believed to be an adequate amount of clothing. He had new socks and underwear, 2 pairs of black pants, a dark navy vest with all the necessary pockets, and a couple white t-shirts. He was well aware that his hair looked terrible with this outfit, but he planned to change that first. After tipping Rio 500 yen, he walked out of the store wearing his new clothes and holding the address of his next destination with joy. If he molded any chakra, his seal would be visible because he wore no shirt and left the vest unzipped. Because the barbershop's owner had never bothered to post address numbers and the sign was rather small, Naruto had a little more difficulty finding it. When he finally located it, he entered with the goal of venting to the owner. Naruto sensed what was unquestionably chakra manipulation as soon as he took one step in, and his mind came to a complete stop. The old man was in another room. As he backed out of the store, he began the seals for Kage Bunshin, cursing whatever misfortune had led him to encounter Shinobi. A rather irate looking old man who had just moved more quickly than Naruto could keep up with was on the other end of the kunai, which he felt at his throat after only 2 steps. When he realized he wasn't dead after his first panic attack, he turned to face the man. Naruto was certain that this was the man he was searching for because he was elderly, didn't have a forehead protector, and looked like a barber. The only issue was that the knife was still at his throat. The elderly man raised an eyebrow in response to Naruto's question. "So, I hear you specialize in hair dye." As if he weren't endangering Naruto's life, the man calmly replied, "Yes, you heard correctly, though if you're a customer it's generally preferred if you don't perform jutsus in the shop. I like to keep it clean." So then, Naruto responded, "How much do you charge for that special dye of yours? I'm looking for the permanent root-altering stuff." Leaning over, the man examined Naruto's head. 7,000 yen, 4,000 if you have any good stories. Naruto was perplexed. Stories? What kind of stories? The elderly gentleman raised his eyebrows. "You are a missing nin, aren't you? I don't see a forehead protector. No village I've heard of has a uniform like that. You're too slow to be an undercover Enbu or hunter. Nin. And to top it off, you come here wanting permanent hair dye, so I think it's pretty obvious." Naruto had to concur that it was fairly obvious when he stated it that way. That didn't help the situation, though, so he made the decision to take a chance and tell the truth because he disliked lying to people who could A. likely catch him in the act and B. kick his ass. "Yeah, I'm a missing nin, though I really just decided that this morning." Following some contemplation, the elderly man took the kunai out and placed it in one of the numerous pockets in his smock before turning around and returning to the rear chamber. The old man called, "What color?" Naruto took a moment to realize that the man was inquiring about hair color. "A dark maroon." He called back to the man. Naruto gave his color choice a lot of thought. He wanted something very different from his current blonde, but not so different that he wouldn't like it. The man came out with a bucket and a bottle, and he pointed to one of the barber chairs. The man instructed Naruto to rinse his hair in the bucket after rubbing a strange chemical into it while he sat there. After finishing that, the man pulled out a pair of scissors, began cutting, and instructed Naruto to begin a story. Naruto and the man shared stories about their experiences as shinobi, making the following hour one of the most strange and fascinating of his life. The old man told Naruto about missions he had completed years ago, and Naruto discussed the mist techniques he wished to learn and how he hoped to learn them. By the end of the cut and dye, both felt as though they knew each other, even though no names or introductions were given and neither of them even knew which village the other was from. With his hair now dark red, Naruto gave the man his money and a small salute before leaving the room. Hours later he would discover the little scroll bearing the mark of the hidden mist and titled, "Beginning and Intermediate Stealth Jutsus" in the pocket of his pants. The sound of chaos on the lower floor woke Naruto up on the third morning. The majority of the night had been spent practicing Kirigakure no Jutsu. The main reason he left Tizuna's was because dinner had mostly consisted of the different family members admiring his new hair and clothes, and he had arrived just in time for dinner. He began practicing at the waterfront and soon had the jutsu working. It was a simple technique compared to the Kage Bunshin or Rasengan, but it took a lot of chakra control to control the mist effectively. This basically meant that he received a lot of mist but was unable to control it. He was able to execute the jutsu with just a bucket of water by the end of the night, but he suspected it would take some time before he could do it with just water in the air. But now it was more important to eat breakfast. After putting on his trousers, Naruto descended the stairs to the sounds of Tsunami battling as usual to get Inari ready for school on time. Naruto thought she would have been a decent kunoichi after observing her. "Inari!" she yelled, "How many times have I told you to stop throwing those knives?" Upon entering the kitchen, Naruto was confronted by several steak knives set into the wall. He remarked absently that Inari had fairly good aim, given his position in relation to the knives. A brief vision of a future conflict flashed through Naruto's mind. Tenten, weapons master, versus Inari, kitchen knife ninja. The other two people in the room finally noticed him when he laughed to himself. Tsunami greeted him with, "Oh, good morning Naruto-kun," while attempting to persuade Inari to eat his breakfast and remain motionless. Naturally, once Inari saw his idol had entered the room, this was rapidly becoming impossible, so Naruto decided he had better calm things down. "Nay, Inari, you really should eat your breakfast. If you don't, you'll be late for school, and if you're late for school, you'll be in even more trouble," said Naruto. Naruto made sense, and his desire to please his mother and idol overcame his defiance, so he sat down and began to eat with a groan after Inari appeared to take a moment to process this. Tsunami gave Naruto a thank you glance before approaching and beginning to yank knives from the wall. "There's some breakfast for you there too. I made pancakes," she said, drawing out another knife. Naruto had never had pancakes prepared for him, so he was amazed. He had managed to keep Konoha out of his mind until now, and he had essentially just eaten ramen in Kono. Crap. He refused to call what he had done betrayal because feeling bad about leaving made him think about the people who would feel deceived. Betrayal suggested that he had a duty to Konoha and its inhabitants. As he proceeded along this line of thought, Tsunami could only observe Naruto's increasing melancholy. Then, she gripped him tightly by the hand, startling him out of his reverie, and pulled him to the table. She ordered him to sit, so he did, sitting beside Inari, and waited just a few seconds before a plate of pancakes was placed in front of him. Good food wouldn't be common in a life of traveling and hiding, so he picked up his fork and made the decision to savor this type of food while he had it. Inari quickly finished her breakfast and departed for school. After assisting Tsunami in swiftly clearing away the breakfast dishes, Naruto withdrew to his room. Once more left on his own, he crept out onto the roof and retrieved Kabikari from where he had concealed it the previous day. He leapt to the street, hefted the sword over his shoulder, and made his way toward the woods. With a flick of his wrist, he unwrapped the sword when he arrived at what he considered to be a sufficiently remote location and began making simple swings to get a sense of the blade's balance. Naruto discovered after only an hour that he had developed some significant muscle. He was only able to raise the sword with one hand, but his movements were erratic and predictable, especially when he had to turn around. Another hour went by, and Naruto found yet another issue. He was too small to perform any kind of upward cut. At least a foot more height would be required of him. After thinking about this dilemma for a few minutes, he experimented and discovered that he could jump while swinging to gain the additional height he required. As usual, Naruto was incredibly determined to train, and by midday, he was pleased with his progress. He had made the decision to visit Soba Akira's store on his way back to Dazuna's for lunch. Naruto wanted to meet the man as soon as possible, and it was on its way. The store was fairly easy to locate. It looked like a simple, medium-sized structure with a sign outside identifying it as Soba's Stone and Metal Workshop. In order to avoid frightening the man, Naruto leapt onto the roof and concealed Kabikari. After jumping back down, he saw that a brick was holding the front door open, so he simply entered. In front of him stood a rather unkempt desk, piled high with papers and a bell that read, "Ring for service." Beyond the desk, the room opened into a cement-floored workshop filled with tools Naruto couldn't identify and fragments of metal and stone in various carving stages. With a shrug, Naruto rang the bell. A piercing ding echoed throughout the structure, and Naruto heard a shuffle. From the rear of the store came a man in his late 20s or early 30s, dressed in a leather apron. His brown hair was cut neatly, and he exuded a sense of tidiness despite his somewhat rough exterior. He smiled like a salesman and asked Naruto, "Can I help you?" "Maybe," Naruto said cautiously. "I needed 2 gravestones for dome friends of mine but don't have too much money. I was wondering if maybe I could help you out in the shop as payment?" "Work here as payment? Do you have any experience with stone or metal working?" Soba asked, looking doubtful. "Something like that," said Naruto, grinning, "and I'll show you if you lead me to a block where you need a lot of stone removed." Akira guided him to a 5-foot tall block of stone that had already been marked with lines to indicate the areas that needed to be cut away. With his hand extended, Naruto began shaping his chakra into the recognizable swirling design. He poured chakra into the now reasonably sized vortex in his hand, opening the floodgates. "Rasengan!" he cried as he struck the block of stone with the orb. The majority of the unnecessary stone was ground away in just under 30 seconds. He turned to face Akira, who was muttering to himself about raising production by 50 while grinning foolishly. Naruto asked excitedly, "I'll pay you 2,000 yen an hour, when can you start?" Before Akira quickly snapped out of it and took hold of his arm. "Right now," Naruto said, flashing his recognizable fox smile. He would later realize that his new appearance made him appear scary instead of cute, but Akira seemed largely unaffected. Instead of being asked to use the Rasengan once more, Naruto received a 2.5-hour lesson on all the tools a carver could possibly need and how to use them. Naruto's respect for the man increased, despite his impatience. Before he let loose on the store, he was controlling his excitement and ensuring Naruto understood what he was doing. Akira himself shared a personal story that demonstrated the dangers of sandpaper. The sun had already set when Naruto completed his thorough inspection of the store, and he became aware that he had once again missed lunch. He was getting into the habit of doing it. He was starving at the end of the day because, as fate would have it, every time lunchtime rolled around, something important would come up that would take forever. When he turned to face Akira, he saw that the man had been conversing with him as he considered his hunger. Unaware of what had been said, Naruto simply gave a forceful nod, which appeared to be the appropriate reaction. Akira inquired, "So, you'll start work when tomorrow?" "I'll be here at noon. I'm busy in the morning so I'll work from 1 o'clock to 6 o'clock. Sound good?" Naruto asked himself after giving it some thought. Akira gave a nod. "Yes, that should work nicely. We'll also need to discuss the details of your order." As he turned to go, Naruto nodded and said, "Okay then, Akira-san, 1 o'clock it is." As the boy ran off into the distance, Akira smiled, drooling already. That kid's strange energy ball thing would cut his production time in half. It wouldn't be a good idea to forget that Naruto waited until Akira had turned and entered the store before going back to retrieve Kabikari. Since he was now temporarily referring to Tazuna's house, Naruto ran all the way home. He had hoped for a better day, and it had gone even better. Now he had a job that paid more than ever before he was a ninja, and it also provided training. He might even push his plans forward by up to 3 weeks. He would be comfortable for a while with the 18,000 yen he had saved up from his shopping and a month's salary at 10,000 yen per day. After leaping to the roof and hiding Kabikari, Naruto crept to his window and entered. He estimated that he had to do something in the 40 minutes before supper. Pulling his forehead protector from his pocket, he sat on his bed. The symbol of the hidden leaf was carefully ground off with his Rasengan after he collected a chakra swirl in his right hand for the second time that day. Taking a kunai from his holster, he carefully carved 2 kanji into it. After tying it back around his head, he entered the bathroom to look at his creation. The words, "Akuma Shinkaru, Demonic Mirage," now appeared on his forehead protector. Naruto had given his plan for his forehead protector a lot of thought. It was what showed the world that he was a shinobi and that he had no plans to settle down and take a low-paying job, but leaving it in its current state would draw attention from the leaf that he didn't want. He had ultimately made the decision that he would attempt to establish himself as a shinobi without village allegiance on his own merits. However, this would necessitate having a unique appearance and removing everything that would identify him as Uzumaki Naruto. Uzumaki Naruto passed away and Fushicho Naruto was born as he looked at and thought about his nearly unrecognizable appearance in the mirror. Changing the name wasn't enough because Fushicho had to be everything that Uzumaki wasn't. For Naruto, this was completely different from what normal people would think of as pretending to be someone you're not. He was aware that it would take some time for him to learn how to not force himself to act in a particular way. He began rehearsing his facial expressions in front of the mirror. His first attempt was to smile, but he quickly discovered that this required caution. His longer and sharper canines, which were excellent for intimidating people but not so good for casual conversation, were displayed in a full-fledged smile. Although it was uncomfortable to scowl for longer than a few seconds, he tried a few scowls and everything appeared to be fine. Naruto kept doing this until dinner time, practicing different facial expressions. As he attempted the "nice guy" pose, Inari opened the door to invite him to dinner, which would have prevented this issue. Throughout the meal, Inari had continued to give him those strange glances, despite his best efforts to act as though he had only been checking his thumb. During dinner, Naruto surprised everyone by announcing that he had landed a job at Soba's shop. He didn't elaborate, only stating that Akira had used some of his unique skills. Supper was uneventful aside from his announcement because, happily, Naruto had remembered to take off his forehead protector before descending. Once more, Naruto hurried to his room because he had one more task to complete and wanted to go to bed early. He needed new ninja rules for himself because he understood the damage that being a missing nin could do to someone. He took a seat and began writing on a piece of paper. Never abandon a task. It felt good to write, but he assumed this one was obvious. Never complete a mission just because someone asks you to. This was crucial because a lot of missions were pointless and he couldn't afford to work on pity. He believed that too many shinobi had perished because they had forgotten the rule to never enter a situation without knowing how to leave. Never cut twice. Naruto interpreted this as a life lesson. You might not get another chance, so always make sure you succeed the first time. After giving his list a satisfied glance, Naruto folded it and slipped it into the opening in his forehead. Protector cloth where he had just moments before concealed ramen tickets. After changing, he hopped into bed. He thought about how much his life had changed in just 7 days as he lay there, gazing at the ceiling. He had wasted his tears when he stumbled into Konoha 2 weeks prior, covered in blood, because the bastard had an unhealthy obsession with his family. He had squandered a week complaining about his foolish teammates, and in that same week, he had made a permanent positive change in his life. For the first time in his life, Naruto went to sleep that night without worrying about what the following day would bring. Being a tree did not make for a pleasant morning. Naruto had now spent 15 days in Wave Country. He had a busy schedule after meeting Akira. He would rise, train with Kabikari and his new jutsus in the forest, take a lunch break, go to work, and get home in time for dinner. Since it was now at least 7 o'clock, he had a few hours of free time before going to bed, which he usually used for training anyhow. Everything had been going smoothly until 2 days prior, when Naruto realized he had to send Konoha his message right away or they would come and find him. He knew that if enough work was put in, someone would remember him and his story would be blown, but the challenge was that he had to send it in a way that made it impossible to trace it back to Wave Country. He had devised what he believed to be a very clever plan because he needed the Konoha records to prove that he had committed suicide somewhere far from Wave as a result of emotional trauma. He had been going crazy with anxiety for the past 24 hours after mailing his letter the day before. He knew that a million things could go wrong. Sadly for the forest, Naruto had discovered that the only way to release his tension was to train even harder, and the trees were marred by deep cuts. On the plus side, he had made significant progress and could now manage Kabikari with one hand without appearing foolish. After 15 more minutes of practice, Naruto collapsed into the grass and gazed up at the sky, gasping for air and allowing his thoughts to wander. It was astounding how drastically one's perspective could shift in such a short period of time. Without ever realizing he was being manipulated, Naruto had dedicated his life to fighting against those who killed without cause because he hated them. For all his life, what had he believed the Anbu had been doing? How many innocent people had been killed in the wars and skirmishes Konoha had started, even though Orochimaru had attempted to destroy the Leaf and killed Sandaime Hokage? In a month, how many assassinations did Leaf Shinobi carry out? A week? A day? Uchiha Itachi killed his entire clan in order to better himself. However, the Hyuga were one of the most revered Leaf clans and had been routinely killing and enslaving one another for as long as village history was written. If he included himself, he would have the group of people Konoha hated the most, and they would all share a single trait. It wasn't who they killed, nor was it their cruelty or savagery. It was as a result of their departure from the village. When someone broke free from the village's clinging loyalty, they discovered that all shinobi were the same, which is why Nuknins were hunted. Their enemies were evil because their cherished village followed their instructions. With a start, Naruto realized he would be late for work after glancing at the sun leaping to his feet. He ran back towards the city, temporarily forgetting his deep thoughts. In the village of the Hidden Sand later that day, Kankuro inspected the home he and his siblings shared very slowly and meticulously. He was aware that Temari had a date and would not return home until at least midnight, if not later. Regardless of what Gaara did, no one had ever bothered to discover it, but he was never present. It was uncommon for Kankuro to have the house to himself, so he laughed with joy. When the doorbell rang, he was just getting ready to burst out laughing. Unaware that they had a doorbell, Kankuro froze. Temari could simply break down the door if she couldn't find her key, and Gaara could teleport using his sand. When Kankuro opened the door, a rather uneasy-looking man in brown with a UPS hat stood in front of him. A United Postal Service employee informed him that a letter had been delivered to someone in his home, so he opened the door a little more. It was a first. Kankuro gazed expectantly at the man as he fully opened the door. As he went on, the man's confidence increased. Have a package for Mr. Gaara of the desert. Is he here? He asked, clearly hoping he wasn't. For the first time in his life, Kankuro could not speak. He realized after a moment that the man was looking for a response. Kankuro didn't want pee on the front stairs, so this man didn't need to know that Gaara was upstairs. Kankuro pretended to smile as he said, "No, but I'll make sure he gets it." Kankuro shut the door after the man fled the house. What had he been up to again? He remembered, and his face lit up with a smile. After throwing Gaara's letter on the table and running to his room to make sure everything was okay, he took a DVD case out from under his mattress and gave the title a goofy smile. Paradise. The motion picture, Icha Icha, even though he knew it was a dumb movie, he still thought it was one of his favorites. However, Temari was constantly looking for a reason to beat him senseless, so he hardly ever dared to watch it. He ran to the living room and jumped on the couch after skittering down the stairs, throwing some popcorn in the microwave, and impatiently waiting for it to cook. Only a few minutes into the film, Kankuro sensed someone standing behind him. Every muscle in his body tensed as Gaara walked calmly into his line of sight, moved to the couch's recliner, and sat down after placing his gourd on the floor. He restarted the movie, not fully understanding what was happening but not wanting to waste his Temari free time. Normally, Kankuro enjoyed making fun of other characters' folly, but he felt uneasy with Gaara present. But this sensation was soon resolved. Don't drink the purple liquid just because it's sitting there, have your brains leaked out of your head, Or are you just a stupid pathetic waste of life? Gaara barked. It would have surprised Kankuro less if he hadn't looked at his younger brother as though he had grown a second head. At a pornographic film, Gaara was shouting at the television. Gaara opened his mouth to say something, but Kankuro interrupted him when a suitable scene came in. Why would anyone with a fraction of a shred of a half-dead monkey's brain hit the big red button that says "Do not push"? With a hint of respect in their eyes, the two exchanged glances. This continued for roughly half an hour before catastrophe struck. The two barely had time to look when they heard the doorknob turn before Tamari, who appeared somewhat unclean and extremely irate, stomped into the room. She was shouting something about strawberry cool.aid and dumb boys. Pushing Kankuro aside, she rushed to the couch and sat down. She didn't realize what was on the TV until a few moments later, when she was taking a break from cursing. In the front seat of a car, a man and a woman were tangled in a rather strange position as the man used his feet to steer the vehicle through a sandstorm. With the exception of the TV's squeaking and moaning, the room fell silent. That position cannot be physically possible, Tamari said, her eyes widening. The Sand siblings discovered their first commonality at that point, making comments on stupid films. They had never had a better time together. During a brief interlude, Kankuro stopped the film to demonstrate that the previously described position was indeed feasible, albeit excruciatingly painful, using some life-sized sand models provided by Gaara. As the film came to an end, the three of them acknowledged that they had just spent 2 hours together and were genuinely disappointed. That is, until Gaara threw Kankuro another DVD after reaching into his gourd. Icha Icha Paradise 2. Revenge of the Squid was the latter. Kankuro gazed in awe at his brother. When Kankuro said, "This isn't supposed to come out for another month, why do you have this?" Gaara shrugged and pointed to the first film's still, rolling credits. Team Special Effects Visual Effects, Ichigo Kurosaki. Effects of Creatures. Abarai Renji Gaara of the Desert, The Impact of Sandstorms and Weather. The two older siblings gazed at their younger brother until he gestured toward the machine and raised a non-existent eyebrow in their direction. After the second movie ended, it was well past 1 o'clock, and they were all getting ready for bed when Gaara noticed a big envelope on the table. To his surprise, it was addressed to him. After carrying it upstairs, he tore it open to reveal a second envelope with a message inside. To Gaara, "You might find this a little strange, but it's crucial that you do as instructed in this letter. I'll explain why if I ever see you again. I need you to change into me using henge, no matter what day tomorrow is. Then go into the desert, let go of the henge, and return to your work after taking the letter in the envelope I sent to the courier and having it delivered directly to the Hokage's office. People will stop by to inquire about me in a few weeks. Inform them that you only met me once and that we discussed hate, life's hardships, and other angsty topics. After that, tell them, I vanished into the desert. I owe you a huge debt." Naruto. A scrawled illustration of a stick figure with fox whiskers was at the bottom of the letter. Since he had nothing better to do and assumed Naruto wouldn't ask if it wasn't important, Gaara woke up the following day and complied with his request. For a few weeks, it also provided him with a task. He needed to work on his angst. Now let's return to Wave Country. After 2 more days, Naruto was largely finished worrying about the letter, but he now had something else to worry about instead. His eyes were the one aspect of his disguise that he had forgotten. His eyes were a striking shade of blue, which stood out sharply against the rest of his dark attire. The problem was that, although he believed he had discovered a method to alter the color of his eyes, it would be extremely risky, necessitate extensive research, and ensure that he would never be permitted to return to Konoha. He looked twice and saw that none of those were really a problem for him. He was beginning to enjoy his identity as a Nukenin. Naruto began to consider his departure plans after spending 2.5 weeks in Wave Country. Naruto had placed the 2 gravestones the day before after Akira offered to make them for free. He had been earning a ton of money and reasoned that he wouldn't have to start accepting missions for some time, which was fortunate. Spending more and more time in the forest, Naruto had developed enough control over Kirigakure no Jutsu to make it a formidable, if not flawless, skill, and he was constantly honing his sword technique. That was where the issue was. Naruto became increasingly aware that he needed to improve on a number of things as he trained. He needed to have his sword repaired because he had learned a lot about metal from working with Akira, and it had been an old sword when Zabuza had owned it. If he wanted a good job on a sword this unique, he would need to find a master swordsmith because most smiths, even good ones, only worked on the more common swords, like wakazashis, katanas, and ninja datus. His insufficient physical training was his second issue. He was afraid that it would be painfully clear the first time he fought that a sword style that had been used for 200 years was superior to the 3 weeks of experimentation. He had to learn how to do more than just swing his sword, he had to learn how to fight. Since he could fight barehanded and still had his old jutsus, he reasoned that the first one was more significant. However, he also reasoned that sword experience was meaningless if your sword was broken. Naruto threw himself into his training even more, adding an hour at the local library to his daily schedule, with the goal of leaving Wave Country in less than 10 days. Naruto found enough related books to give him a decent idea of what he would need to do to change the color of his eyes, though it wasn't as comprehensive as Konoha's. It would be crazily dangerous, but not very complicated. Naruto wrote down that he would test this specific jutsu somewhere far from, well, anything. Time passed even more quickly because he had roughly planned his departure date. His 4th week in Wave Country was almost over before he realized it. Naruto was scheduled to depart on Sunday, and today was Friday. He would therefore be leaving Akira today, and Naruto was shocked to learn that he would miss the man. He felt compelled to ask a question because it was his last day, but he wasn't entirely sure how to go about it. Since Naruto had taken care to never reveal his purpose, Akira was unaware that Rasengan might be a beginner's jutsu. Naruto walked up to what appeared to be his boss's office and paused. "Is there something I can help you with, Naruto?" Akira asked, looking up. "Yeah, I've already told you that I'm leaving Sunday, but before I go, I need you to promise never to repeat any of this and answer a question without asking why." Akira nodded despite giving him a strange look. "I want to know who the best swordsmith on the continent is, and where I could probably find him." Naruto took a deep breath. Konoha would be completely screwed if he knew the answer to this question and knew he had asked it. Then Akira laughed, which surprised Naruto. "That's what you wanted to ask?" "I was afraid there for a second. It's really an easy question. Kirin is by far the best. No one knows his last name, but he was the youngest of 3 brothers, all of whom were forced to flee from the Hidden Mist when the oldest went rogue. Kirin himself made 4 of the 7 legendary mist swords, and the middle brother, now dead, made the other 3. It's quite a well-known tale in the metal working community. Kirin is somewhat of an idol." Akira inhaled and appeared momentarily unsure. Finding him may be more difficult. He was last known to have taken shelter in another village in the north. Some claim a place called the Village of the Hidden Sound, but I don't honestly believe such a place exists, so all I can tell you is go north. Naruto stopped paying attention at this point. He concluded that the fates had a very perverse sense of humor. After bidding farewell to the man who had served as both his boss and friend for more than a month, Naruto made his way directly home. He didn't intend to leave, and he hadn't told Tazuna about it. Naruto would leave an apologetic note explaining that he had to leave right away for a top-secret mission, but he would be gone long before dawn the following day. The family was reminded by a PS not to tell anyone, not even his own teammates, that he had been there. That night, Naruto went to sleep feeling anxious. Now that he had a solution, albeit a potentially unpleasant one, to the problem of how to fix Kabikari Hucho, he had turned his attention to how he could become more skilled at it. Since Zabuza had fought with the sword as an extension of his body and didn't require a style, a regular swordmaster could teach him some basic forms. Naruto's lack of skill would be an insult to both the sword and its former master. Someone who knew and understood how to fight with a weapon this size was the person Naruto needed to learn from. In addition to ideally being aware of the different water jutsus that complemented the use of such massive weapons, they would need to have no affiliations with any secret villages that were friendly to Konoha. Naruto became increasingly troubled by this the more he considered it. The fact that he knew people who met these requirements was the issue, not the fact that he didn't. When Naruto awoke the following morning at 3 in the morning, he discreetly and carefully packed his few belongings into a tiny duffel bag that Tazuna had given him to store his clothes in. Zipping it up, he slipped downstairs. Tazuna would surely discover his note when he came down for his morning tea because he left it on the kitchen table. He left the house, shutting the door behind him, and said a silent farewell to the house and its occupants. As usual, Kabikari Hucho was on the roof, exactly where Naruto had left it. With the sword close at hand, Naruto had begun to feel more at ease and became anxious when it was out of his line of sight. Perched on top of the house, Naruto surveyed his surroundings. He pictured the entire population of Wave Country sleeping, totally unaware of the person who would be departing from them this evening. Naruto leapt from the roof and took off running. Similar to how he had fled another city just a month prior, he fled the city and entered the forest. However, something was different. He had been tormented by flashbacks as he had left Konoha. This time, however, he was thinking about the future as he walked away from the port city that was still asleep. Naruto kept running through the forest as the morning dragged on. He was in Fire Country now and would likely stay there for a while. Since Naruto wasn't good with ships, it was the only direct land route from wave to sound. He would be within 40 miles of Konoha if he took the most direct route, but Naruto wasn't ready to be that arrogant just yet, so he had planned a slightly detour that would keep him safe. Naruto realized he had been stalling long enough as the sun rose toward the top of its path and noon drew near. After all, he hadn't seen any traces of human life for hours. He put his sword and bag on the ground next to a particularly tall tree, steeling his resolve, and ran through the forest for another minute. Naruto tried to relax, feeling sweaty and breathless but not exhausted. He wanted to be at least composed so he wouldn't make any mistakes when he attempted an experimental jutsu. He calmed his soul and closed his eyes. His eyes snapped open, and he bit his thumb, causing a line of blood to run down the seal on his abdomen. His hands moved more quickly than the average human eye could follow. 37 hand seals were present. After completing the dragon seal, he yelled to the deserted forest. Shikafujin Kai. The familiar terrain of his cave. Like mind was where he was. Even though he had anticipated this, it still made him uneasy, especially in light of what he was anticipating at the end of the tunnel. He entered the spacious chamber that housed the Kyuubi's cage. He had expended enough chakra and the jutsu had been effective. As he watched, the seal that held Kyuubi in his cage began to stretch and glow, and the great iron doors began to open. This was evidence that it was flying around the room, creating a swirling vortex of blue energy. Kyuubi's voice called out, "What are you doing, brat?" With a level of confusion Naruto had never heard Kyuubi's before. The demon assumed he must be having some sort of mental breakdown because the seal was getting longer and longer and the gates were opening wider and wider, but he wasn't prepared to let chance get away. When the gates were sufficiently open, Kyuubi thrust a paw through the opening and launched it in Naruto's direction in an attempt to destroy his mind and seize control of the body. It took all of Naruto's willpower to wait as long as he did when he saw the enormous clawed appendage approaching. Naruto released the jutsu just as the claw was about to transform his body into a demon puppet. The room's blue chakra instantly disappeared. The Kyuubi's front right leg was cleanly severed as the seal lost its glow and the gates slammed shut. The leg swiftly broke apart into a surge of red chakra that swept over him. The demon's cries followed Naruto as he was drawn out of his mental realm. When Naruto awoke in the real world, he learned that the word, pain, had a new meaning. Every muscle and bone in his body seemed to be simultaneously contracting and expanding as a hurricane of red chakra ripped through the nearby forest. The chakra disappeared after a minute or so, leaving Naruto to lie on the grass and gaze at the clouds. That fox is pretty stupid for a demon thousands of years old, he thought as he slowly fell asleep. Naruto discovered he had slept for 18 hours when he woke up and saw the sun rising. Examining his body eagerly, he was disappointed to see that there had been only slight changes. He had grown about 3 inches and put on a little muscle. Additionally, he discovered that he had acquired some additional reserves of chakra after molding some of it. Because he saw his reflection in Kabikuri's blade at that moment, Naruto remained somewhat depressed the entire way to where his stash was. His eyes had grown somewhat more angular and were slitted. They were no longer that innocent shade of blue, instead, they had taken on the red that he usually reserved for his insane outbursts. Some time ago, Naruto had guessed that his body might be improved by channeling crazy amounts of Kyuubi's chakra, but he had needed a way to obtain that much. He had discovered the concept of the Shikafujin Kai at that point. It had made sense that since raw chakra could break jutsus like the Shadow Bind, it would also be possible to temporarily bend the seal and fool the Kyuubi in the same way that he had. After months of investigation, Naruto had given up on the plan after realizing that assuming the Kyuubi's position of authority might provide the villagers with the justification they needed to murder him. He was happy that he had done the research, even though in hindsight he had been correct to give up the jutsu at the time. His experimental jutsu was successful overall. His eye change alone was worth it, but he was certain Kyuubi would never fall for the same trick again. He might even be able to bluff his way out of a situation where he had already been identified because it was nearly impossible to change eye color without genjutsu. Naruto checked his map and compass after a long nap, feeling satisfied and rejuvenated, and then he bounded through the forest. In the meantime, in Konoha, her eyes were staring blankly into space as the 5th Hokage lay on her desk. Both her face and the letter she was frantically holding in her right hand were dripping with tears. Despite the council's outcry, she had sent a squad of Anbu to the sand the previous day, and she had been dreading their report ever since. Since Naruto had always had such an unbreakable spirit, she didn't think he had killed himself. However, as the days went by, Tsunade began to recall things. Pictures of shopkeepers making fun of him. Children hurling rotten fruit hit me. Parents yelled at me for requesting to play with their child. Naruto had also experienced all of these things in the past. And for 13 years, Tsunade wasn't sure if she could take that kind of treatment. She had been crying for 2 days, but she began turning her grief into rage as a result of these memories and thoughts. No matter how she saw it, Orochimaru was to blame for the entire mess. It was he who had broken Naruto's brittle trust and taken Sasuke from the village. She grew more irate the more she considered it, until she made the decision to use both of her hands to burn the sound to the ground if those Anbu returned to confirm the death of her third loved one. A green necklace was lying in the bottom of Naruto's duffel bag, forgotten far away. Naruto rubbed his feet while sitting in the forest. He gave his boots, which were resting on the forest floor beside him, a threatening look. His feet began to hurt after just a few hours of running, and a short while later he was unable to run anymore. He soon realized the issue. His feet had gotten bigger after soaking in demonic chakra. Only a few fractions of an inch, but it was enough to pinch his boots, though not by much. Though he hadn't anticipated all the issues it would bring about, Naruto had anticipated a slight increase in body size. He concluded that this represented the less glamorous aspect of transformation jutsus. His pants hung a good inch and a half above his ankles, exposing skin, and a quick once over had also revealed that the hems would need to be loosened. A sudden sympathy struck him for Kimimaro, who must have spent all of his money mending holes in his clothes. Although this line of reasoning was humorous, Naruto was 70 miles from the closest town and was unable to decide what to do about his boots. He kept massaging his foot in an attempt to restore blood flow. He finally had an idea after 10 or so minutes. He pulled a kunai from his holster and began hacking at one of his boots. In 3 minutes, he had a pair of what he believed to be ninja sandals that were functional if not very attractive. In reality, he had simply cut off the top of his boots and tied his feet into the bottoms using the excess material. Now that he could move again, Naruto stood up, grabbed his sword and bag, and began to walk through the forest. At the time, Uchiha Itachi was shopping for Pocky about 50 miles north of where Naruto is now. He stood amidst the various flavors, futilely trying to make up his mind. The fact that the most lethal Nukenin in Konoha history was obsessed with the chocolate treat was not widely known. For years, he had been eating 3 packs a day, and he had only stopped eating them during combat when a bunch of grass Junin started laughing while he was contentedly munching. He obviously kept eating while tearing them to pieces, but he then made the decision to keep eating and fighting apart. He had a pencil carefully tucked behind his ear and had not worn his Akatsuki cloak today. Long ago, he and his partner had agreed that Kisame would handle their money management and Itachi would handle their shopping. In this manner, Itachi received what he desired, and his partner was able to determine how much of it he received. He had a weekly Pocky limit of 15 boxes. He took a seat in the aisle and allowed his gaze to wander over the different shelves. He had to make a thoughtful decision, but he was patient and knew that the answers would eventually come to him. Naruto glanced at the sun. He had come a long way. He hadn't even stopped to buy new shoes in the last town he had passed through because he wanted to leave Fire Country as quickly as possible, though this could also be partially explained by his desire to hide from others. He thought about his great endurance as he ran on. His stamina had been greatly increased by weeks of morning training and afternoon Rasengan-ing, and he was getting better every day at handling Kabikari Haucho's weight. This was demonstrated by the fact that he still had some energy after running for the majority of the morning. Naruto took a moment to rest at the base of a tree and considered his options for what to do when he got to the village of the Hidden Sound. He wasn't sure he would just go up to the gates and knock. He would have to find another way in because he had no intention of joining the Sound, and since he knew Orochimaru, he would have to sacrifice something in order to get what he desired. He kept thinking, utterly oblivious to the presence in the treetops far above. Staring down at the unaware boy was Hoshigaki Kisame. The strange chakra surge Samahata had experienced the day before was definitely caused by this, but to discover him with Kabikari Haucho. Normally, Kisame would have killed anyone who dared to claim one of the 7 missed Tenkan as his own right away, but Samahata had revealed some strange information regarding his chakra. The sensation of a person's chakra was something Kisame never forgot. Never. This boy was unquestionably the Kyuubi brat. Alone in the woods, wearing Azusa's sword, wearing a new forehead protector, and looking entirely different. Kisame knew right away that the boy had left his village. Without his chakra, he would not have recognized him. The only thing in the direction he was going was a hidden sound, so he tried to think of something that might entice him out here. His eyes widened as he took another look at the sword. The sword must have been given to the boy recently because Kisame had written down its location and the last he heard, it was being used to mark the demon's grave. It made perfect sense. The brat would obviously need someone to fix the sword since it needed to be repaired. Kisame was beginning to formulate a plan, but the boy would need to be proficient with his weapon in order for it to succeed. He gave the son a quick look. Kisame estimated that he had roughly 2 hours before Itachi returned, taking into account the distance to the store and the 15-box Pocky limit. Lots of time. The words, Kirigakure no Jutsu, were whispered as his hands darted through seals. Naruto was about to begin his journey once more when he saw the mist beginning to descend. He dropped his bag and dove into the bushes, where he discovered Kabikari running through the underbrush. Naruto tried to get a better view of the area by jumping into a tree as the mist grew thicker. The only explanation he could think of for who might be responsible for this was misthunter.nin, but that didn't make sense. His instincts cried out to him, abruptly interrupting his thoughts. Just as the branch exploded, he leapt off it. Through the forest, two phantoms performed a destructive dance. The only warning would be a slight agitation in the mist, and then they would be at each other, trading blows more quickly than the human eye could track, before disappearing back into the mist. There was no sound in the air as the two fighters stalked each other in silence. Both were aware that there was no time to try other jutsus. If one of them was caught off guard, the other would attack. Itachi was still a long way off, reaching for his 9th box of Pocky, when he abruptly pulled his hand away. He couldn't let himself make a snap decision. Gazing out into the impenetrable fog, Naruto silently cursed. He was aware that he was at a disadvantage because Kisame knew more about Kirigakure no Jutsu, so Naruto was fighting blindly out of instinct. Then there was the minor matter of Kisame's Junin status. He was exerting all of his remaining strength and flexibility in order to stay away from Samahata. He shouldn't be able to avoid Samahata at all, though. In an attempt to understand why Kisame was holding back, he ran through the forest. Why was the shark man here in the first place, anyway? Samahata rushed out of the fog, leaving Naruto with no more time to think. He twisted in midair, bringing Kabikari around to block the inevitable follow. Up strike, and leapt over where he knew Kisame was standing. However, it never materialized. Naruto attempted to make amends after realizing he had been duped, but he lost his balance and landed badly. An impact on his left arm was the last sensation he experienced. As Kisame gazed thoughtfully at the unconscious boy, the mist gradually dissipated. In the less than 2 minutes that the fight lasted, Naruto showed that he had no idea how to wield his sword, which is precisely why Kisame had been so impressed. Even with Kisame suppressing more than 2/3 of his strength, the brat managed to hold him at bay for 2 minutes, which was quite an accomplishment. He sighed and slung the boy over his shoulder before bending down to pick up Kabikari. Kisame suspected that he would have to double next week's Pocky budget because Itachi would not be pleased about this. As Naruto began to regain consciousness, his first thought was that he must be in heaven because the aroma of freshly made ramen filled his nostrils. But the moment he opened his eyes, the ramen was removed. "Wake up, brat," Kisame said impatiently. "Before Itachi returns, we need to have a brief conversation." All of a sudden, Naruto was awake and looking around. The fact that Kabikari and his bag were in good shape gave him a sense of relief. But being tethered to a tree and dwarfed by an obnoxious shark man did not make him happy. He would later come up with a lot of things he could have said right now, but he chose to say what immediately sprang to mind. Naruto questioned, "Why aren't I dead?" "Because I need to ask you some things," Kisame answered without missing a beat. Naruto blinked. He thought that was logical. "Ask away." Kisame began simply by grabbing Kabikari and extending it before Naruto, asking, "Where did you get this?" After weighing his options, Naruto concluded that his "don't lie to people who can kick your ass" theory applied in this particular situation. He also understood that he could only explain where he got the sword if he also explained why he had left Konoha, see Chap. 3. One thing led to another, and Naruto basically summarized everything that had happened over the past month and a half for the next 10 minutes. Kisame was thrilled but had remained silent the entire time. This would be ideal. If someone had planned it, the outcome would have been even better. The author playfully twitches his thumbs. "Tell you what," Kisame replied, "I'll give you some help with your atrocious sword skills and help you get into Hidden Sound to find Hoshigaki Kirin, and all I want in return is for you to help me out with something." Kisame smirked, and Naruto paused what he was about to say to reconsider what he had just said. "Oh," was the smartest response Naruto could think of. "So," began Kisame once more, "do we have a deal, brat?" Given that he was shackled to a tree and powerless, Naruto realized that even if he hadn't required assistance entering sound, he really wouldn't have had any say in the matter. Slowly, he nodded. "Good," a smiling Kisame said. As he placed the bowl of ramen in front of the hungry boy, he sliced Naruto's bindings. Kisame called out to Naruto, "Eat quick, brat," while tossing him some chopsticks. It took him 3 hours and 43 minutes to decide on the flavors he wanted, so Itachi was satisfied when he left the store and returned to camp. He was eating a stick of white chocolate cream when he noticed a small, red-eyed boy in the center of his camp practicing with a huge sword. Itachi took out his Pocky box and carefully examined the ingredients, finding nothing that seemed off. The boy was still there when he turned on his Sharingan after taking another look. He felt Kisame land next to him just as he was ready to apply one of his kunai to the boy's neck. He pivoted and gave his partner a fierce look. "Explain." Then Kisame reiterated the synopsis Naruto had given him a few minutes earlier, concluding with the words, "So he can get what he wants from my brother and we get a reliable agent in the hidden sound. Everyone leaves happy." Itachi paused to reflect. Kisame had a point, as much as he hated to admit it, and he most certainly hated to admit it. Working with other missing nins was uncommon but not unheard of, and this boy could save them a lot of trouble. Itachi and Kisame took a vacation from Akatsuki's job every 18 months to visit Kisami's brother, Hoshigaki Kirin. Itachi simply went since it was a respite from constant work, and Kisame went to have his sword examined and repaired. After each visit, they would decide where to meet the following time. Kirin had to hide in the hidden sound after being forced to leave the agreed upon location by mist hunters. This presented a minor issue because it was improbable that Orochimaru would allow the two most powerful Akatsuki 9 members to simply stroll into his village and pay his new best weaponsmith a brief visit. Their plan was to have a sound Junin deliver a message to them, locate a squad, murder everyone except for one, and then threaten the remaining member until he complies. Although messy and left a trail, this had previously worked. Since Kisame genuinely cared about his brother, he had been worried that this approach might endanger him. As soon as Kisame saw Kabikari Hucho, he had a sneaking suspicion that Naruto might be searching for his brother and concluded that he would make a much better agent. To begin with, Naruto had no reason, or even less of a reason, to turn on them. Second, if Naruto ever hoped to be more than a seasoned swordsman, he would need Kisame and his brother's assistance. Thirdly, he had a good reason to speak with Kirin and be in the Sound Village. The last, and possibly most significant, benefit was the absence of Fushicho Naruto. There would be no trace of anyone with his name or description, no matter how far they searched or how deeply they dug. He had no friends, no history, and no home village. Kisame explained everything, and the only thing that prevented Itachi from agreeing right away was that the boy had been the target of a mission that had failed, and Itachi detested mission failure. For weeks, they had irritated the council. Itachi's decision to collaborate with the brat marked the end of his internal conflict. After all, the boy was now a missing nin, and the villages would kill them off one by one until nobody had the guts to leave if they didn't occasionally support one another. The two Akatsuki truly needed assistance, but Itachi would never acknowledge that to himself. This was the other, and much more significant, reason. Even though Naruto knew the two were close by, he still jumped a little when two forms appeared out of the forest. He blinked. Naruto had been enthralled by Itachi's overwhelming aura of power during their previous encounter. However, it appeared that this effect was somewhat lessened when he was carrying shopping bags and without his cloak. He no longer resembled an incarnation of death. Rather, he resembled an elderly Sasuke who had developed a Pocky addiction. At first, dinner that night was awkward. This was mainly because Naruto had an unexpected realization not long after he sat down. People were S-class missing. Nins. When Itachi had built a campfire and begun to cook some meat in a pan, it had been the biggest shock of his life. Noodles and fried chicken were their basic fare, but Itachi proved to be an excellent chef. Once more, Naruto was taken aback when the two Akatsuki began to discuss meaningless topics unrelated to death. In contrast to his younger brother, the elder Uchiha was much more talkative than he may have imagined. Naruto eventually found himself growing accustomed to the idly way the two lethal shinobi talked about the meals of the following day in between mouthfuls of chicken. He even began to occasionally add remarks to their exchanges. As the meal was swiftly over and the conversation shifted to their assignment, Naruto now actively participated. Kisame was sick of seeing his brother flee, but he had to think he was dead for the hunters to stop pursuing him. They had to escape the secret village of Sound without being discovered and create the impression that Kirin had passed away in a way that would prevent his body from ever being found. The plan would be foiled if even one person saw Kisame or Itachi because everyone would suspect a plot. Unfortunately, in the shinobi community, Kirin's affiliation with Akatsuki members was much more well-known than in the metalworking community. This implied that Naruto would be the key to everything. They agreed that he would enter the village pretending to be a young man seeking a sword repair. Orochimaru permitted Noobnins to reside in and travel to his village, in contrast to most hidden village leaders. Orochimaru assumed that they would assist in the event of an attack on the village, even though some chose to accept missions and others did not. People fought to preserve the sound because it was the only place that would take them, not because they were paid to do so. It was similar to having a free defense force. It was simultaneously sad and brilliant. Naruto would pretend to be the child of one of the mist nin who had fled with Zabuza. It was decided. He would say his father had just been murdered. He could enter the village with little attention if he told this story and offered a few bribes. Unaware that another plan was being hatched far away, the three kept planning long into the night. Gaara and his siblings presented their report to the Hokage. The few people in the village who cared about Naruto's fate surrounded him. He had been talking for a little more than an hour, and from the moment he opened his mouth, he had the entire room's attention. He crafted a story of melancholy and despair so profound that it broke the hearts of even the most heartless Junin. It told the story of a broken boy who, before throwing his life into the desert sands, had come to see the only other person on the planet who was just like him. He meticulously detailed every word, gesture, and facial expression from his conversation with Naruto. Of course, it was all a total lie. He concluded by saying, "Then I saw his form slowly vanish into the desert." Gaara, feeling very proud of himself, stepped back. He had just delivered the most angsty speech anyone in the room had ever heard, and he wouldn't question it. However, he acknowledged that he had become a little uneasy after spending an hour watching Rock Lee cry and embrace his teacher. He had only just realized what Naruto had done when the Anbu had reached his door. Throughout his journey here, he had questioned his ability to deceive the Hokage herself. Then he had witnessed the street parties. Big signs that read, "Ding, Dong, the demon's dead," were waving in the wind, and bars were giving away free alcohol. Konoha as a whole was celebrating. Only a small number of people were unconcerned, and they were the only ones in this room with him who even slightly mourned Naruto's passing. He scanned the room with his eyes. Halfway through his story, the Hokage began to cry quietly, and the man named Jiraiya was holding her hand. While his younger sister, or cousin, Gaara wasn't sure, clung to him and sobbed. The older Hyuga child, with his eyes squeezed shut, was clearly trying to control his emotions. Naruto's teacher and the rest of his teammates were conspicuously absent. Gaara gave a scowl. These people have no right to be depressed. How dare they? When Naruto needed them, where did they believe they had been? The truth wasn't fair to the residents of this village. The Hokage calmed herself and thanked him, but Gaara remained enraged. Orochimaru was to blame. Tsunade believed that Naruto had killed himself because Sasuke had left, and that Orochimaru was to blame for this. She also believed that Sasuke had left because of Orochimaru. Tsunade stood and gazed at the small group of people in front of her. "There has been," she said, "far too much sadness in this village. So much that it will be many years before life gets back to normal. But in this time, I ask you to be strong, and help me to eliminate the source of this sadness." Tsunade broke her desk when she slammed her fist into it. "I want every available shinobi called in from whatever mission they're on, from the Anbu to the Genin, I want them all here." She asked Shizune to get our strategists working on a plan. 1 month from now, we will crush Orochimaru and his village of sound, and end this circle of sadness forever. A stunned audience watched as the Hokage whirled around and bounded out of the room. With a sigh, Shikamaru said, "Troublesome." Naruto was back in the forest, sleeping soundly by the now gone campfire. Itachi and Kisame were washing clothes in the moonlit river farther into the forest. For the first few moments, they were silent, each of them thinking about something. Itachi decided to end the silence after glancing at his partner. "Don't even start thinking about it, Kisame. The council would never allow us to have a dependent, he would just slow us down." As he attempted to remove a sweat stain from his shirt, Kisame gave a small growl. "I'm perfectly aware of that, but looking at him is a lot like looking into the past, isn't it, Itachi?" Itachi was only able to nod. He had vivid memories of his first year of being a missing nin. He had been a Junin when he left, and it had been difficult. At his best, Naruto was Chunin level. No, he was well aware that, should Naruto survive to the end of these months, the months that followed would likely be the most trying in his life once Konoha learned of his survival, which they would, in due course. Itachi's thoughts were interrupted by Kisame. "We could at least help him get stronger and teach him enough to survive." He continued, "It's 3 days to Hidden Sound if we move quickly, but we have all the time we need, so why not take 2 weeks and teach him a few tricks, then we go our separate ways after we're done in Sound and the council won't even need to know he exists." Kisami's suggestion went unanswered by Itachi, but it made no difference. Even before his partner's words were spoken, they had both known he would agree. As a whole, Missing Nin Society operated much like a secret village, according to a previous statement. Although there were clear ranks and the older nins frequently shared their knowledge with the younger ones, mission information was transmitted through rumors rather than scrolls. That made sense to Itachi now. Itachi inevitably recognized a piece of himself in Naruto, not because he had a special affection for him. Bonus. Big ass sword physics. Any good swordsman must have a reasonable understanding of rotational motion. First, the distribution of mass is a critical factor. It takes more energy to move the sword the farther the mass is from your body. The law of conservation of energy then comes into play. Let's say you wish to swing the sword once in a full 360-degree circle in a single second. Additionally, it takes 5 units of energy to swing a sword if you hold it at the end of the handle and away from your body. It will only take 3 energy units to move the sword in a circle if you hold it at the top of the handle, close to the blade's hilt, and close to your body. However, if you start swinging the sword at arm's length, giving it 5 units of energy, and then pull it in close to your body, the swing will actually speed up to make up for it because energy can never be created or destroyed, normally. Conversely, if you begin a swing near your body and then extend your arm, the strike speed will decrease. Naruto was awakened at 5:30 the following morning and instructed to get up and train. After giving him Kabikari, Kisame began dragging the still drowsy Naruto to a clearing before drawing Samahada and beginning to explain. Okay, brat, listen up. Itachi and I don't think you're ready for this mission yet, so you're going to be getting a 2-week crash course on how to be a missing nin. Your mornings will be spent doing taijutsu and swordsmanship training with me, and your afternoons will be devoted to Itachi teaching you the more general skills you'll need to stay alive. Kisame ran without another word. As Naruto attempted to block Kisami's initial blow, he was caught off guard and slammed fully awake. The operative word was, tried. The force of the blow threw him backward. That was pretty much how the next 2 hours went. Naruto attempted to block Kisami's attack from somewhere. It took Naruto 45 minutes to realize that this was training of the imagination and instincts rather than strength. Early on, Naruto realized that he would never be able to defeat Sharkman, but he discovered some strategies he could employ. After making several attempts to deflect shuriken with his sword in the same manner as he would with a kunai, he discovered that if he turned the sword sideways, it was sufficiently wide to fully protect him. Additionally, he discovered that counter-attacking was the most effective way to stop Kisami's attacks. Kisame would lose the momentum advantage he had when Naruto was just waiting for the impact if they charged at the same moment. They ate breakfast at around 7:30. Itachi had orange pocky, while Kisame and Naruto had bacon and eggs. They returned to training immediately after breakfast, but Kisame was teaching this time. After teaching Naruto the fundamentals of wielding and swinging a sword, he gave him some drills to practice. Kisame thought this was crucial because he had witnessed instances during their pre-breakfast drill where Naruto executed a really spectacular block only to be overcome because he was holding the sword incorrectly or at the incorrect angle. Naruto was worn out by the time lunch arrived. Itachi replaced Kisame after lunch, gave him a quick glance, and said he needed new shoes. Naruto was still wearing the improvised sandals he had made out of the leftovers from his boots, which were now rather worn out. This is why, an hour later, Naruto ended up in a shoe store in the closest town. Before Itachi revealed that he occasionally ran for half a day to get his weekly supply of pocky, Naruto had complained that the run for shoes was too long. After blindly selecting a pair of boots, Itachi gave them a close inspection before nodding. They ran all the way back to camp after Naruto paid for the shoes. Now totally cleaned up, Naruto scowled at Itachi across what he now referred to as the training field. The old Itachi, the one who used to give him nightmares, was back all of a sudden. Every single part of Naruto's body cried out for him to run, but he was unable to do so. The sensation vanished in an instant, and Naruto gazed at Itachi in wonder as the Sharingan user took out a stick of banana cream pocky and began to consume it. Today's lesson is for you to figure out what I just did, and I'll repeat it as many times as you like, Itachi stated in between mouthfuls. And he succeeded in doing so. Naruto was equally as stunned and paralyzed the first few times. However, he gradually began to suppress the emotions as the afternoon wore on, and as he did, he began to take notice of small details. The slight change in Itachi's posture, the narrowing of his eyes, the angle of his head, the tensing of his muscles. Naruto's eyes widened in comprehension as the list continued to go on and on. Itachi didn't move, but in some way. Naruto remarked, "It's everything, you're altering everything." Itachi gave a small nod, Orochimaru calls this killing intent, he stated, but what it really is the accumulation of fear stimulus. Itachi attempted to think of another explanation for Naruto's expressionless expression. What do people do when you glare at them with your red eyes? Itachi inquired. With hesitation, Naruto said, they get afraid? Itachi repeated, exactly. And what do they do when you bare your fangs at them? Wondering where this was going, Naruto answered, they get more afraid. Itachi kept going, right again. But, Naruto, we are a race that has huge numbers of instincts that we never need to use anymore, instincts left over from when we were primitive hunters. And there are over 100 more subtle movements that automatically set off a fear reaction in humans. Itachi went on while Naruto felt a shiver go down his spine. I just shifted my weight as if I was going to attack, and I'm sure you felt some fear? Naruto gave a nod. So if I were to do 40 or 50 small motions at once, each of which triggered a small fear reaction, Naruto concluded, they would build up into a paralyzing terror. After giving it some thought, Naruto smiled and flashed his fangs. Teach me. Because he couldn't learn the technique himself until he was completely able to resist its effect, Naruto was exposed to Itachi's fear stimulus for the remainder of the day. By the time supper arrived, Naruto was completely exhausted and went to bed early because Kisami's smirk indicated that he would be waking up at 5:30. The first week went by in this manner, and this time, his progress impressed both of his teachers. He was by no means a genius, but his extraordinary perseverance and diligence more than made up for it. Naruto had mastered the fundamentals of wielding his sword in 6 days, and his movements had become more fluid and refined. Additionally, he had already mastered 15 of the 36 fear stimuli that Itachi intended to teach him. He was working on using them all together, but he had not yet done so successfully. It was decided that Naruto would go with Itachi when it came time for him to go shopping for food and Pocky on the 7th day. Itachi struck up a discussion about handling clients as a missing nin on the way to town. So say you find out that a client wants to meet you at a certain place and time, Itachi continued, what do you do? I'd send a clone, and watch from a distance, Naruto said after giving it some thought. Wrong. Itachi responded with conviction, don't you think Hunter? Nin's plan for that sort of thing? You should go yourself to meet the client. Anything less would be insulting, but use at least 6 clones as sentries. You don't care if the hunter Nins find you. If they are stronger than you, then you're doomed either way, because they will always find you eventually. You just always want to know when they're coming. It's also good to remember that if you are caught in a sting operation, whoever is posing as the client can be used as a hostage or human shield. As they arrived in their own, Naruto took in all of this information. Naruto was left to get all of the usual food after Itachi gave him a shopping list and vanished into the snack shop. Both completed their tasks 2 hours later, but Itachi wanted to make one more stop. Naruto snarled, what do you mean, I need a new sword wrapping? Your current one is too difficult to remove in combat and falls off too easily. Instead of one large piece of cloth that you fold around it, we're going to get you a long strip of cloth to wrap around it, much as Kisame does. Itachi responded with composure. 20 minutes later, Naruto was returning to camp with 60 feet of what appeared to be bandages and a week's worth of groceries. Itachi's payment was the only reason he wasn't whining more than he was. Things quickly returned to normal after they got back to camp, and before Naruto knew it, 4 more days had gone by and they were headed to the Hidden Sound. They spent every available moment planning and training for the 3-day journey. Since Naruto would have to travel alone for the final 12 hours of the journey in order to keep Itachi and Kisame out of range of the Sound's frequent patrols, they halted a day away from the Sound. Each of them was thinking back on the previous weeks as they sat around the fire eating what would be their final meal together. It had been a special chance for Itachi and Kisame to spend time with someone who wasn't scared of them in addition to teaching. No S-class criminals, not even Orochimaru, possessed the aura of fear that Uchiha Itachi and Hoshigaki Kisame possessed. Fear followed them everywhere they went. This boy, however, was not only impervious to it but also found it admirable. Naruto had mastered all 35 fear stimuli during his weeks with Itachi, and he could now use 12 at once without making a mistake. They both discovered that their relationship with the boy was similar to their relationship with one another. They tolerated and accepted one another even though they didn't necessarily like one another. And that was sufficient for individuals such as themselves. Itachi raised his head from his thoughts, giggling a little at his own feelings. A man who had massacred his own family was now developing a weak bond with a boy he had met just a few weeks prior. On the other hand, he wondered how someone defined family as he observed Kisame attempt to teach the boy how to wrap his new bandage like a sword. Itachi had never felt like he belonged anywhere before he became Kisami's partner, and that was a big part of it. Was his family actually the Uchiha clan? As Kisame and Naruto grappled in a heap of tangled cloth, he was startled out of his reverie once more. He watched them silently, grinning. Naruto prepared to depart as the last of the fire was extinguishing. His goal was to reach the sound at the crack of dawn. Itachi handed him his bag, and Kisame simply nodded. Silence seemed appropriate, since they had all agreed that none of them would deny to their graves what had transpired over the past 2 weeks. They would probably never see each other again. Naruto spun around and fled the camp. He discovered a box of double chocolate Pocky in his bag when he stopped for lunch halfway to the sound. Naruto approached the hidden sounds gates cautiously. There was some traffic entering and leaving, and the gates were open. Naruto went up to the guard after waiting for his turn and line. With a bored tone, the guard inquired, "Who are you and what is your reason for being here?" Naruto said without hesitation, "Fushicho Naruto is my name and I'm here to see a swordsmith about getting this," pointing to the neatly wrapped Kabikari Hucho on his back, fixed up. Naruto had rehearsed his speeches until he knew them by heart. The guard gave him a questioning glance. "Village of origin?" "Mist," answered Naruto. "Equivalent rank?" "Chunin." "Time since you left your village?" 1.5 years. The guard waved him through, looking satisfied. Naruto's heart was racing as he walked into the village. They hadn't practiced the final question. Some of the most anticlimactic moments in Naruto's life followed. The hidden sound appeared to be a village. This wasn't what he was expecting, and he wasn't sure what he was expecting. It might have been Konoha, except for the sound's slightly rougher appearance surrounding the edges. Naruto spent some time wandering around and taking in everything that the village of the hidden sound had to offer, but he quickly realized that he had a mission that depended heavily on timing. A few minutes of asking around finally led him to a house, where he was now standing. Kirin was written on the door's nameplate, but it didn't appear to be any sort of store. After that, he noticed smoke emanating from the backyard. His face blanched as he leapt over the fence. Kisami's brother was the only possible identity for this individual. Few people in the world could have such a shark-like appearance. Naruto saw no fire, but he seemed to be hammering on a red-hot chunk of metal. After a minute or two of observing the man, Naruto noticed that his hands were suddenly forming seals as he dipped the metal into a bucket of water. "Gukakyu no Jutsu," the man exclaimed abruptly as he inhaled a flame that consumed the metal. Naruto gave himself a nod. The right man, without a doubt. Jumping back over the fence, Naruto knocked. After a brief period of muttering, Kirin opened the gate with a displeased expression on her face. She then looked down at Naruto and, more specifically, at the wrapped sword on his back. "What do you want, brat?" Naruto smiled. His brother and he shared more than just appearances. With a professional tone, Naruto said, "I have a repair job for you, one probably better discussed in private." Despite giving him a suspicious look, Kirin opened the gate and let him in. He approached the house's back door and opened it, beckoning Naruto inside. After they had settled into a comfortable chair in Kirin's rather dull living room, Naruto removed the sword from his back and, using a thumb flick, he had spent hours perfecting the knot holding the bindings, the cloth dropped off. Everyone was tense back in Konoha. Kunais were being anxiously sharpened throughout the village as the attack force was scheduled to depart for the sound in 6 days. The Sand siblings sat in their designated room, trembling. They received a message from the Sand shortly after Tsunade's announcement, telling them not to bother returning and that 170 ninjas would be sent to support the Konoha attack on the Sound. The irony of this act was not lost on anyone. The 3 siblings were placed on the containment roll. Each of them was assigned a group of Chunin, whose job it was to patrol the forest and ensure that nobody of importance fled the mayhem that would be the hidden Sound. It was at this very moment that Gaara felt uncomfortable. He had nothing to polish, not because he was a murderer or a demon. Tamari was using a dry sponge to buff her fan while Kankuro was meticulously cleaning Karasu. Gaara did nothing but sit there the entire time. Tamari gave her brother a strange look because he had been observing her hand buffing her fan for the past 5 minutes or so. Her nerves weren't feeling well. Although she had previously fought in battle, this time she was leading a group of Chunin, the majority of whom were from the Leaf. She hadn't heard much else, but she was aware that she was in charge of the lazy ass and his team. She wasn't sure she wanted the responsibility of leadership. Gaara's unwavering composure made him a better fit. Tamari buffed frantically after noticing a scuff mark. All she could hope for, she supposed, was that no one dangerous attempted to cross her patch of forest. Kirin was stunned far away. He muttered, Kabikari Hucho, as though he was worried it would vanish. He reached out to touch it, and after Naruto nodded in agreement, he picked it up and looked it over. Kirin inquired, "Where did you get this?" This was something Naruto had practiced. "I was part of Zabuza's group, and am now the only one left alive. I've started to use the sword myself but needed it repaired." Kirin gave him a close look before asking, "Do you know how to handle it?" Nodded. "I've been practicing since Zabuza died, and I like to think I'm proficient. More importantly, how much for you to fix it?" Kirin nodded his head. "I can't be charged for fixing it, the sword isn't broken, it was just never finished." Naruto's eyes widened as Kirin went on. "I was driven out of Hidden Mist before I could finish it. I had heard it had been given to Zabuza the demon, who had also later fled, but I never dreamed I'd see it again." He glanced at Naruto and said, "I don't want any money, it would be my greatest pleasure to finish the sword, but first I need to see you handle it." Kirin never noticed, but Naruto would later come to the conclusion that it was probably not a good idea to show Kirin the routines Kisame had taught him. Naruto realized he would need to be more cautious because it was crucial to the mission that no one, not even Kirin himself, ever discover that he had been collaborating with the Akatsuki. After Naruto showed off for a few minutes, Kirin nodded, but then she surprised the boy by asking, "Okay, so you're good up close, how good is your aim?" Naruto blinked. "Aim? When you throw it," Kirin said with a frustrated expression. Once more, Naruto blinked. Since the sword had been flying in the air over his head the first time he had seen it, he felt incredibly foolish. The boy had demonstrated his ability to wield the sword, Kirin sighed. "Okay, new condition," said Kirin. "I will finish the sword, but after you have to learn how to make use of its full potential, otherwise, you're wasting it, and I won't allow that." Naruto gave a nod. It was better than he had anticipated. He learned that Kirin was to be left alone until Kabikari Hucho was finished, which would require 5 days of diligent work. Naruto had 5 days of free time as a result, which was unprecedented for him. Naruto first found a ramen stand and ordered 12 bowls, but after that, he decided to train since he had nothing else to do. He located a good training ground and joined the others. When everyone else on the field glared at him in the mist he was creating, he tried practicing Kirigakure no Jutsu once before switching to Taijutsu. For the next 5 days, he threw himself into training, striving to build up the strength he knew he would need to survive. Shinobi were preparing for war in Konoha in a similar manner. When Naruto returned to Kirin's shop on the 5th day, the man himself emerged with a bundle wrapped in cloth. Tsunade strode to a podium in Konoha and confronted her soldiers. The swordsmith and Hokage spoke in nearly perfect sync, despite being hundreds of miles apart and speaking in quite different tones. "It's time for you to show me what you've got." Kirin grinned at Naruto's response and let the cloth drop. Physically, the sword appeared largely unchanged, but the blade. Something had discolored the blade so that it was dark, nearly black, and unreflective. In some way, it gave the sword a more menacing appearance. Kirin stopped Naruto before he could touch it. "Before you so much as touch this sword," Kirin continued, "you have to understand what it is. It has changed in many more ways than what you can see. Do you know why the 7 Mist Tenkan are called that? Why they are called Heavenly Swords?" Naruto gave a headshake. "Because," Kirin went on, "they are more than just swords, that is why they are given names. After all, each Tenkan is forged using a number of forbidden jutsus that allow it to contain a bit of its wielder's essence, and its powers reflect that. My brother Samahata can smell and eat chakra, showing our family's rather shark-like personalities." With a smile that revealed his pointed teeth, Kirin went on, rapidly returning to his serious demeanor. "But it also means that taking up one of the Tenkan is a lifelong commitment. The sword is part of you until the day you die. Zabuza never had that connection with his sword because the jutsus needed were never done, but you need to understand what you're getting into. Are you sure you still want to go through with this?" Naruto grinned at Kirin as he reflected on his experiences with the blade over the past few months and how it had begun to feel like an extension of his body. "The sword is already a part of me," Naruto replied, "so it's only fair that I give it some of myself." With a nod, Kirin handed Naruto the sword with caution. "Now, I'm not sure what's going to happen when we do this," Kirin continued. "Most of the Tenkan start looking something like that." He said to Kabikari, "When my brother did the blood ritual, his sword grew scales." Despite raising an eyebrow, Naruto allowed Kirin to go on. "First of all," Kirin said, "you need to carefully slit both your wrists with a kunai." Nervously, Naruto pulled out a kunai and did so. The blood flowed freely. "Now," Kirin went on, "hold the sword upside down with both hands so your blood runs down the blade, and with the handle still between your hands, Copy the hand seals I show you. When Naruto finished and grasped the final seal, his wrist wounds healed, his blood seeped into the blade, and he felt as though something had been ripped from him. As a whirlpool of red and blue chakra whirled around him, he dropped to one knee and leaned on the sword. He noticed that his seal was spinning wildly, just like it had done with the Shikifujin Kai, and he felt a strange burning sensation in his stomach. He watched as the outer two seals on his stomach vanished, leaving only the spiral seal, but he felt the chakra suddenly being drawn back into his body. After a brief moment of panic, Naruto inhaled deeply and felt inside his body. To his pleasant surprise, the Kyuubi's chakra was still sealed, precisely where it should have been. However, something was absent, and he sensed a strange pull at the back of his mind. He heard Kirin gasp a little, and his breath was taken from him as he returned to reality. The image of a blood-red 9-tailed fox engaged in combat with a deep, blue dragon was now engraved in the finest detail on the dark blade. The name written next to the handle began to change a moment later, with the kanji rearranging and twisting to read Spirit Cutter, or Seirei Kurite. He sat there on the ground, laughing hysterically as he felt a sense of confusion emanate from the sword. In addition to taking a piece of him, the sword also took the Kyuubi's soul. After 15 minutes and a great deal of explanation, Kirin was nodding his head. It made perfect sense when he considered it. No matter how strong the seal, the Kyuubi's soul would be much less attached than Naruto's, so the jutsu had taken it. The jutsu was made to take a portion of a person's soul. This resulted in a bewildered demon fox inside the sword and Kyuubi's chakra inside Naruto, still joyfully blending with the help of the remaining spiral seal. Naruto also thought it strange that he could sense the fox's thoughts and feelings in a hazy way. At the moment, said fox was incredibly unsteady. He had been in that cage for years, feeling all of his chakra but not being able to perceive anything. Now that he was able to sense his surroundings, using his chakra was like drinking the ocean through a straw. His sense was merely a perception of what was close by, not a precise kind of sight. He also discovered that he and the brat shared a certain amount of empathy. The fox was attempting to draw on Naruto's chakra from inside the sword when he felt a slight pull on it while he was sitting on the floor of Kirin's living room. The sword began to flicker with a red glow as he relaxed his chakra control and allowed the fox to take some. Naruto was holding the sword, which was encircled by a shifting red aura, when Kirin returned to the room. He took a seat on the sofa and watched the boy. Kirin was captivated by this situation, which she had never witnessed before. Subsequent research showed that the Kyuubi could manifest body parts if he was given enough chakra. Since the fox was still a little miffed over the arm severing incident, Naruto suffered a significant number of nicks and gashes as a result. However, this was the direct cause of the subsequent discovery. Naruto was able to use his own chakra to manifest in addition to controlling the fox's chakra level. After all, Naruto had to worry about controlling his own body, so nothing as complicated as what the Kyuubi could handle. However, he quickly discovered that he could use the sword to send a tiny burst of chakra. Now I get it, Kirin said abruptly, breaking the silence. Naruto was going to inquire about Kirin's gift, but he was unable to do so because the shark man continued talking. What was it you said before the ritual? That you felt the sword was part of your body. That's the power of your sword, to exude chakra from it as if it were a part of your body. But Kyuubi complicated things. That also explains the engraving. The red 9-tailed fox is obvious, but the blue dragon represents your chakra. The two creatures in the engraving are fighting, but they are also intertwined, much as you must be. Therefore your essence is mixed with the demons, and that's what's holding Kyuubi's soul in the sword. Kirin hurried on, now totally engrossed in his own world. Naruto gave Kirin a wary glance. Meaning, Kirin replied with a confident voice, that the only reason Kyuubi still exists now that he's apart from his chakra is because he is, in the literal sense, now part of you. You aren't two separate beings anymore, you're one being with two minds and two chakras. Even though Naruto found this thought to be incredibly comforting, it also meant that the fox would be forced to reconsider killing him, which was a good thing. Now that that's over with, it's time for a sword-throwing lesson, he said with a smile, Kirin continuing to talk without any awareness of the atmosphere. Naruto scowled. For added impact, he included a few fear stimuli. Alternatively, Kirin added, we could begin the lesson early tomorrow morning. Naruto nodded, needing some alone time to practice his sword. Naruto gave Kyuubi enough chakra to make a head appear for the demon after Kirin left the room. Naruto made an effort to appear calm, as though he had daily conversations with red fox heads that glowed from his sword. The demon remarked, well, brat, this is definitely an intriguing twist. It changes little, said Naruto. You still need me to stay alive, and since I know how much you look forward to dying, I figure you'll contribute to my well-being no matter how much you hate me. Kyuubi chuckled. Yes, I suppose that's true. And I have to admit, this form allows me a great deal more freedom than that cage your belly and. Before anything, let's get one thing straight. We hate each other, correct? Interrupted Naruto. With a savage smile, the fox head nodded. But you need me to give you access to chakra or you're about as useful as Sakura. That had been harsh. The fox flinched. But I'm stuck with you either way. So here's how things work. You help me fight, which you love to do anyway, and in return, I'll give you chakra. The only rule is that if you ever hurt someone without what I think is a valid reason, I'll cut you off forever. Do we understand each other? The demon said, I suppose, with a faint sigh of irritation. Since he was unable to leave the brat behind, he would simply seize the chance to cause havoc whenever it presented itself. He had learned patience from his 14 years in a cage. As the head disappeared, Naruto let out a sigh and fell to the ground. He was worn out, and it was only supper time. After an uneventful evening, Naruto got up early the following morning to prepare for his throwing lesson. After guiding him out of the concealed sound and into the forest, Kirin found a tree that he liked. He then led Naruto to a location 140 feet away and instructed him to attempt chopping the tree in half. After failing miserably the first few times, either missing the tree or only nicking it, Naruto felt the familiar tug that indicated Seirei Kurite, or more precisely, Kyuubi, wanted chakra on his 9th attempt. As he released the throw, he charged the sword with chakra, and it not only expertly sliced through the tree but also turned back to Naruto's grasp. He smiled. The demon could use chakra to control it. Kirin was a little surprised. Okay then, I guess it's on to lesson 2. Learning the Shuriken Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, which Kirin said was essential, was the second lesson. Applying it to a weapon wasn't too difficult for Naruto because he had used the regular variant before, and he picked it up fast. The only difference was that Naruto referred to it as the Kurite Kage Bunshin no Jutsu because he felt it was offensive to call his sword a shuriken. During the remainder of the morning, Kyuubi demonstrated his ability to wield 9 swords simultaneously, 8 shadow clones and the original, all of which he used with joy to clear a sizable portion of the forest to stumps. Kirin decided that Naruto could leave at 3 o'clock since he had run out of things to teach and was no longer a true ninja. Naruto ran back into town. He had to be prepared for the operation, which would begin in 4 days. He had devised a straightforward plan with the 2 Akatsuki. The sound was about to be invaded by Naruto. Not really, of course, but enough chaos and devastation would be created that it would be easy to forget about Hoshigaki Kirin's passing. The issue had been how to make Naruto appear like an invading army, but after much deliberation, they had a viable solution, which Naruto began implementing over the course of the following 3 days. He started by pretending to be a regular worker with a fertilizer bag. Nobody saw that the bag had a hole in it, and pieces fell out everywhere he went. People were unaware that the bag contained gunpowder rather than fertilizer. Kirin lived close to the south gate, and Naruto had enough gunpowder lying around for nearly 2 days that even the smallest spark would set some of it on fire, but people simply dismissed it as a lighter malfunction. His last day was spent putting up shuriken launchers on the tops of houses, which, when triggered, would shoot the kunai into the air and cause them to fall in the street, appearing as if they had been thrown over the houses. He had gone from being a workman to a repairman. On the night before the mission, Naruto sat and considered his plan, making sure he hadn't missed anything. He would get up early the following day and begin his fictitious assault an hour later. Naruto intended to launch his invasion by creating as many shadow clones as he could, each of whom would be disguised as a different leaf ninja using henge. Itachi and Kisame would pose as sound ninjas, take Kirin out of his house, and then set it on fire. They had no intention of staying in the village for more than 15 minutes. 8.5 hours after the sound, Kisame quickly woke up his partner after spotting what seemed like a huge number of approaching chakra sources. Tamari led her advance team 9 hours from the sound. Since they were supposed to cover the north gate, they would need to make their way around the entire village to reach their positions without raising any alarms from the sound sentries. Tsunade was in charge of the main invasion force 9.5 hours away from the hidden sound. They would rest an hour or so away from the village and launch their attack at dawn. Naruto was knocked from Kirin's couch, where he had been sleeping, 30 minutes before dawn. Kisame and Itachi were standing above him, disguised and resembling sound ninjas. "What's wrong?" he asked, glancing at the clock. As if discussing the weather, Itachi stated, "A leaf invasion force will be here in 10 minutes. For a brief moment, Naruto appeared perplexed. A real one? Itachi gave a nod. This will be a pain, won't it? Naruto muttered. Itachi gave another nod. So we'll have to fight our way out? Which way? Naruto asked as he got up from the couch and began getting dressed after Kisame left to wake his brother. Itachi considered for a moment, then calmly took out a stick of strawberry pocky and checked his watch, saying, 7 minutes. North, he said, assuming you have everything set up for our plan. The first fire jutsu used in this area of town will light this place up, so we need to get out of the south end before the Leaf arrive in. With a rather irritated Kirin on his shoulder, Kisame dashed back into the room. When Kirin saw Naruto with Itachi, his eyes widened, but he understood right away. The three of them dashed out the back and jumped up onto the roof. People were rushing around making last-minute defense preparations, and the hidden sound was in disarray. Kirigakure no Jutsu was uttered by the three of them as they passed their hands through seals and, for a brief moment, every eye in the concealed sound was pointing in their direction. The fog began to gather. More chakra had been added to the mist by the three of them than was necessary to call forth 8 Gamabuntas, and soon the entire hidden sound and its surroundings were covered in it. After setting his brother down, Kisame and Naruto drew their swords and flicked off their wrappings in a kind of eerie synchronization. Naruto's black engraved blade caused both Akatsuki to raise their eyebrows, but they chose to ask Kirin a question later. Naruto took a moment to run his hands over the kanji he had scratched in all those weeks prior before carefully tying on his forehead protector after reaching into his pocket. Gazing out into the mist, he could feel Seirei Kurit's heart pounding with anticipation. Itachi took Kirin without saying anything, and the three shinobi plunged into the mist. Each of them already knew what they had to do, so they ran north in silence. Naruto would proceed while Itachi and Kisame broke right at the north gate. Naruto would have to divert the attention of a containment unit of shinobi to prevent them from carrying out their exact actions. There could be no knowledge of Akatsuki, and since the attackers were the Leaf, there was an even greater risk of being discovered. Everyone else was going south to fight, but they arrived at the north gate without any problems. They heard and saw a massive explosion on the south side of town as they were getting there. By now, both armies would be totally perplexed. Just outside the gate, Itachi made a sharp right turn, which Naruto anticipated. Naruto paused on top of the gate and gazed out into the fog-covered woodland. In order to gaze over what would soon be a battlefield, he had done everything he had since leaving his village, not as a Konoha Genin or even as a Konoha Nukenin, but as Fushicho Naruto. A dark grin spread across his face. However, he reasoned, he would be merely a demonic mirage to his opponents. With caution, Akamichi Choji peered into the fog. The instant this strange fog had descended, he had deployed his multi-size no jutsu. Naruto, less than 40 feet away, was silently cursing. Although he was aware that it was gentle, he truly didn't want to murder the few individuals who had shown him some degree of kindness. He sent a clear message to the eager sword by hefting it. Until Naruto says so, don't kill. He drew his arm back and threw the sword as it pulsed in his hand. Choji sensed something approaching and leapt aside as it passed by. It appeared to be a massive sword. He instantly became extremely vigilant, searching for anything that might indicate the location of his adversary. When he turned in horror and saw 3 enormous blades sticking out from his back, he lurched once and then twice more. A moment later, each blade turned to smoke. The big man was able to yell before collapsing to his knees and fainting, then he grew back to his normal size. He was already in the way of Naruto's sprint to the next foe. He had practiced the leaf containment unit formation numerous times, so he was familiar with it. Yamanaka Ino had no knowledge. She was unable to sense Naruto even though he was less than 5 feet away. He walked around her until he was behind her, then calmly cut her spinal cord close to her waist with a shallow cut, watching her fall apart like a puppet. He reasoned that he was rescuing her from a brutal death in battle, even though she would never be able to walk again. Her shinobi skills were poor. There was just one more now. He really didn't want the 3 dead, but he was willing to take a chance here. As anticipated, he felt his body instantly freeze as he leapt to the spot where the 3rd member should be posted. Even without seeing Shikamaru, he was certain the genius would somehow catch him in a shadow bind. He knew Shikamaru was somewhere in the mist. At this point, it became risky. He sent a chakra pulse to the sword, and it returned a sense of comprehension. He poured demonic chakra into the blade, opening the floodgates. The aura of the blade transformed into a gigantic claw that soared into the night. A grunt was heard by Naruto, and the shadow bind was broken. The part about running like hell now came. Even by Kyuubi's standards, manifesting required an absurd amount of chakra, as any shinobi within 3 miles would have realized. In a few minutes, an investigative team would arrive. He hoped the leaf was the source. However, there was a single issue. Because of the size of his team, Naruto had only practiced containment operations with 3 people, although he was unaware of this. It was common practice to have a 4th member, further out in the field. Because of this, Naruto was taken aback when he was flung against a tree by a hurricane. Force wind. After a speedy recovery, he found himself facing someone he knew he would lose to in a now mistless clearing. He was depleted of chakra from the Kyuubi's manifestation and the massive Kirigakure no Jutsu. More importantly, though, he owed the restless boy far too much, and even though he couldn't recall her name, he couldn't harm Gaara's sister. When her blood froze, Temari was circling her fan for another blast. Naruto simply let his body fall into what the Sharingan master had referred to as the death stance, as Itachi had taught him. Naruto identified it as a set of fear stimuli that Orochimaru had employed in the forest, giving the target a sense of impending doom and paralyzing terror. He couldn't afford to let her tell anyone about him because she had seen him and was handling the leaf. He was still in a weak death stance that would wear off in a matter of seconds. Naruto decided that he would come up with something later because he didn't have time right now. Temari struggled to regain control over her body because, although she knew rationally that she was powerless in this situation, the fear was still too great. In less than 3 seconds, Naruto leapt into action and crossed the clearing of sliced trees between them. Temari's last vision was of a pair of evil eyes piercing her own. Before sprinting as quickly as he could into the forest, Naruto threw the unconscious girl over his shoulder and took one final look back at the chaos behind him. A few short hours later, a certain long-haired Hyuga would notice a necklace glinting in the sunlight, and the remains of Naruto's bag, long forgotten, lay in the smoldering pile of wood that had once been Kirin's house. Note from the author. Well, I guess I forgot the story again. Even though I am completely incapable of describing fight scenes, I rather like how this chapter turned out even though I hadn't planned anything involving the Kyuubi. Unfortunately, anyone hoping for romance right away will be let down. You can probably wait a few more chapters because it took 9 chapters for the characters to meet. Regarding the sword's new name, Seirei Kurite, which translates to spirit cutter, the word Seirei suggests that the spirit is good or holy, which highlights the sword's somewhat sinister nature. For the avoidance of confusion, the majority of Kyuubi's chakra is still sealed away and is gradually blending with Naruto's. As a result, Naruto controls all of his blue chakra as well as a portion of his red. Kyuubi can only access as much chakra as Naruto because he now draws all of his chakra from Naruto's chakra reserves. Naruto laughed. He couldn't help it because his companion was so adorable, even though he knew it wasn't the right moment. The 12-inch tall fox gave him a menacing glare. The little fox was growing irritated as they stood in front of the locked gate in Naruto's mindscape. After giving biting the boy's ankle some thought, he decided it would only be degrading to himself. Through the gate, they were treated to a strange scene that resembled a sunset. Behind the seal, a sea of red energy, the demon's chakra just sat there. With the fox now on his side of the seal, there was no one to push the chakra through, so it just slowly leaked out. Naruto sighed, hoping there might be a way to draw on this ocean of chakra. He was given the opportunity to irritate a small demon fox as a consolation prize. Without it, the demon reverted to the smallest and most effective form imaginable because his chakra was responsible for maintaining his form within the mindscape. He became hilariously cute as a result. The demon was obviously not enjoying the humor. The 5th Hokage looked around at the devastation in what had been the hidden sound hours before. Orochimaru was dead, but sacrifices had been made and lives had been lost. She walked back into the makeshift hospital and began caring for the constantly arriving injured. Most of the sound nins had surrendered right away after the death of their leader. Sasuke had not been seen, which was unfortunate, but the invasion had been well planned. Unless there are 2 exceptions. The strange commotion at the northern gate was the first. None of the shinobi had been killed, but 3 had suffered serious injuries and 1 was still unaccounted for. According to her own examination, Ino appeared to have been slashed once across the back by a large, sharp object, while Shikamaru and Choji had wounds from an unidentified source. The cut was too shallow, too intentional, and too well planned to have been an accident. Shikamaru appeared to have had his arm nearly severed by a massive hand, and Choji suffered 3 deep gashes in his back. However, these injuries were not fatal. Whoever had attacked them had resisted. Gaara had been extremely agitated since learning of his sister's disappearance, so she was waiting for one of the three to come to and provide her with a clearer picture of what had transpired. The other issue, and, to be honest, the one that the Hokage was most concerned about, was the necklace's discovery. Hyuga Neji had mentioned in passing that he had discovered a necklace that bore a striking resemblance to the one Naruto used to wear while he was in the hospital due to a severe case of chakra burn from using Kaden excessively. Unlike most people, Hyuga Neji meant, exactly like, rather than, really similar to, when he used that phrase. Tsunade insisted that he show it to her right away, and he did. The necklace was identical. Weeks after his passing, Naruto's necklace was somehow making an appearance in the hidden sound. The numbers didn't add up. Tsunade had that persistent sense that she had missed something, but she wasn't sure what it was yet. She was startled out of her reverie when a group of civilians who had been in a building that Manda had destroyed were brought in. Tamari floated. Nothingness surrounded her weightless body. Sight revealed only darkness. All ears could hear was a curse. Tamari opened her eyes slowly and blinked into what seemed like an intensely bright light. She was sitting, leaning against something, and unable to move her arms once she was mostly conscious and began to notice her surroundings. She was now rapidly awakening. Her eyes finally focused in time to see a pair of dark red eyes staring into hers as the cursing she had been hearing abruptly stopped. Then she remembered. There was only one reason to keep a shinobi alive and awake, and that was after she had lost in the forest. Her eyes widened in terror. To get information, torture them. Tamari tried desperately to bite off her tongue in a panic, but she bit it instead after feeling a hand thrust into her mouth. Naruto scowled. Even though he was aware of her initial reaction, his hand was in excruciating pain. With his other hand, he took hold of her head and made her turn back to face him. "For the love of God, stop biting my hand," Naruto said in a somewhat strained voice. "I am not going to torture, kill, violate, abuse, or harm you." After digging her teeth in for a moment more, Tamari released her grip and glared at her captor. After shaking his hand to restore blood flow, Naruto gave the struggling girl a kind smile. "My name is Fushicho Naruto, and yours is?" Glaring, Tamari said, "Screw you." As Naruto raised his sword and brought it down sharply, his courteous smile transformed into a grin. Tamari let out a scream. The blade was less than an inch above her head when he stopped it. The corners of her eyes began to well up with tears. As Tamari snarled, "Bastard, your name?" asked Naruto, still grinning. She spat her name at him, Tamari, as if it were a curse. After giving this some thought, Naruto nodded and turned to head into the woods. He called behind him, "Tamari-san, don't go anywhere." Naruto fell against a tree as soon as he was out of her sight. Throughout his years as a shinobi, he had always been someone subordinate and never been in charge. He was making all of the decisions for the first time, which made him extremely afraid. He wasn't very good at being mean, so he knew the "act like Kisame" trick wouldn't last. In any case, he would have to keep her close by until he came up with another plan because the girl had already seen too much of him for her to be released. Naruto fought the impulse to curse once more. Alone now, Tamari paused to consider her situation more thoroughly. Her hands were tied behind her as she sat on the ground with her back to a tree. She thought about it for a moment before attempting to move her hands once more after noticing that her hair was loose. She was bound with her own hair ties by the bastard. Additionally, her fan was nowhere to be found, which greatly disturbed her because without it, she was essentially worthless in a fight. The bastard, as she now called him, returned to her line of sight as swiftly as he had left. This time, Tamari made the decision to initiate the conversation. She said, "I really hate you," in her most threatening voice. She was shocked and outraged when the bastard began to make fun of her. When he eventually calmed down and managed to reply, 30 seconds later, he was still laughing, and Tamari was beginning to worry that he might have gone insane. "You hate me?" Naruto chuckled. "Listen, little girl. There are a very large number of people in this world who hate me, and pretty much all of them are more frightening than you. Hell, I'm more afraid of my sword than I am of you." The fact that Naruto was actually 3 years younger than the Sand.Nin was a minor detail, but she didn't need to be aware of it. Naruto suddenly got serious, but all that is really unimportant. What is important is that right now, you are in my control, and you are also very pissed off about it. Naruto went on, "I'm going to give you a hypothetical situation, and you need to tell me what you'd do, agreed?" Without receiving any response. Tamari scowled. That sounded like a yes to Naruto. "You," he stated, "are a missing.nin, one who has protected their identity so well. There are 3 people in the world who know who you are." Then one day, An enemy sees you, someone who could identify you. Normally you'd kill them, but something is preventing you from doing so. What options are left over? Tamari was not happy with the conclusion she was reaching, and she had long since realized where this was going. Seeing that she grasped his point in any case, he went up to her and kept talking. So as you can see, there's no point in being angry at me since I have no more control of this situation than you do. I can't kill you and I can't let you go, so now that we understand each other, he penetrated her bindings. Tamari had a concealed kunai in her hand and was preparing to stab within a half-second. After a half-second, she was on the ground with the kunai pointing at the back of her neck and her arm twisted backward. Naruto said, taking his sword off his back and setting it beside her, "Nay Tamari-san, we will probably have to put up with each other for a while, so please don't do that. I need to go hunt for something to eat, and you may move 20 feet in any direction, but no further, and must always have this sword right next to you." Then he let go of her arm and strolled off into the woods. Naruto sent back an image of Tamari restrained by fox claws, along with what was left of his chakra, after he felt the sword sending him an image of Tamari preparing to run, as was to be expected. Tamari nearly let out another scream. The sword developed clawed arms and seized her just as she was ready to flee. Once more, Naruto entered the forest after returning to the clearing. "One more thing, Tamari-san, the sword is intelligent," he said, pausing, "but I see you've already learned that." With her arms extended and the sword resting silently beside her, Tamari lay on the forest floor, gazing up at the fading sky. "You know," she told it, "I've always thought of myself as somewhat of an authority on weird homicidal shinobi, but this guy is something else." She exhaled, 24 hours ago I was preparing for a minor role in an invasion, now, my team is probably dead, I'm in a forest somewhere, prisoner of a demon-eyed boy who manages to be polite and terrifying at the same time, and being guarded by a sword." The sword was remarkably silent. Tamari put a hand on her forehead and said, "It feels like I'm living a twisted nightmare." She felt a breeze, but she abruptly jumped to her feet when she heard a voice behind her. "Is it really that bad? I know the slitted red eyes thing throws people off, but I think terrifying is a little strong. AANNNND. He continued, drawing the word out, "I'll have you know that not a single one of your minions is dead, though I did cripple the blonde one." Naruto smiled at Tamari, who glared once more. Tamari was irritated and asked, "So what are we having to eat exactly?" She was truly hungry. Naruto held out both hands and smiled broadly, saying, "One dead rabbit and one box of double chocolate Pocky." Tamari simply let her head hang. The boy was insane. He must be. If he couldn't kick her ass so effectively, she would laugh herself silly at him. Actually, it didn't take much for his sword to immobilize her. His weapon was stronger than hers. While Naruto built a fire and began cooking the rabbit, Tamari was preoccupied with these kinds of positive thoughts. They decided to go to bed early because they were both exhausted and the food was consumed quickly. Even though they were only lying on the ground with their clothes on, Tamari insisted that Naruto keep a reasonable distance from her while she kept watch with the sword next to her. Soon after, they both began to nod off, but Tamari managed to regain consciousness long enough to pose a question to the sleepy Naruto. "In that hypothetical situation we talked about, why can't I kill the one who saw me?" For a moment, she saw something concealed in his eyes as he turned to face her. He grinned at her and said, "That's for me to know and you to go crazy wondering about." It was gone in an instant. Although it was a typical response from him, Tamari remained awake for an additional 30 minutes, wondering about that brief glimpse of depth. Tsunade went outside to observe the sunrise the morning following the invasion. Even though she had been working through the night, they had far fewer casualties than anticipated. Gaara was already outside. He had been up all night too, but that was nothing out of the ordinary for him. As the first rays of light appeared over the horizon, the two stood silently. The words, "Hokage Sama, I have a confession to make," were spoken by Gaara with hesitation. "Naruto's alive, isn't he?" Tsunade said without even looking up. Gaara gave a nod. Tsunade's hands clenched into fists, and she realized that she couldn't blame Gaara because Naruto had made the decision to go. Her fingernails sunk into her flesh, causing blood to trickle from her hands. Naruto had been in this exact village. Though she couldn't even fathom what would have brought him here in the first place, she hoped he had left before the invasion, but she had no choice but to do what she was about to do. Tsunade didn't let herself falter once as she strode purposefully all the way to where she knew Shizune would be organizing diplomatic meetings for when they returned to Konoha. She cut off her assistant in the middle of writing a scroll that would be sent to the different nations to inform them of the defeat sounds. Shizune, she said, trying not to stutter, Uzumaki Naruto is hereby registered as an A-class missing.nin. Location unknown, as of right now. Let the hunters know. Ignoring the shocked expression on her face, Tsunade spun around and left, fighting back tears. A night's sleep did wonders for his chakra supply, and the newly official missing.nin was just waking up, oblivious to his predicament, feeling incredibly refreshed. Before pausing to reflect, he looked at Temari to make sure she was still asleep. He could go either east or west at this point. Going east would take him to Hidden Cloud, which was far from and an enemy of Hidden Leaf, while going west would take him almost directly to Hidden Waterfall, but he would still be directly above Fire Country. It was east. He had enough money to last him for a while, but he had lost his extra clothes, and he needed time to figure out what to do with the annoying sand.nin before he began actively seeking missions. As Temari began to stir, Naruto sighed, wishing Itachi were here so that his Sharingan could simply impress the girl with their coolness and then she would follow orders, a tactic the Uchiha had never taught him. Unconsciously, he released some chakra after feeling a tug in his mind. He heard a shout behind him and turned to see Temari glaring at Seirei Kurite, who turned to Naruto with a furious expression. "I was just groped by your sword." "What?" Temari was furious, saying, "My ass was just grabbed by a glowing red claw." Naruto regarded her with suspicion, but he soon began to feel gratified by Kyuubi. He really didn't need this first thing in the morning, so Naruto pinched the bridge of his nose. For Temari's benefit, he said aloud, "Okay, you," pointing to the sword, "no manifesting unless there's a reason." "And you don't give him a reason," he said, gesturing to Temari. Temari appeared outraged, and the sword was brimming with arrogance. Given that they both seemed to understand, Naruto went on. "At this moment, we are moving east. The closest village is at least a day and a half away, and we are without supplies. Temari, you have to always carry the sword on your back and stay within 30 feet of me, or I'll restrain and carry you." Temari managed to look both angry and a little ashamed at the same time, as if the sword were suddenly glaring at her. "All right," she whispered, "but I need a knot for my hair." "Why?" Naruto asked right away. "It falls in my face, making it difficult to see and looking foolish," she said irritably. "Your hair looks fine, and I'm the only one who can see it anyway," Naruto said after giving this some thought. He had spent his entire life surrounded by whiny girls who spend all of their time complaining about how they looked. However, there's always the option of being carried if you're having vision problems. Growling, "I'll be fine," she said. Temari wondered the entire time if the first part of the bastard's last remark had been an insult or a compliment as they quickly made their way through the forest. Throughout the Leaf Camp, word quickly spread that Naruto had been registered as a Nukenin. Many shinobi were already advocating for a special hunter.nin squad dedicated solely to killing the Foxboy, and it soon became the most talked about topic in the camp. Tsunade was aware that this would occur, but she also understood that she couldn't let her emotions interfere with the necessary actions. After sensing someone behind her, she turned to see Amino Iruka standing tensely by her tent's door, and she motioned for him to come in, which he did with a swift bow. The Chunin with the brown hair paused and said, "Hokage. Sama, I wanted to check with you because I've been hearing some disturbing rumors around camp. Do you really have Naruto listed as a missing nin?" Tsunade nodded and concluded sorrowfully, "It now appears that he faked his own death to cover his betrayal. In that case, Hokage. Sama, there's something I'd like to give you," Iruka said, casting a sorrowful glance at the ground. He gave her a piece of paper and hurried out of the tent, saying, "Please give it some serious thought." Tsunade's eyes widened as she took in what he had given her. An application to join the hunter nin was submitted. Naruto found himself in a challenging circumstance once more. They were now only an hour or two away from a small town on the edge of Sound Country, having made good progress. Fortunately, Temari had remained silent for the most recent portion of their journey because Naruto needed to figure out how to keep her under control in the town. He would have to be more subdued in populated areas because he didn't want to attract attention by grabbing onto people with glowing red arms. He was aware that they both required a bath and clean clothes, so continuous physical contact was not an option. Kyuubi provided him with an image as his response. The demon had most likely proposed it because Naruto knew the sand girl would not approve. When he raised a hand, the two shinobi came to a halt and nearly fell to the ground simultaneously. Temari turned to glare at him, as he had noticed she always did. He couldn't decide if that was good or bad, but it meant that she was at least less scared of him now. The angry girl insisted, "Why are we stopping so close to a village?" "As I'm sure you know," Naruto replied, "it will be more difficult to watch you once we're in town." For days, Tamari had been aware that she was counting on it and would be searching for an opportunity to get away. And you also know, he went on, that my normal methods of restraining you won't work. So, with help from Seirei Kurite, I have come up with a solution. Naruto approached the girl, grabbed her back sword, and used a kunai to make a tiny cut in her clothing just above her waist. What the hell do you think you're doing? Was her response, of course. Naruto took hold of her arm and covered the hole with the sword on her back while remaining composed. This way, he continued, if you cause problems, the manifested restraints can go under your clothing. Naruto wasn't sure if her redness was from anger or embarrassment at this point. There is, of course, another option, but I didn't think you'd go for having to hold my hand 24/7. And if you don't try to run or kill me, it won't be a problem either way. The bad news was that she had been preparing to either kill him or try to get away, or probably both. Tamari was determined to win the war even though she knew she had lost this battle. She would be there when he made a mistake, which he would eventually have to do. After leaping back into the trees, the two shinobi continued their journey. Naruto took his disobedient but exhausted prisoner to one of the first decent hotels he saw because they had arrived in town rather late. They had spent 2 nights sleeping on the ground, and he could afford it. He swiftly dragged Tamari upstairs and found a standard 2-bedroom room. They had been attracting attention with their strange appearance and enormous sword. Naruto established some rules once they were inside. Okay. Your leaving this room requires one of 2 things, either you're with me, or you've told me where you're going and you take Seirei Kurite. This place had public baths, or am I supposed to just not wash myself? Tamari asked, irritated. Naruto performed several hand seals. After a cloud of smoke, he was a girl with dark hair. He had added clothing to his typical sexy no jutsu. He smiled. Me or the sword, your pick. Tamari had to decide between a creepy sword and a bothersome boy. The sword remained silent. Seirei Kurite was taken by her. With the sword still in her hand, Tamari slid into the water. Since the bathroom was unoccupied, she didn't want to give the blade the opportunity to restrain her while she was naked. When she was comfortable, she raised the sword above the water. It was the first time she had really looked at it for a long time. Normalcy ended with the handle, which was ordinary. No matter how she angled it, the blade reflected virtually no light. She proceeded to the engraving. The fact that both sides were carved in a mirror image of one another still astounded her. The 2 enormous monsters engaged in battle looked genuinely alive, and the carving was flawless. She moved her hand slowly over the engraved image, beginning at the hilt where the fox's tails began. The dragon and fox twisted around one another near the center of the blade, each attempting to deliver a lethal blow. It was clear that a battle was coming to an end, but Tamari was shocked to learn that no one would ever find out who had prevailed. Just before the winner was determined, the 2 would be immortalized. Tamari came to the realization that she had simply accepted the sword's sentience without ever questioning how or why. Who was she to doubt an intelligent sword when her younger brother was always carrying intelligent sand? She was curious now, though. Determining to ask him about it later, she sank further into the warm water. Naruto was slapping his own head back in the room. The Kyuubi decided it would be amusing to send random images of a wet Tamari straight into Naruto's head every few seconds while he was working on a map, planning their route to and through Lightning Country. The demon took care to position each picture so that it hinted at everything while revealing nothing. On the inside of the sword, Kyuubi smiled to himself. It was enjoyable. It was a new experience for him because he had never had the opportunity to do such things before. Tormenting these 2 was nearly as much fun as destroying a village, he thought as Naruto began pounding his head against the table. Nearly. An hour later, Tamari returned to their room with her clothes and a towel wrapped around her. Naruto was lying on his bed and didn't even look up because he knew that doing so would make him flush. Like Naruto, Tamari washed her clothes in the restroom while taking a bath. When her captor remained silent for this long, she knew something strange was happening because she had spent enough time with him. By now, she calculated, he ought to have cracked at least 3 wisecracks. A moment later, she came out of the restroom still wrapped in her towel, but Naruto could see as he looked over that she had her net shirt on underneath it. She crawled under her bed's covers, unlike the fox boy. After a few moments of staring at the ceiling, Tamari found herself nodding off. Sometime later, she was roused, but a quick silent check of the clock revealed that it was only 2 a.m. Tamari saw Naruto sitting at the table in the corner of the room, where a lamp was on. Naruto was studying something on top of the table while Seirei Kurite leaned against the opposite side. Tamari half whispered, "Are you aware it's 2 o'clock in the morning?" "Yeah." Tamari took a quick look at his study on the table. She questioned, "Why are you playing chess with yourself?" "I'm not," was Naruto's response. "So, with whom are you playing?" With skepticism, Temari asked, but just as she was done, a clawed hand emerged from the sword and moved a fragment. "Does your sword play chess?" Temari blinked. Then Naruto nodded and said, "He's pretty good at it too." "Oh," Temari paused, then said, "I'm posing this question. Why are you using your sword to play chess at 2 in the morning?" Naruto used one of his bishops to capture his opponent, knight. "Couldn't sleep." "Where did you get the chess set?" Temari asked, pausing once more. Kyuubi and his queen captured Naruto's rook, stole it from the game room downstairs. "Oh," Temari merely sat there a while. After slowly getting out of bed and covering herself with a blanket, she pulled a chair up to their table and watched them play in silence. There was nothing here, no one to disturb him, and the boy found himself floating in pleasant darkness. He began to notice that his left arm hurt when he heard rather screechy voices all around him. "Troublesome," Shikamaru sighed as he opened his eyes. Tsunade demanded that everyone leave the room as soon as she learned Shikamaru was awake so she could give him a personal debriefing. She took a foldable chair and sat next to his bed. The Hokage said, "So you're positive that it was a fox's head that bit you?" "Yes, a red fox head," the shadow user said with a slow nod. It seemed to be a manifestation of a chakra. Although Tsunade was impressed, Shikamaru was the most perceptive and lazy person she knew, so if he claimed it had been a fox, it absolutely was. That meant something to her. She turned to Shizune, who was waiting, and slowly left the room, saying, "Naruto's status has been upgraded to that of an S-class missing.nin. The northern gate was attacked by him. I want the best hunter.nin and Anbu we have on this, and Kyuubi is active enough to manifest. We cannot permit the demon to escape." The great irony, of course, is that without Naruto to provide him with chakra, the great demon fox was at that point about as dangerous as a house cat. Right now, Naruto was snoring happily in bed. Temari had woken up first, was dressed, and had briefly contemplated running for the door, but Seirei Karit's presence made fun of her, as though she were daring her to do so. After taking another look at the sword, she became curious and began counting the fox's tails, even though she knew there were more than 6. Something in Temari's memory told her, 7.8.9.9 tails, a 9-tailed fox. She looked around the room and noticed Naruto's wallet on the table, a connection she had missed and was unable to make. It was a frog. Her gaze expanded. Gaara. The frog. The fox. The girl pinned to the tree. Gaara change. Naruto Uzumaki. He must have left his village shortly after the unsuccessful attempt to save Uchiha Sasuke, which is when she last saw him. She was certain that this was the boy who had beaten her brother, the one who should have been dead, even though nearly everything about him had changed. Suddenly, Temari remembered his new name, Fushicho Naruto, a person who was reborn from the ashes of his death after being burned alive. As she watched him awake, this was the revelation that stuck with her the most out of all of them. Temari was sitting on a chair close to the end of his bed, staring at him thoughtfully, something she had never done before, and Naruto realized something was amiss the moment he woke up. The sand girl said, "I want you to promise to answer a question truthfully, with caution." Naruto simply nodded, sensing that humor would not be appreciated at this time. "How did Uzumaki Naruto actually die?" Temari asked, inhaling deeply. That had been the question Naruto had been least prepared for out of all the ones in the world, but at least, he thought sorrowfully, he knew the answer. "He died from broken dreams and a broken heart," the boy said, grinning gloomily. After a few minutes of silent sitting, Naruto slipped out of bed, put on his shoes and vest, and slid Seirei Karit onto his back. When he reached their room's door, he stopped, Temari got up, put on her shoes, and they left together. Temari would later reflect on what might have happened if she hadn't followed him that day, but she would change her mind because it hadn't been her choice. In that instant, her need to understand overcame any fear or desire to flee. So she did. Iruka looked into the mirror and the white mask that stared back at him. It had been an easy choice to put on the mask because he knew Naruto better than anyone else, so he knew that no one would be a better candidate to hunt him down. He knew that when he did find the boy, he would face difficulties. As much as Iruka hated to admit it, Naruto had planned and carried out an almost flawless fake death, one that had deceived the entire village for weeks. What was he going to do? Ask the boy to return. The issue was that such preparation was evidence that his departure had been planned rather than unplanned, and the law was not forgiving of such treason. A shinobi was to be immediately killed if they left the village in a manner that gave the impression that they had planned it. Iruka needed to speak with Naruto first because he didn't think he could handle that. When he saw Naruto, the brown-haired man would wait and make a decision after carefully taking off his new mask and massaging his face. The news that Temari had vanished in a Naruto attack was both reassuring and unsettling, and while Gaara was certain that Naruto would not harm his sister, that didn't make the idea of his sister being held captive by a Nukenin, even Naruto, any more likable. Kankuro had not taken it well at all and had gone to some trees to let out his frustration. He and Kankuro had been summoned back to Hidden Sand alone with the other Sand Nins, and they were scheduled to depart the following day, so Gaara gazed up at the sky. The sand whirled around him nervously. He didn't want to leave without Temari, but she might be anywhere. He would have to rely on Naruto to look after her, and he had better be reliable for the sake of the Fox Boy. The Hokage had sent out squads to all the surrounding towns 10 hours prior, claiming to be hunting an S-class criminal named Uzumaki, and everyone knew what that meant. Hiroshi ran through the forest with his squad in tow. The child of the demon. In addition, Hiroshi had heard that he had brought a sand girl with him, and since he had lost his brother in the war with the sand, he reasoned that he might have to engineer a small accident involving the Sand.Nin if his squad discovered them. The aforementioned Sands.Nin was shopping at the moment, and she had noticed that the sword was no longer covering the hole Naruto had made in her clothing just 30 seconds after she had left the hotel. There would be no need to restrain her, so Naruto was now carrying his sword. They had reached an unspoken understanding. She knew that if she ran, he would likely have to find her and kill her, which she knew he really didn't want to do, and she knew she didn't really want to die. Temari had never been a shopping person, mainly because she always wore the same clothes, but Naruto had insisted that she get some pants and at least one regular shirt, so she went off to buy traveling supplies with the 15,000 yen Naruto had given her to spend, mostly, as she pleased. He was the one who was paying, so she complied even though she had been growling for a little while because she loved her net shirts. 1 hour later, Naruto returned to the room to find Temari looking a little stressed, but holding a shopping bag full of clothes, while Naruto himself was carrying a big duffel. Naruto opened the bag and began taking out the contents one by one, naming them as he went. He took out a small package and tossed it to her, grinning. Some new pants to replace the pair I lost, 2 extra light sleeping bags, new underwear, magnetic chess set, whetstone, dehydrated soup, a pot, Pocky, soap, and, he said, smirking, new hair ties. It was still a little awkward between them, and Temari gave a half-hearted glare. Temari had come to terms with the futility of trying to get away, and although she knew Naruto would eventually release her, it felt wrong to be acting as though she was his prisoner and they were just 2 shinobi on a mission. She was once again giving him a thoughtful look as Naruto grew anxious. Refocusing, the boy took out his map and spread it out on the table, remembering the plan he had made the previous evening. This, he said, indicating a tiny dot on the Sound Country's eastern border, is where we are now. Naruto continued by outlining the general location of Hidden Cloud and the route they would need to take to get there, but Temari was startled by the conclusion of his speech. And when we arrive, I'm going to let you go. The kid concluded, my village will figure out my secret soon anyway, and the cloud has no hostilities with the sand, so you should be able to find your way home. Suddenly, things seemed less dire. Temari had a goal to strive for, and although it would take a week or more to reach Hidden Cloud, she could be back in the sand within a month. Since it would be 2 days before the next one, Naruto wanted to eat in town and take a bath, something he had forgotten to do the day before, even though Temari would have preferred to leave at that moment. The Nukenin and his prisoner were nearly to the edge of town when they passed a small sushi shop. The two paid the hotel manager and left immediately after dinner. Temari was given the duffel because Naruto had to carry his sword, but she constantly complained about it to irritate him. It was his lucky day, and Hiroshi grinned as he gazed at the photo in his hand on the roof above them. As soon as he passed the sushi shop, Naruto's shinobi sense began to tingle. With a comparatively calm demeanor, he pushed Temari into an alley, pulled out his sword, and spun in one fluid motion to deflect some needles that were aimed at his neck. Even hunters couldn't toss jutsus around in populated areas, so Naruto ran down the street, staying close to the buildings, and he could see 6 hunters, with 1 spotter somewhere. Leaping into the air, he spun, freeing Seirei Kurite, then landed and ran through seals, flashing along a building wall. As the enormous sword sailed past them, the hunters dispersed, but they were unaware that it had divided into 9. A hunter who attempted to engage in close combat was killed when Naruto leapt from the wall and landed on the ground in time to grab his sword and execute a spinning slice. While the other 3 hunters attempted to use their needles to strike a vital point, a second hunter approached him from behind. Naruto snorted. These weaklings were nothing compared to Haku, and he spun once more, deflecting the needles with the flat of the blade and turning it to face the hunter who had attempted to attack his rear. The second hunter fell as Seirei Kurite flashed once more. 3 hunters faced him in the street, debating how to attack, but Naruto was unhurt, save for a few needles in awkward spots. They could fight it off in a few seconds, but Kyuubi didn't need half that time, so he never gave them a chance, letting his body flow into the death stance and watching them freeze in fear. As with Choji, the sword shadow clones approached from behind, and none of them could have a chance without the added bulk of multi-size no jutsu. There had been 6 hunter.nin pieces lying in the street, but Naruto was not looking. Where was the last one? With a growl, he turned and dashed back toward the alley. It would be an understatement to say that Temari was shocked. She sat in the darkness between the 2 buildings, part of her mourning the death of the strange boy she had spent 4 days with, but also knowing that the hunter Nin's presence meant she was safe and could return home. She was offered a hand in getting up by a leaf hunter.nin who landed in front of her. She smiled pitifully and reached for it, but then saw a glint in his other hand, which caused her eyes to widen. The hunter was hiding a knife and slowly drawing the arm back for a stab. When a player puts his opponent's king in a position where he dies regardless of what he does, he wins the game of chess. This is contrary to the popular belief that a player wins when he kills the opponent's king. Temari still had 1 move left. Temari tripped the last hunter and slammed a kunai into his face, causing the mask to split just long enough for the man to whisper, "Sand bitch," and fall, blood dripping around the knife protruding from his forehead. Naruto arrived just in time to witness this. As Temari fell, Naruto hurried to her aid. The squad's spotter was racing back to tell his superiors that she had just killed a leaf hunter, one who had been sent to kill a Nukanin she was traveling with. She would be classified as a missing nin within 24 hours. She had been anticipating seeing her village in less than a month, and she was alive, even though she was unlikely to see them again. Naruto sat, drenched in blood, and held her while she sobbed because he was at a loss for words. As Naruto built a fire to cook a dish of dehydrated rice he had picked up, Temari sat against a tree, her arms around her legs, her eyes gazing into space. Despite having been up for over 24 hours and running for 16, neither of them felt like sleeping, and they were both in a peculiar state. Once the fire was finally started, Naruto went over to sit next to Temari against the tree. He took a stick of Pocky from the package he kept in one of his shuriken holsters and began to slowly eat it. "Did you know," he said to the girl, "that the 3rd Hokage once prepared fried rice for me?" Temari said nothing. He went on to say, "Since then, I've learned that a person's diet greatly influences their personality. Fried rice, which is essentially composed of healthy ingredients but is fried in oil to make it slightly sinful, appealed to the 3rd. As he continued, Temari glanced over at him. "You don't know Iruka, but she always joined me at a stand to eat ramen. Ramen is inexpensive, hot, and satisfying. Iruka was always that way. He showed everyone kindness without ever expecting anything in return." The majority of Temari's attention was now on what Naruto was saying. Then, Naruto said, extending his snack, "We have Pocky, who is inherently contradictory. A chocolate-covered pretzel stick. It is nearly impossible to describe because of these 2 aspects. It is neither sweet nor salty, healthy nor unhealthy, it is simply ambiguous. The first person I ate Pocky with was a psychopath who killed his family," Naruto said, taking another bite. "Additionally, it was he who taught me the life-saving techniques. Until you cease thinking in terms of good and evil, it appears impossible to reconcile these 2 points of view. Yesterday, I killed 5 people from my old village in less than 60 seconds, but I had to do it for us to survive," Naruto said, finishing his stick and grabbing another. "I don't consider myself to be good or bad. Like Pocky, I just keep on being." Temari slowly reached and took a stick out of the open pack, setting her head on her knees as she took a bite, grinning slightly as Naruto removed his Pocky from his holster and placed it on the ground before getting up and going over to check on the fire. Tsunade was tense because the shinobi were preparing to return to Konoha and the camp was being packed, which meant arranging for all of the injured to have a means of transportation home. Reaching her quickly, Shizune said, "Hokage Sama, we have another problem with Yamanaka Ino." "What is it this time?" Tsunade sighed. She was disturbing the other patients again. "All right. She does that all the time." She was explaining to another patient how horrible it was to try and find anything that looked fashionable in a wheelchair. And, the patient she was explaining this to had his face horribly scarred and both his eyes burned out by a fire jutsu. He apparently had a small mental breakdown after listening to her for 20 minutes. Tsunade made a vow, have a Chunin watch her constantly, that girl has less tact than Jiraiya in a bathhouse. Another shinobi rushed up with a scroll, which Tsunade grabbed and began to read, her face turning white as a sheet as Shizune hurried off. A leaf Chunin ran up to Gaara and Kankuro as they were about to leave, whispering something in Gaara's ear. What has our sister been? Every breathing creature within 60 feet froze as Gaara roared. He looked like a sand tornado, tearing through the camp as Gaara, who was really resisting the urge to squish someone at the moment, picked up random objects and threw them around. He assumed the Hokage would receive complaints later, but he didn't really care. Normally, his storm was restricted to picking up inanimate objects, such as tents, chairs, packed boxes of this or that, but it also picked up the occasional shinobi or small child, most of whom were not happy about being flung in random directions. Unexpectedly, Kankuro was also resisting the urge to squish someone. He nearly began detonating poison bombs as soon as Gaara informed him. Although he was not as impressive as his younger brother, Kankuro was furious and was trailing behind Gaara. Tsunade's tent was blown away by a walking sandstorm, leaving her exposed. Am I able to assist you? The Hokage inquired courteously. Why has my sister been registered as a missing nin? He asked, settling for his most threatening glare rather than squishing her. Tsunade was becoming anxious. She was reported to have killed one of the hunter nin sent to find Naruto. The whole squad less one was wiped out. And therefore, the last member must be the one who told you these lies about Temari, Gaara said, still glaring. Until I learn otherwise, I have to assume he's telling the truth, Tsunade said, beginning to wriggle. Kankuro moved forward to support his younger brother in case he needed it as the sand began to swirl more violently. Ignorant of the tension, Kakashi walked calmly between the demon boy and the Hokage, laughing to himself and reading his porn book. More than 60 people watched the copy ninja wander off again, utterly uninformed. No sand hunters will pursue her, I will see to that, Gaara snarled, claiming that Kakashi had destroyed the atmosphere. He spun around on his heels and called over his shoulder. You are welcome to discard the lives of your shinobi, smiled Gaara. He was hoping his confidence might have distracted the Hokage for a short time, but he knew that even if his ploy worked, it wouldn't last long, and soon she would use the hunter nin again. The sand user stomped away, wishing he was half as confident as he sounded. Temari didn't even have her fan, so she'd be largely useless in any difficult fight. Gaara needed to speak with Baki because, despite his limited power, he could stop the sand hunters and he could and would make the Hokage's life as difficult as possible. She sent the messenger to Gaara after the Hokage had sent Iruka the hunter's report, and now she strode purposefully into his tent to see what he thought, blushing a little as she walked in on him changing. Iruka blushed and invited her in after a minute, but things quickly became serious. Hokage. Sama, the Chunin said, before anything else, you must first promise that you will not send any other hunter squads to be slaughtered without consulting me. Tsunade nodded despite raising an eyebrow at his arrogance. Unfortunately, Iruka added, we have placed Naruto in his most perilous condition. He assumed responsibility for the sand girl when he took her, and Naruto will now hold himself accountable for her disappearance. Unfortunately, that means Naruto will stop at nothing to save her life. Although he is not desperate, he is ruthless, and no regular squad can defeat him with any real chance. Tsunade changed gears and allowed the Chunin to continue. We must first dispel some myths because Naruto is extremely intelligent and we must not undervalue him. We don't know what kinds of ninjutsu he has learned while away because, according to the report I read, he killed the hunter nin mainly using taijutsu and very quickly. In addition, where did Naruto obtain his sword? What is it used for? According to the report, the sword divided into numerous pieces and behaved as though it were under control. That needs to be investigated. Iruka went on talking, and Tsunade just stood there. Secondly, it's ludicrous to think that Kyuubi is breaking the seal. If the demon is appearing, it's to aid Naruto in battle, but we must make sure. Regarding the boy's altered appearance, Iruka took another look at the report and said, I'll elaborate later. I need this team right now, so please get these people together. Tsunade looked a little surprised as she scanned the list. But, we need those people when we go after Naruto. Otherwise, it's useless, Iruka said, nodding. He used only taijutsu to defeat 5 Chunin. He could defeat even a Junin squad with that ability in the mist jutsu he employed in the North Gate attack, but if you give me the right team, I can counter it. Oh, and Hokage. Sama, I'll need the shinobi ID photos for Gaara and Sasuke copied onto clear plastic, Iruka said as Tsunade turned to go. When everything is prepared, give me a call. You better have one hell of a presentation for us, Iruka, Tsunade said with a slight scowl. Oh, I will, he said, sadly glancing at the ground. Make sure of that. Fortunately, both Naruto and Temari had slept the night before and were not quite as exhausted, so they sat around their fire eating breakfast. Naruto was trying to convince Temari that her life was still going on, and he was winning the argument, which was bad for her village loyalty. I mean really, the fox boy was stating, how many people were even kind to you in your old village? I've heard that you've spent your entire life training and stealing from the locals. The only defense Temari could think of was that she sort of enjoyed training, so she remained silent. I realize that you miss your family, he said, but I really can't see either of your brothers condemning you for this, and who cares what the rest of the village thinks. His argument was winning Temari over, but he glared abruptly. There is, she continued, the minor issue of spending your life being hunted. Naruto sighed. Gaara scares the hidden sand way too much for them to hunt you, and as for hidden leaf, they'll give up sooner or later. Can you even remember the last time you did something fun? Naruto continued, noticing that she was bending. Not killing people, kind of fun, that is. Although you didn't request this, there are plenty of worse outcomes. Like what? Snorted Temari. Having a demon inside you, Naruto said with a smile. I really can't argue with that, can I? Temari asked, pausing to give him a quick glance. His smile turned into a, no, grin. But I'd need a new fan even if I agreed to be a missing nin, she sighed. Only in hidden sand are battle fans produced, and even then, very few are made. Naruto understood that this would be an issue, but he had strategies for handling difficulties. Wait a sec, he replied, I need to consult with someone. Naruto allowed himself to enter a meditative state, and soon he was in his own thoughts, with the chibi fox waiting for him. The fox appeared utterly delighted, and Naruto wasn't sure if this was a good or bad thing. I have a sand battle fan, a very nice one too, Kyuubi said bluntly. Naruto stated, but, of course, you want something in return. What? I naturally want a larger chakra allowance, the demon remarked, tripled. Examining the demon closely, Naruto realized that if he tripled his allowance, the demon would have access to a quarter of his chakra. Deal. The boy said, how can we win your fanship? My storage area requires a gate to be summoned. It's a fairly easy jutsu that just takes a lot of chakra, and there's an additional issue. That being, Kyuubi stated, I must perform the jutsu myself. Why? Naruto asked, casting a suspicious glance at the demon. The user must be aware of the proper seals, or the address, as it were, of wherever they're going because the jutsu cuts through space. I'm not granting you carte blanche to plunder my antiquated treasure trove whenever you please. I do the jutsu if you want the fan. Simply drive the sword into any vertical surface, enter the gate, pick up the fan, and leave. Fine, Naruto replied, but if I get the slightest feeling of being tricked. Temari was staring at Naruto strangely as he returned to the real world, letting the threat linger in the air. Naruto explained, I was talking with my sword, he has a way to get a fan for you. As Temari asked a question, he strolled through the forest, searching for a suitable surface. Anyway, who's in that sword? Is there a shinobi who was caught using a sealing jutsu improperly? Still searching for a vertical surface, Naruto shook his head and said, nah, greater demon, more specifically, the 9. Tails demon fox. About 3 seconds prior, Temari had ceased her movement. The Kyuubi no Kitsune is in your sword. Yeah, it used to be in my stomach, but a forbidden jutsu used in the forging of my sword changed that, Naruto said, giving her a strange look. Why? It seemed like having a greater demon in your sword was something to make a big deal out of, but Temari really couldn't think of a reason why. Let me clarify. Does the demon fox have a fan that I could use? You can have it, I'm giving him more chakra in exchange, said Naruto, shaking his head. And just where is this fan? Temari questioned doubtfully. As he discovered what he needed, a big rock that had been split in half, leaving a flat surface, Naruto held out his hand to silence her. He slammed Seirei Kurite into the rock and saw it begin to glow before the sword sank into it and a black doorway emerged. Temari's jaw hung loosely as Naruto confidently entered what seemed to be a large room with white walls, filled with, well, everything. Naruto reasoned that a huge fan couldn't be difficult to find, and a few moments later, he pulled it out from beneath a stack of scrolls and what appeared to be a gold statue of an unidentified shinobi. A few minutes later, Temari remained motionless as Naruto came out the door with a big fan, turning as the door closed behind him, and Seirei Kurite seemed to emerge from the darkness until the door vanished and the sword was exactly where Naruto had slammed it. After removing his blade from the rock and placing it back on his back, he gave Temari the fan. It's amazing, he commented, how useful a demon can be sometimes. Tamari didn't pay attention. What he had just given her left her speechless. Tamari had been using a simple battle fan for years, but she had never received a new one and had never voiced any complaints. The fan she was holding now was a master's fan. Nothing looked much different from the outside, but when Tamari opened it, she knew. The fan was a good foot longer than her previous one, and the frame was made of dark metal. The fan opened with a very slight movement, and even Naruto paused his rambling to admire it. Tamari had no idea what the pattern painted on would be, but all the master fans were painted to look as though they were lighting the air itself on fire when they swung. The fan was painted to resemble a sunset, with every inch of it being full of reds, purples, and pinks that made it look like the real thing. She had never seen anything so magnificent. Naruto returned to his thoughts about the various applications of possessing a demon after his moment of admiration, which is why his brain shut down a few moments later. Naruto was not accustomed to full body contact, and he had never done so with a girl, but that was definitely what was happening now. His eyes told him Tamari wasn't where she had been standing a moment ago. His ears only heard breathing. His nose smelled soap. His sense of taste wasn't receiving anything, but that was more than made up for by touch. He unconsciously noted that in addition to all the things mentioned above, he was also immobile. To put it another way, Tamari was hugging him. Tamari was laughing uncontrollably while sitting in the forest with her new fan in her lap. Naruto raised an eyebrow as he glanced over from where he was preparing dinner. The boy asked, "What's so funny, exactly?" Tamari was attempting to control herself. "In our village, giggle. There's always been the legend that windmasters could ignite the air. I always thought, snicker, that it was because their fans were painted to look like it." The kanji for Kei's Nenshu no Justu was the first carved words on the inside of the frame when she began to laugh once more and held up her fan for him to see. The method of burning winds. Tamari glanced at Naruto. There are only 3 fans like this in all of Hidden Sand, and they never make more. There are over 40 wind users who are Junin level and only 3 of them know the jutsu I just read over. I've spent 9 years training with my battle fan, 300 swings a day, and learned a few low and mid-level skills. In the first week I spend with you, I find what's probably among the most powerful wind jutsus in existence. Tamari wasn't sure what she thought of this new insight after saying it, but Naruto simply shrugged. "So, my strength has at least doubled in the couple months it's been since I left Konoha. It's to be expected of missing nins." Observing Tamari's interest, he went into further detail. The idea of a hidden village is that it teaches a certain set of skills, which it keeps secret. For example, mist jutsus aren't taught in hidden leaf and fire jutsus are rarely taught in hidden mist. This means that people are very limited in what they learn. Nuknins, on the other hand, have no such restrictions. He kept going, checking the food along the way. "The sword I use is a mist sword. No one in Leaf uses such weapons, but I do because it suits me. I know that you love your fan, but I can and intend to teach you every jutsu I know. It's a sharing of resources, and it's what makes missing nins so strong." Tamari nodded. Even though she found the concept of learning foreign jutsus strange, it made a lot of sense. Naruto removed the food from the fire after noticing it was done and took a seat beside Tamari's fan. He had an idea from his own words. "How long," he inquired, "will it take you to learn that fire jutsu written on your fan?" Tamari paused for a moment, assuming we spend most of each day traveling, about a week to be good enough to use it, but completely mastering a jutsu like this takes years. After searching through the scroll pouches on his vest for a while, Naruto eventually located what he was looking for and gave it to her. The old barber had given him the scroll of basic stealth jutsus from Hidden Mist. "I want you," he stated, "to learn the first jutsu in that scroll, Mizu Gyoshuku no Jutsu, water condensation technique. It's a basic jutsu used to help people learn Kirigakure no Jutsu. It supersaturates the air around you with water, like on a very humid day." "And why am I doing this?" Tamari inquired. Naruto began eating in between bites. "I have an idea, but I won't say anything else until I see this burning winds technique of yours. More importantly, if we move at a steady pace, I expect the next hunter squad to catch up to us in just under 2 weeks. I want to be ready for them when they appear." Nibbling on his rice for a moment. "They won't make the same mistakes as last time, they'll be far better prepared, and there'll probably be more of them. All this means that not only will I need your help this time, we need to plan in advance." The two spent the evening conversing after Tamari put down her fan and got herself some food. Tamari's thoughts were racing by the time she tucked her fan into her sleeping bag and climbed in beside it. She had just made the decision to assist in ambushing a group of her nation's allies. the leaf.nin. After this, there would be no doubt about her status as a Nukanin. That thought, for some reason, didn't bother her nearly as much as it ought to have. Tsunade dispatched a messenger to Iruka while the Leaf Army prepared for the night. At last, she had made arrangements for all the people he required to be transferred. The first group briefing for the 7 shinobi she had temporarily moved to the Hunter.nin was scheduled to begin in 10 minutes. Iruka strode into a tent full of mostly bewildered faces when the appointed time came. Iruka seized the initiative right away. He yelled, "Everyone, shut up," and the group fell silent. "As some of you know," he went on, "you are here because you have been temporarily put under my command for a very important mission. That is to find and incapacitate Uzumaki Naruto by any means necessary." After a few people gasped a little, Iruka continued, "I want each of you to tell me, now, why you've been selected for this team. You need to understand that before anything else, go from right to left." The figure stood on Iruka's far right. "I am here," said Morino Ibiki, "because I am the best personality analyzer in Konoha. My purpose is to study the target's movements and figure out what he'll do next." After doing some research, Iruka found that Ibiki had contributed similarly to the search for Uchiha Itachi. Ibiki took a seat, while the other person stood. "I am here," Hyuga Neji said, "to act as a scout for the squad." Iruka was happy with the response because he had been worried that the Hyuga would begin talking about fate. Shikamaru added a grumble for effect, and the third member stood up and said, "As troublesome as it is, I am here to strategize, and because I'm the only one to see Naruto's powers of manifestation." As she finished, Anko grinned and said, "I guess I'm here because I'm somewhat experienced with the habits of S-class criminals." Iruka filled in because the fifth member appeared to be lost. "Tenten is here," he stated, "because she has by far the most experience with weapons, and as of now, we know nothing about the sword Naruto carries or how to counter it." Putting his book away with a casual demeanor, the sixth member said, "I guess I'm here because Naruto was on my team, so I know him pretty well, and of course, because I'm a Junin." Every Genin and Shunin scowled. Kakashi simply grinned beneath his mask. "Tsunade. Sama has sent me to act as the squad's medic and her representative." Shizune swiftly sat back down as the seventh member stood, appearing only mildly uneasy. Iruka looked around his group. Though he knew Shizune would be a valuable addition, he hadn't requested her. "First thing," Iruka said, glaring at Kakashi, "you are under my command until the Hokage says otherwise, regardless of your rank." He received several nods. Iruka had chosen to begin with a demonstration, so he took pictures of Gaara and Sasuke the Hokage, transferred them to clear plastic, and overlapped them. "Good, now on to the briefing." He held the overlaid photos up to the light and said, "We are looking for someone with almost exactly this hair color." While the others' eyes were wide, Ibiki nodded slowly. Iruka put the photos down and looked at his group. Right now, Naruto is changing, and so he looks to what he admires to see how he should change. It's a period all missing nin go through, redefining their identity, but it doesn't last forever. If we are ever going to catch him, we need to do it now, while he is relatively predictable. Iruka began to walk while he spoke. But there are complications, not the least of which is Tamari of the Sand. Initially, she was his prisoner, but we have a report stating she killed one of the Hunter.nin last sent after them, so we have no idea what to expect from her. Iruka called up different team members to clarify certain points as time went on. The majority of the team members had never heard of the accumulation of fear stimulus before Ibiki's speech about the possibility that Naruto was using it. When Tenten was asked to discuss the different ways Naruto might be controlling his swords, Anko mentioned that they should be careful not to be too forgiving of him because he had once been their friend. They would have enough trouble beating him going all out, she explained calmly, regardless of whether one of them changed their mind. Since they were departing for Konoha early the following morning, Iruka allowed them to go to bed after 4 exhausting hours. They all knew they were lacking in information, but the majority felt they had done a lot. Now, all they could do was make assumptions based on what 100.nin had said. Iruka sat by himself and rubbed his head after the tent was cleared. He knew he had to do this even though he couldn't believe he was doing it. They knew roughly where the boy was and what he was doing, so this was their best chance ever. More significantly, they knew who he was. Naruto might be a totally different person in a year. Iruka was aware that only he was capable of doing this. Not even Kakashi had the same level of understanding of Uzumaki Naruto as he did. He had to keep himself from failing. Baki, Kankuro, and Gaara sat in their tent, looking solemnly at one another. Kankuro gave his Junin teacher a sly smile and said, "Go fish." Baki muttered a curse because he was certain Kankuro had a 2. He looked at his hand again and pulled out the 4 of clubs. it didn't appear promising. Bucky said, "Gaara, do you have any fours?" in an attempt to gamble. As he handed over his 4 diamonds, the red-haired boy scowled. After hours of evil planning, the 3 were now unwinding with a game of Go Fish. They planned to slow the hunt as much as they could, even though they knew that was the worst they could do. Gaara had already completed the first act by using his sand to steal every Hunter.Nin mask in the camp and concealing it in a bag. Then, in the forest, he discovered a hornet's nest in a tree and blocked it with the bag. A rather unpleasant surprise would be in store for whoever took the bag out. The following morning, Naruto awoke with a feeling of purpose. He made the decision that they would spend the day in a small city that was just 3 hours away. It seemed to him that they both needed a little time to have fun. Naruto didn't want to get too far ahead of the hunters, and they had made great progress over the past few days and were ahead of schedule. That might have sounded strange, but he needed to know when the Hunter.Nins were approaching because of his plan. If they had escaped at first and the hunters were unable to locate them, he had no idea when the masked shinobi would locate them again. Temari was just waking up when Naruto began packing up camp. Naruto turned his back as she exited her sleeping bag, as had become their habit, and resumed his previous activity after about 15 seconds. Before long, the two were running, and at about 11 o'clock they reached the city's edge. As usual, finding a place to stay was the first priority. In order to practice on the roof without being noticed from the ground, Temari recommended a tall hotel. After Naruto gave his consent, they were given a room. Both of them hurried back to the roof, where Naruto counted their money and Temari practiced Mizu-Gyoshuku no Jutsu. Even though they were still wealthy, they would need to find employment fast because their funds would run out either before or as they got to Hidden Cloud. Temari, meanwhile, was struggling with her practice. It took a while, but she was able to collect water in the air around her. She estimated that it took her around 30 seconds to finish the jutsu. The other issue was that she would swear Seirei Kurite was glaring at her, and her clothes were soaked through. As usual, when she turned around, the sword was simply sitting on the roof next to Naruto, even though she was just beginning the jutsu and had a really unsettling feeling running down her spine. Kyuubi was smiling to himself inside the sword. After 14 years in prison, he had noticed that he was more easily amused, but he didn't mind. The demon would always appear with a small portion of his head whenever Temari turned her back, long enough to gaze at her before she began to turn and the demon let go of the manifestation. This continued for about 20 minutes before Naruto became aware of it and told the fox to stop right away because Temari was beginning to exhibit signs of mental instability. After completing his financial assessment, Naruto got up and stretched. The boy said, "You up for a taijutsu spar?" to the still, angry Sand.Nin. Naruto looked at Temari's fan anxiously as she nodded suddenly and moved it into the ready position. "You do realize," he continued, "that taijutsu means no wind blasts. I seriously doubt the hotel would appreciate a hole in its roof." Temari simply ran, swinging low, attempting to take Naruto's legs out from under him without even bothering to answer. In an attempt to try something new, Naruto sent Kyuubi an image and used his sword to block the fan. Temari anticipated that her attack would be stopped, but she was not prepared for the counterattack to take the shape of a glowing claw. She just dogged the demon's swipe as she threw herself back. That was essentially how the spar went on. The demon and Naruto were coordinating, but the sand girl was frequently able to block Seirei Kurite if she anticipated it. Kyuubi was totally unpredictable because he could appear at any time from anywhere on the sword. Temari narrowly avoided Naruto's blade throw in the last experiment, but she ended up flying through the air. The flying blade had materialized as Kyuubi, who seized her ankle. Kyuubi simply flew in a full circle, releasing Temari so she fell into Naruto, causing both ninjas to sprawl, because letting go would mean dropping her. While Seirei Kurite, brimming with self-satisfaction, embedded itself in the roof, they attempted to untangle themselves. After deciding that was enough sparring for the day, the two returned to their room at around noon and began planning their lunch. To Temari's mild surprise, Naruto changed into one of his t-shirts. What was even stranger was that he instructed her to do the same with her fan while leaving his sword in the room. "I really don't like the idea of walking around unarmed. I just got the fan a couple days ago and I'm still getting used to it. Seirei Kurite will watch the room and make sure nothing happens to your fan," Naruto said, smiling, dismissing her worries. "We are going out." At this point, Temari showed off her skill at simultaneously looking ashamed and furious. It's a delicate mix of narrowed eyes and a slight flush. After assuming she would ask why, Naruto simply took her hand and left the room. 3 minutes later, Temari's grievances and inquiries had been forgotten as the two strolled down the street. She inquired inquisitively, "So, where are we going, exactly?" "It's a surprise. I don't like surprises, tell me." Naruto paused his pace and turned to take a closer look at her. Suddenly he narrowed the gap between them and put his arms around her neck. After a little tinkering, he removed her forehead shield and smiled as he slipped it into his pocket. Temari glared after remaining motionless for a few more seconds, but she saw that he was also missing his own. Naruto sighed, "We won't need to be shinobi today, so there's no need to advertise that we are shinobi. Next time, tell me." Temari glared further, "I'll do it." Naruto continued to smile as he shrugged once more and said, "Okay." It wasn't until they got there that Temari realized she had forgotten to ask where they were going. The maid was vacuuming the floor back in their hotel room when she jumped and screamed. She would swear that someone had just pinched her, even though no one else was in the room. The Konoha camp was in disarray elsewhere. Since this morning, there had been no fewer than 7 incidents, and Tsunade was becoming quite irritated. It all began when two Hunter.nin approached her to report that their masks were missing. Soon after, it was discovered that every mask was gone. After an hour of searching, the bag of masks was dropped at her feet by a squad stung by wasps. Since then, several shinobi have discovered tiny stinging animals in their shoes. A group of genin was lost in the forest. 3 patients were traumatized in the hospital by Ino's constant whining, and a group of people had become ill from food poisoning. Despite the lack of evidence, the Hokage was certain that the 3 sand shinobi in front of her had something to do with all of these incidents. Baki, Gaara, and Kankuro stood there grinning broadly and without any hint of ill intent. Tsunade had contacted the 3 present to talk about Baki's request that the squad stay in Konoha to keep an eye on Temari. Related developments. For political reasons, she was unable to say that the 3 were only going to interfere with the hunt. Just as she was about to come up with an excuse to turn Baki down, she saw water on the floor and a chunin rushed into the room. "Hokage. Sama, you won't believe this, come look outside." Tsunade gasped as she hurried out of the tent, sensing the urgency. The field was rapidly becoming a swamp, with 8 inches of water covering the entire camp. This wasn't one of their many schemes, and none of the 3 sand ninjas had the authority to do this, so they were just as shocked by what they saw as the Hokage. The leader hurriedly kneeled in the mud and delivered his report as Anbu abruptly dropped around them. "It's some type of unknown water jutsu that brings water from underground rivers and springs to the surface. We sensed a large chakra signature, but when we arrived at its location the jutsu was done and there was no trace of the user. We did, however, find this." Tsunade opened a sealed note that the Anbu commander had given her. "To Hokage, since I have been here for 5 hours and no one has noticed me, I just wanted to let you know that your security is a little slack. I've left you a gift to remind you to be more perceptive, but I was hoping for a good fight. I hope you're keeping your scrolls and robes in a waterproof bag." Itachi, a drawing of a cloaked figure making the peace sign, was in the margin. Tsunade crumpled the note in her hand and swore. She peered out at the shambles that, just hours before, had been a well-organized military camp. Since practically everything would need to be washed, they would need to locate the closest river and set up camp there, which might take a day or 2 before the main force could leave again. An army had just been delayed by 2 to 3 days by one man. Then she said, "I know it's hopeless, but search the area just in case Itachi decided to hang around. Other than that, everyone salvage what they can from the mud." The 3 sands decided that her statement also applied to them and slipped out the other side. Gaara noted that she needed to locate and master that water jutsu. Temari strolled through the street fair with great excitement, taking in everything. In hidden sand, open stores and stands didn't really work because windstorms were too strong. Ignorant of the afternoon heat, Naruto simply followed her slowly as she hurried from stall to stall. Although Naruto had always loved such locations, he had only ever summoned the courage to attend a Konoha festival once. Before someone recognized him and a small riot broke out, it had been the most amazing night of his life. Fortunately, this time there was only an enthusiastic girl and no riot. For a brief moment, Temari paused to gaze lustfully at the wares of an elderly woman peddling elaborate fans. Despite their average size, they were nonetheless stunning. However, she was quickly distracted by a stand selling mini donuts. She searched for Naruto after realizing she was broke. Temari hurried over to the boy as he was strolling down the middle of the walkway. "I need money for mini donuts." "Why?" As though it were clear, Temari stated, "Because I've never had mini donuts before." With a sigh, Naruto gave up his wallet and said, "You can spend 3,000 yen, no more." While Naruto fingered the cash in his pocket, Temari ran off to buy snacks. For 4,000 yen, the elderly woman's fans were sold. He had 4,300 yen. A lot of money was involved. When he had given her the master-level battle fan in the forest, he recalled how her face had brightened. After all, money wasn't all that important. The two of them were leaving the street fair with Temari practically bouncing. She was a little tipsy and on a sugar high, which was very unusual for her, and was brought on by 4 bags of mini donuts and an excessive number of free sake samples. From a distance, Naruto was trailing her, appearing a little frustrated. Giving Temari the fan he had purchased for her was about all he had done in the previous 2 hours. It was worth the money just because she loved it, but Naruto wished he had given it to her sooner. You see, Temari had already realized that she had no reason not to use wind jutsus with a smaller fan. Add that to her temper, the fact that she was only mildly intoxicated, and a sugar high, and you have a pretty dangerous girl. She had already threatened a stallkeeper, claiming that he had deceived her, even though she had missed her target. Naruto stepped in before a minor windstorm interrupted the fair, and the man had no idea why the odd young woman was waving her fan at him. The decision was made to return at that point. The two were now making their way back to their hotel on foot, but Temari was constantly sidetracked by random objects in the area. She was just moving very slowly, not that she wasn't moving at all. At last, Naruto resorted to the same strategy he had employed to persuade her to leave the room in the first place. He simply grabbed her hand and got going quickly. Temari eventually began to relax, and she took Naruto's hand a few blocks away from the hotel. Temari returned to the room by herself and collapsed onto her bed, covering her head with her hands, after Naruto declared he wanted to go for a run when they got there. She didn't understand. In reality, her whole life had been a fairly straightforward procedure. Theoretically, her life should have continued with a flawless mission record until she became a Junin and a lifetime of service to her village, since she had attended the academy and become a shinobi. She had only really had to deal with 4 men on a regular basis in her entire life. Baki, whose 2 passions in life were playing Go Fish and being melodramatic, Temari ignored. Gaara, who had been insane for the majority of her life and whom she had mostly been afraid of. Kankuro, whose primary pastime was rattling her. And her father, who was an ass, whom Temari ignored. Now she was in a position where she had to plan for a new life and deal with a new person. Despite her best efforts, Naruto remained a mystery to her. He was unlike anyone she had ever encountered. She had been terrified of him at first, but her fear was fading more quickly each day. He grew more human, the more she considered it. She had never experienced any harm from Naruto, quite the opposite, actually. He had always been generous and kind. She argued that he was to blame for her initial situation, but she didn't think most kidnappers were as kind as him. Despite everything, though, she had never been able to get rid of the image of her first encounter with him on the battlefield, his eyes blazing with an inner fire that left her paralyzed with fear. However, it was equally impossible to forget how sweet he had been just this afternoon. Picking out that fan for her, never complaining, and always giving her praise when she won a game. Temari rubbed her temples. She was getting a headache from all this contemplation. Baki sat rigidly, staring at his opponent across the table with unblinking eyes. Undaunted, Gaara stared back, his entire body motionless. Between them sat the moderator, Kankuro, holding an unopened deck of cards. Every championship match started with a brand new deck. Additionally, it was customary for each player to wager a personal item. Baki set down a katana that had been in his family for 3 generations. Gaara placed his special edition of Icha Icha Paradise, the motion picture, on the table, determined not to be outdone. Baki's gaze expanded. Indeed, the stakes were very high. After carefully unwrapping the cards and shuffled them, Kankuro began dealing slowly. As the tension increased, Kankuro positioned the deck in the center of the table and both players had their hands ready. "Go, fish," the puppet master said, raising his hand and bringing it down dramatically. Naruto took off running. He was thinking back because his afternoon with Temari had brought back memories of earlier times. Of another afternoon spent with someone who, in spite of the difficulties they were facing, had the ability to smile so brightly. He pondered absent-mindedly what it was that enabled Temari and Haku to do that. He quickly found himself lost in his thoughts, as usual. Kakashi had begun lecturing Zabuza about how his goals were too dangerous, and that no shinobi should behave in such a manner while Zabuza stood motionless. Zabuza chuckled, "I don't give a damn, I fight for my ideals, and that shall continue." It was a declaration from someone who, deep down, knew he had lost, but the mist demon had never given up. As Naruto ran through the city, Tears began to fall from his eyes for the first time in months. He recalled it as though he were still there, half dead Zabuza facing a horde with only a kunai in his mouth and fighting valiantly to preserve his beloved's memory. The boy abruptly stopped allowing these gloomy memories to wash over him. After several minutes of running, Naruto found himself on a bridge overlooking a river in motion. Abruptly, he took out his forehead protector and looked at it. The kanji for demonic mirage was staring back at him, and everything was exactly as it had been when he had changed it months earlier. He became aware that he had erred in judgment at that moment. Since leaving Konoha, he had been concerned about whether he could carry on Zabuza's legacy and if he was deserving of wielding the demon's sword. As he stood on that bridge, he came to the realization that he had been mistaken to believe that Zabuza's greatness was due to either of those factors. As long as he was strong enough to defend his beliefs and the things that were important to him, it didn't matter how strong he was. Haku and Zabuza both died without regretting their attempts to live that way. Watching as his forehead protector dropped and landed with a small splash in the water, Naruto let it go. According to Kakashi, being a ninja means more than just standing up for your beliefs and the people you care about. Naruto didn't want to be one if that were the case. Refreshed, he turned slowly and walked back toward the hotel. He smiled like Temari and Seirei right. He was strong, and he had someone valuable to keep safe. Baki felt hundreds of eyes on him and struggled to keep his cool. The Hokage had interrupted their game shortly after it had begun, and since Tsunade was instantly captivated by gambling, everyone searching for the Hokage had gathered at their tent. As more people wanted to watch, the tent was soon taken down around their ears, but the game had continued without interruption. The game was more than half over, both players were being cautious, and Gaara had a one-pair advantage. There were more people there, some standing on chairs to look over the crowd. The song, Eye of the Tiger, was being played by a chunin who had set up some enormous speakers somewhere in the crowd. Gaara, do you have any fives? Baki boldly asked. Before Gaara slowly withdrew a card from his hand and handed it to the crowd, everyone held their breath. Everyone cheered and clapped, eagerly anticipating Gaara's next move. Iruka was worrying somewhere else in the camp. Too many delays meant that his team would have to begin the hunt right away, without first going back to Konoha. Time was of the essence, but this was highly unusual. Without consulting Tsunade, Iruka had taken the initiative to call a group meeting and instructed his team to prepare for departure in 4 hours. The issue now arose. Iruka would have to give the Hokage a detailed explanation of why he was disobeying her and breaking the rules. He had to make her understand, though. This was their only opportunity. Naruto had just returned to the hotel when Iruka made plans to leave. From her prone position, Temari's first observation was that he appeared more energized than he had been before he left. There was a little more fire behind his eyes. He smiled. I hope you're enjoying your break. Tomorrow, we leave the city and train. Train? Shouldn't we be putting more distance between our pursuers and us? Temari asked with a doubtful expression. Naruto nodded. Running is mostly pointless, they will find us eventually, and so we'll travel only a few hours a day and devote ourselves to training. Naruto then went to his bed and collapsed on it. The two lay motionless, enjoying the fact that they could finally unwind, at least for the time being. Baki was proudly holding Gaara's special edition tape above him as he stood in the middle of a cheering crowd. After 8 days. Through the forest, Hyuga Neji ran. Since leaving the Konoha camp, they had not stopped traveling, and it was thought that they would soon locate their target. It was his responsibility to make contact, even though he knew the others were somewhere nearby. He was then expected to fight as long and as hard as he could. He only agreed to the task because he had faith that his team would fulfill their end of the bargain. Even though Neji knew what his role was, he didn't enjoy it. In the forest, Temari stood behind Naruto, her hands guiding his through strange movements. It intrigued her that something so familiar to her could seem so strange to someone else. The speed at which Naruto picked up jutsus was also somewhat astounding to her. Although he was a little awkward, he held the enormous fan with assurance. Whereas it had taken her 3 months to learn the fundamentals of Kamaitachi, it only took him 7 days. Temari felt weak. However, she was far more powerful than she had been at the time of her abduction. She had made quick progress with Kei's Nenshu no Justu, and now she could turn the slicing winds into something hot, if not scorching. At Naruto's request, she also kept up her practice of Mizu Gyoshuku no Jutsu, which she had mastered. Temari jolted back to reality as Naruto paused in his motion. Since his hands had slipped, she put them back where they belonged and stepped back, saying, "Try it again." With a nod, he resumed the gestures. Tamari had explained that without at least a passing familiarity with the taijutsu associated with the enormous weapons, it was impossible to attempt using a fan in combat. As always impressed, the Sand.Nin turned to watch Kyuubi's practice. Seirei Kurite was encircled by trees and stuck in the ground. Using as little chakra as possible, the demon was attempting to materialize and destroy the trees that were farther and farther away. If there was one thing the demon detested, it was weakness, which is why Kyuubi had been practicing with Naruto or alone virtually non-stop. The boy and demon together were even more amazing than the sight of enormous glowing red appendages tearing up a forest. After practicing synchronizing their thoughts and perceptions, the two were now able to see into each other's minds to some extent. As Tamari approached her archenemy, the water balloon, all of these ideas went through her head. She had been given this practice to do that afternoon. She could now see why she had felt anxious when Naruto had smiled so broadly while outlining her plan of action. It simply refused to break. Although she was able to use her chakra to spin the water, she was never able to produce anything like Naruto's pulsating and exploding effects with such minimal apparent effort. She was, to put it mildly, annoyed by it. When he eventually got the motions perfect, without faltering or hesitating once, Naruto yelled. When he turned to face Tamari, he saw that she was glaring hotly at the tiny object she was holding that was filled with water. He wanted her to at least begin practicing even though he knew she lacked the chakra capacity for a full-fledged Rasengan. When he had promised to teach her everything he knew, he had meant it. "Nay, Tamari, supper sounds good right now. You done practicing?" Naruto asked, casting a quick glance up at the sky. When Naruto got his sword back, Tamari threw the balloon violently against a tree. That sounded like a yes to him. They walked the short distance back to camp after he handed her fan back. The boy inquired, "So what is it today? Dehydrated rice or dehydrated rice?" "Hard choice," mumbled Tamari. Humming to himself, Naruto simply picked up a pot and began the 5-minute walk to the river. His hand went straight to the blade on his back when he got there. He was being watched. Naruto turned to the left and saw a pair of hateful white eyes staring at him. He took his hand off the handle of Seirei Kurite slowly and said, "Yo, Neji. I was wondering when someone would show up. I was told not to confront you if we met, but I don't need a team to beat scum like you, Byakugan," the Hyuga said, his glare growing even more intense. "That's a little arrogant, isn't it? But I'll tell you what, since you're going to be so brave, I won't even remove the sword from my back. That should make it at least amusing," Naruto said, smiling as the veins exploded around Neji's eyes. As he charged, Neji's anger nearly boiled. Neji's speed had increased significantly, and Naruto had to exert some effort to avoid the Hyuga's initial blows. Before long, the two were trading blows steadily. Since Neji was only throwing regular punches rather than his soft fist, Naruto was beginning to grow a little alarmed. Naruto leapt back and chose to do what he always does, assembling a small army of shadow clones and directing them to launch an attack. The ensuing altercation wasn't particularly noteworthy. In a methodical battle, Neji gradually reduced the number of clones until the final 5 were eliminated by a Kaden. Neji had improved significantly, he had to admit, but Naruto simply did not have the time to play with the Hyuga. Naruto could now sense the telltale chakra encircling Neji's hands as the two closed once more. This time, they were playing for keeps. Neji glared once more, barely gasping for air, and dropped into a pose that Naruto was all too familiar with. "Do you have any last words? Can we pull this off?" Naruto asked in his mind as he sent an image to the fox, knowing that Neji had the honor of waiting while he considered his next move. Following the fox's "yep" response, Naruto sensed the demon's smile. "Without killing Neji? I suppose," spread the fox's smile. As he and Kyuubi synchronized their thoughts, Naruto felt his perception expand back in the real world. "I have things to say, and I want you to remember them forever," he said, looking up at Neji. The Hyuga gave a small nod, but as Naruto assumed a position that resembled his own, his eyes grew wide. "It's over, you are within my Hake's field," the fox boy grinned. "Gentle fist style, hands of Hake," was Neji's only reply. Neji called out, "2 hands." At the same time, Naruto called, "4 hands." If Neji was taken aback when Naruto called out simultaneously with him, he was even more taken aback when Naruto managed to block 2 blows and land 2 of his own. Even though Neji was aware that no Hyuga could use the hands of Hake, Naruto was doing it, and with 4, Naruto wouldn't be able to match Neji's speed indefinitely, but he refused to be intimidated. 4, 8. As his 4 blows were deflected and 4 struck his body, Neji snarled. 8. 16. Neji was stopped again. 16. There are 30.2. This shouldn't be possible, Neji thought, a little anxious. There are 30.2. 60. 4. As Naruto landed 30.2 of his own blows and blocked all 30.2 of his body was in excruciating pain. 64. 120. 8. The greatest of Hyuga could only manage 128 strikes, and he had won. Neji had some burned tenketsu, but none of them were fully closed, and Naruto was doing the impossible by mimicking a Hyuga skill of the highest level, but there was no way to stop his next attack. When Neji said, 120, she stopped. Two red arms with evil claws emerged from the sword on Naruto's back halfway through his last blow. Demon Claw, Hake, 256 hands. Neji attempted to block, but it was unsuccessful. The demonic arms had perfect aim where Naruto missed the tenketsu, and all four arms were striking with godlike speed. When the last blow struck Neji's chest, he flew back, colliding with a tree and landing on the ground motionless. The greatest attack the Hyuga had required their enemies to be slower than them, in one place, and limited to two arms. Other than that, the hands of Hake were rarely lethal. Naruto snorted as the Kyuubi dissipated his arms. On the plus side, however, he had received his first practical test of his and Kyuubi's mind sync, and he had been impressed when Kyuubi's perception had demonstrated the capacity to provide a hazy image of the chakra systems of those in close proximity during practice sessions. They had no more time for supper, so Naruto sighed, picked up his pot, and went back to camp. He had an idea of what had happened as soon as he entered the camp. Temari was not there, and her fan, which she would never have left without, was lying by the fire. His magnetic chess set sat on the floor, with just 3 pieces on the board. A white knight pincered a black king and black queen, allowing the knight to take either the king or the queen in his next turn. The black queen must be sacrificed to his adversary in order for the black king to live. It had all been a set. Up with Neji. Temari had been taken by the bastards. They had gone too far this time, and Naruto snarled and clutched Seirei Karit's handle. He had had enough of holding back. Naruto cursed his own folly as he paced the camp restlessly. In hindsight, it was so clear that the leaf dared not confront him directly. The hunters couldn't take the chance that Temari was still merely his prisoner because Naruto was now certain that they were unaware of his relationship with her. Therefore, they had no choice but to take her and question her. The strong impulse to destroy something was resisted by Naruto. He had to maintain his composure because his opponents were intelligent. Naruto inhaled deeply and considered the circumstances. Taking Temari had several benefits for his adversary. Determining if Naruto coerced her into becoming a Nukenin or if she did so voluntarily. Analyzing what she knew about Naruto's mind and learning about his strategies and abilities. The issue was that Naruto was unsure of Temari's response. Is she going to betray him? Would she put herself in danger to resist? Would she just sit there and say nothing? He punched a tree and swore. The worst part was that he was aware that the last and most obvious reason for kidnapping Temari was to make Naruto crazy by making him wonder if the girl was dead, and sadly, it was working. He made himself remain composed. Fighting while intoxicated was the worst thing a person could do, and Temari was capable of taking care of herself. He began studying the campsite more intently now. By examining their work, he was able to infer a lot about the hunter squad. Temari had been taken aback because there had been no indication of a struggle. There was at least one Junin on the team because Naruto could personally attest that this was no easy task. He was up against someone who was either extremely intelligent or well versed in the psychology of the human mind, as the placement of the chess pieces was a brilliant psychological taunt. Naruto was speculating that Shikamaru was the one who had done the chess because of Neji's presence. By making him battle his former pals, they hoped to erode his resolve. It might have worked 2 hours ago. Neji was severely injured, and they knew that they were giving Naruto a significant opportunity to flee in any case, so they wouldn't allow themselves to be more than an hour away from his position. Assuming Temari was simply unconscious, he wouldn't consider that. He should be able to locate them in 5 hours if he moved quickly and followed a crisscross pattern. He didn't waste any more time and ran back into the forest to where he had last seen Neji. He might be lucky and locate the hunters within an hour if he focused his search there. Shizune held Neji in her arms as they ran through the forest with Iruka. After a quick examination, she was appalled and said he had to go to a real hospital right away because she lacked the means to treat him in the forest. Iruka served as both her guard and escort because he was the only person in the plan who wasn't required right away. If Naruto discovered them, Shizune would flee with Neji, leaving Iruka to cover their escape. Iruka pushed himself to move as quickly as he could, but he was still concerned even though he knew better than anyone that his team was the best for the job. Though he wished he could have been there himself, he had left Ibiki in charge. Neji's moaning startled him out of his reverie, and he turned to see the Hyuga beginning to move in Shizune's embrace. Iruka swore and accelerated his pace, determined to prevent any fatalities. Tamari woke slowly, but it was like swimming through mud to try to think. She made an attempt to move but was unable to do so, so she sighed quietly. She was sick of waking up feeling drowsy and unable to move. She didn't want anyone to know she was awake, so she kept her eyes closed and remained motionless. Although it was encouraging that she could feel every part of her body, the reassuring weight of her battle fan and shuriken holsters was absent. Unimpressed, she made a small weight shift and was shocked to discover that all of her hidden kunai were precisely where they should be. No one had bothered to search her after stealing all of her obvious weapons. She moved once more as a test and experienced a lump. Naruto had given Tamari a small fan at the fair, which she had tucked into her sash for protection. It remained. The small wood fan in her sash was obvious, and anyone who didn't bother to take a fan from a wind user, even a tied-up wind user, would have to be the most powerful or the most lazy shinobi in the world. If time was of the essence, it was reasonable to avoid wasting time looking her over for concealed weapons. An unaware Shikamaru sat gazing at clouds a short distance away. Since everyone else was out patrolling the forest, he had accepted the least demanding job. His, ostensibly, unconscious prisoner received very little attention from his mind, which was contentedly preoccupied with floating white puffs. Tamari opened her eyes cautiously behind him. She recognized Shikamaru right away, which addressed the issue of who had restrained her and neglected to search her, but it left her unsure of what to do next. Facing away from her, the shadow user was leaning against a tree and gazing up at the sky. Tamari felt a hidden kunai in her right sleeve. It would be easy for her to cut herself if she could get to it. Shikamaru was the only thing standing in her way. Tamari knew she would have to be extremely cautious and silent because she would be sunk if the pineapple-haired boy saw she was awake and learned of her scheme. With excruciating slowness, she began to move, shifting her body to allow the hidden kunai to slip out of its hiding place. At this pace, she was aware that it might take some time, but impatience could destroy her one and only chance to get away. In the forest, Ibiki and Anko stood uneasy. Despite knowing that everything was proceeding as planned, neither was able to get rid of the anxiety that accompanied waiting. At a planning table with your teammates, it seemed like a much better idea to provoke an angry demon boy to attack you. Iruka had stated unequivocally that Naruto would never desert someone he had determined was his duty, regardless of how much the boy had changed. From there, the plan made sense. Take Tamari away when the two Nupnins were apart, then let Naruto approach them. Tamari had been captured by Kakashi, and everything had been going according to plan until Shizune showed up at the meeting spot carrying Neji's shattered body. All of them had thought Neji could at least compete with Naruto for a short while. They had been mistaken. With only one person left to protect Tamari and 4 individuals divided into 2-man teams on the hunt for the Fox Boy, they were now short 3 members. He had been totally crushed, and Neji had been on the same level as Chunin. Even the Junin were a little uneasy about that. This is why Anko was acting so solemnly while they watched the quiet forest, and Ibiki had lost his usual air of humor. They were standing back in the forest, and tension was high. Neither of them could pinpoint exactly what was upsetting them, but the disturbance was there. The mist began to form at that point. The Leaf.Nin fought the impulse to activate their signal flares right away because they wanted to be certain that the mist wasn't a distraction before calling Kakashi and Tenten to support them. Naruto held Seirei Kurite while standing composedly in the fog. He could see Anko and Ibiki, but they couldn't see him. He was unified with his surroundings and his sword. Since he couldn't see the objects around him, he knew they were there, but it was a feeling that couldn't be explained to someone who hadn't experienced it. For 20 feet in all directions, he was aware of the locations of every tree, rock, and plant. It didn't really matter that he felt rather than saw the 2 Junin in front of him moving agitatedly. They didn't know where he was, and he knew where they were. A dark inner light glowed in his narrowed eyes. Because their instincts had been refined by 100 battles, both Junin easily parried Naruto's first blow, but the boy immediately went into overdrive. He would have to put so much pressure on them that they had no time for jutsus because he knew that both Nins had far larger collections of ninjutsu than he did. Naruto had instructed the demon to concentrate on Ibiki, leaving him to handle Anko, and Kyuubi's 8 Seirei Kurite clones were already in the air. At the moment, the female Leaf Nin was performing her finest acrobatics to avoid Seirei Kurite and the Dark Boy who was wielding it as if it were a kunai. Even though Anko had anticipated the boy's strength, her current predicament was absurd. Abruptly, she spotted a gap in Naruto's defense and attacked. Naruto leapt, slashing upward with his sword as he saw the kunai aimed at his heart. Anko brought her two kunai down to block, knowing it was too late to turn back the momentum. They managed to hold for a moment, but the demonic blade was too strong for them. Seirei Karaite proceeded upward, nearly severing the left leg and leaving a deep gash in her side, while both kunai were sliced cleanly in half. Naruto would have struck her with the fatal blow after flipping the blade, but he sensed an explosion behind him. He kicked Anko out of his way as he spun in midair. Ibiki simply stood there and smiled at him. Kyuubi's spinning sword clones had completely mangled the interrogator's right side, leaving his right arm and leg in ruins, but he had a flare gun in his left hand. Ibiki kept smiling as he fell, and Naruto's eyes grew wide. Before continuing in the direction of the leaf camp, the fox boy snarled and bared his teeth while sprinting to retrieve his bag and Temari's battle fan. Unfortunately, Shikamaru had been fully awakened from his daze by the explosion, and he was now standing watchfully above while Temari pretended to be asleep. She was holding the kunai, but she hadn't yet severed her bonds, so if she moved, she and the shadow user would have to compete to see who could hit first. With one hand grabbing the fan from her sash, Temari cut the ropes on her hands and brought the kunai down to cut her leg bonds, deciding she had to take the chance. A chibi. Kamaitachi struck the side of Shikamaru's head as he was beginning the seals for the shadow bind after catching a glimpse of her movement out of the corner of his eye. Temari leapt to her feet, attempting to restore blood flow to her limbs as Shikamaru collapsed to the ground. Strangely enough, she had never considered the fact that she was now voluntarily playing the part of a missing nin in all of her escape plans. Since the flare most likely meant trouble for Naruto, Temari didn't want to waste time thinking about it and began running toward the location of the flare. The former sand nin had barely moved when she sensed two people following her. A form sped in front of her and interrupted her as she was considering how to escape. Temari realized she was in serious trouble when she found herself facing one Sharingan and one normal eye. "Why are you trying to escape?" Kakashi glared. "Because you captured me, isn't it normal to run away?" Temari simply grinned. Kakashi yelled, "Then why haven't you fled from him?" Despite her apparent confidence, Temari's mind was racing, and she had no chance of winning. She had neither a fan nor the time to plan an action. "Get ready." All of Naruto's grating remarks suddenly made sense. Kei's Nenshu no Jutsu and Mizu Gyoshuku no Jutsu were meant to be used in preparation for one another, not in combination. Ignoring Kakashi's question, she began running through the now familiar seals, willing to take a chance. Naturally, the copy ninja lived up to his moniker and began mimicking her seals right away. Mizu Gyoshuku no Jutsu was yelled simultaneously by both of them as they completed the seals. As the water began to pool, neither moved. Both were soaked in a matter of seconds, and water droplets were everywhere. Kakashi couldn't understand. When Temari began performing hand seals without responding to his question, he had been a little anxious, but the jutsu only made him wet. Temari just stood there, praying desperately that Naruto was close because Kakashi would be kicking her ass any moment now if he wasn't. Tenten fell from the trees at that very moment. Literally, the weapons master crunched to the ground and lay motionless. As he gazed at Tenten, Kakashi's Sharingan began to spin. He felt a surge of righteous rage within himself and unconsciously began the Chidori hand seals. If Seirei Karaite hadn't flown out of the trees and directly toward Temari, he most likely would have completed them as well. The girl didn't show any signs of being unnerved by the enormous sword flying in her direction. Kakashi's mind was filled with a million possibilities. Would Naruto murder her and accuse the leaf? Temari's hand reached out and skillfully caught her fan as the Seirei Karaite clone poofed into oblivion, just a few fractions of a second before the blade struck. Temari used all of her chakra in one last jutsu, using the fan's momentum to break it open and spin. Kei's Nenshu no Jutsu. Kikaki. Vaporizer. Venturing Winds method. The air was ignited, and all the water that had gathered on her body and in the air instantly turned to steam. Kakashi only managed the Oshi before he was overcome by pain and swallowed by a surge of extremely hot mist. As the copy ninja thrashed on the ground, some of the steam condensed on his body and kept burning him. Kakashi simply lay on his back and tried not to move as the air began to cool and clear. Abruptly, a shadow passed over him, and he saw a pair of deep red eyes. Without laughing, Kakashi remarked, "I suppose this is the end for the great copy ninja?" "No, there's a message I want you to take to Tsunade for me," said Naruto, shaking his head. "Go ahead," I'm not going anywhere, Kakashi said, raising his charred eyebrow. Naruto paused for a moment and began casually, as far as I know, your whole team is alive, assuming Ibiki and Anko managed to use healing jutsus before they bled to death, so you can be happy about that. More importantly, I want you to know that if I ever catch even a whiff of the scent of leaf hunters ever again, I'm going to find and kill them while they sleep. Aunt, if anyone from your village ever lays a hand on one of my precious people ever again, Naruto said with a small smile. The words, then I will go back to Konoha and burn it to the ground, shot into Naruto's eyes. Do we understand each other? Naruto asked, his eyes losing their radiance before he grinned once more. Kakashi gave a painful nod. Good, Naruto said, turning to face Temari, who had been leaning on her fan and panting. Are you ready? Temari gave a weary nod. The sun had already set, but she wanted to leave their current location as quickly as possible. The two Nukenin began running without exchanging any more words. With a hand on her chest and her heart thumping, Tsunade jumped up in bed, her body drenched in cold sweat, and she remembered nothing of the terrible nightmare she had been having. The fifth was not a superstitious person, but she would swear for the rest of her life that, as she lay in bed, she somehow knew that Naruto had been beaten. A dark sense of dread rose in her heart as she recalled that she had once read a passage from a poem that she believed perfectly captured the essence of a shinobi's life. They don't have to respond, there's no need to explain why. All they have to do is die, into the Death Valley. Road the 600. Even though she had only sent 8 people, not 600, she had sent them on a mission because she personally cared about Naruto and knew that she would never be able to forgive herself if they died. Sabaku no Gaara sat on the ground a short distance away, watching the moon, sitting cross-legged and gazing up into the sky, wondering how Temari was doing. He would be the first to confess that he had never, in fact, lavished his siblings with love, but Temari's absence had been a profound blow to him. A few days prior, the Hokage had told Gaara that you don't know what you have until it's gone, and he was finding that to be unsettlingly true. The sand moved a little as someone sat down next to him, and Gaara realized in a second that it was Kankuro without his bodysuit and face paint. The sand settled, and the two of them sat quietly, the only sound being the wind rustling through the trees. The silence was finally broken by Gaara, who said, "Are you having trouble sleeping?" Kankuro replied, half listening, no, not really. Don't you think it's quiet without her? Kankuro replied once more. How is she doing, in your opinion? Okay, I guess, she's with that Naruto kid, and he's tough as nails, replied Kankuro. That he is, Gaara said, nodding with a slight smile. So they sat quietly, each thinking about their own ideas. Around 3 a.m., Naruto decided they had traveled far enough that they wouldn't likely be discovered, so he set up the 2 sleeping bags next to each other, helped Temari into hers, stripped down to the waist, and crawled into his own before Temari collapsed against a tree in exhaustion. Since their escape from the battlefield, the two had actually not spoken, and a lot of awkwardness hung between them, with Temari feeling the need to talk despite her weariness. I wanted to, I guess, say thank you, Naruto simply appeared perplexed, asking, for what? Suddenly, Temari's anxiety gave way to disbelief, for coming to help me escape. After giving it some thought, Naruto chuckled ominously, saying, don't thank me for that. I don't care if I'm called scum because I defied my village, but shinobi who abandon their allies are worse than scum, and even I won't go that far. He abruptly turned them around so they faced one another and said, but even beyond that, you are on the very short list of people who are precious to me. As Naruto went on, if you ever want to leave, I won't stop you, but until that day, anyone who wants to mess with you has to kill me first. Temari attempted to hide her blush. Temari simply lay there while Naruto rolled back over, and a few minutes later, she began to snore, but her thoughts were still occupied by his last words. Iruka sat with his head in his hands, surrounded by his team. Tenten had only broken an arm and a leg, Shikamaru had suffered a minor concussion, and Anko, Ibiki, and Kakashi, who were all wearing so many bandages that they looked like mummies but were not in any real danger. The now stable Neji lay unconscious beside Iruka, while Shizune stood beside her as the squad's only other unhurt member. How could this happen? The brown-haired hunter asked, looking up at the crowd. How could we let this happen? He said softly. Shikamaru, who had taken it the hardest and hadn't spoken for hours, felt that the entire situation had been his fault and wouldn't accept consolation from anyone, and everyone, apart from the still. Conked out Neji, stared down at the ground. Mistakes were made, Mistakes that should be impossible for shinobi of your caliber to make, Iruka said, raising his voice as he allowed his gaze to burn into each of them. I have yet to receive a satisfactory explanation. Kakashi interrupted Iruka as he was about to yell in public, saying, I ordered that no lethal force be used. What was the abrupt drop in their brown-haired leader's voice to a dangerously low volume? Kakashi went on, once you left with Shizune and Neji, I gave Anko and Ibiki an order to refrain from using lethal force, and if they made contact before I did, to make sure that I knew before anything else. Iruka's eyes showed his rage, but his voice remained composed. And why exactly did you do that? Because I didn't want anyone to kill Naruto before I got to see him. That kind of plan needs to be approved by the mission leader, even if I had agreed. If someone had been killed, how would you have responded? I figured that as Naruto has shown a reluctance to kill people who were his friends as he grew up, and as Anko and Ibiki can take care of themselves, there wouldn't be a problem. Kakashi responded with an aggravating air, turns out I was right. But still, Iruka began to steam. You decide to make a last-minute change after days of planning, which could be the reason why our mark escaped. Kakashi looked at Iruka thoughtfully and said, that was the point. Iruka stepped back and said, you understand what you're saying. Would you mind taking Neji, Shikamaru, and Tenten to the river? I think their bandages need to be changed and their wounds cleaned, Kakashi said with a smile as he turned to Shizune. Tenten assisted in carrying Neji as they quietly departed, all of them aware of the blatant attempt to get rid of the younger team members. Iruka and Kakashi resumed their face-off after they left. You're committing treason with your suggestion, Iruka remarked while simmering. No, Iruka, Kakashi said, waving his finger back and forth, it is you who has failed to see underneath the underneath. Kakashi sat up and said, Iruka, who is the most crucial individual on this mission? A little surprised, Iruka said, obviously, the target, Naru. Wrong, Kakashi interrupted, he is just one missing nin who has no personal grudge against us. He is predictable and all he wants is to be left alone, so who is he to blame? Iruka's gaze expanded. Very good, I see you understand, said Kakashi, grinning beneath his bandages. Since Konoha is seriously threatened by Gaara's strength and influence, his sister assumes a crucial role. The copy ninja's patronizing tone irritated Iruka, but she ignored it. Kakashi went on, I had suspicions from the first time I began my surveillance in preparation for our mission, and they were later confirmed. Even though I was only able to observe their exchange for a minute or two, it was clear that the girl cared for Naruto and felt accountable for him. This became even more evident when she attempted to flee. She wanted to return and check on him, he added. I even asked her why she was returning to Naruto just to be absolutely certain, and in this instance, Kakashi held out his bandaged arms and said, actions spoke louder than words. She chooses to remain with him. Iruka didn't like the direction the facts were taking him, but he was beginning to understand. That kind of devotion is Nukenin's, so even if we had killed Naruto and taken Temari back to the sand, her and Gaara's influence could ruin relations between our villages. Kakashi continued in his lecturing voice. I won't go into what might occur if one of us had to inform Sabaku that Gaara's sister was killed while protecting Naruto from us. That would be terrible enough. As Kakashi continued, the commander was still irritated but also felt a little embarrassed about his short-sightedness. And then of course, he continued, there's the fact that we got our butts so thoroughly kicked that Naruto would have escaped either way. Iruka intervened. But I'm sure we could beat him if we used our resources better, even if Kyuubi is helping him. Maybe and maybe not, Kakashi said, nodding. Naruto's speed and coordination have greatly increased, and I'm confident that he would defeat at least a few of us before he passed away. In any case, it is irrelevant. To be honest, none of us wants to pursue him again, and we have no justification for doing so. So what are we going to tell the Hokage then? Iruka said, deflated. Ibiki intervened. We'll tell her the truth. Naruto has escaped but is not a threat to our village so long as we do not provoke him. Tsunade will like this better, so she won't argue. Are we certain that he isn't seeking revenge? Iruka nodded. He said he would attack Konoha if we pursued him first. Yes, Kakashi replied. He and Temari stay out of our way, and we stay out of his. With a resigned nod, Iruka lowered himself slightly and said, then I suppose that pretty much covers everything. The brown-haired man, who appeared somewhat disappointed, turned and waved his hand dismissively at his team before leaving. Kakashi turned after observing him for a while and said, Anko, follow him. Now is the time for Iruka to hear what you have to say. With only a slight limp as evidence of her injury, she nodded and hurried to follow the vanishing brown ponytail, mentally noting that she would get Shizune a really nice present when they got home. Iruka was sitting at the base of a tree, holding his hunter mask up to the sun and observing how the light glowed through the eye slits when Enko finally caught up to him. "So we can go home. Tell Gaara his sister is fine and thereby prevent Konoha getting stomped. Everyone is still alive, yet our fearless leader is moping about something," she said, interrupting his thoughts as she sat next to him and watched in silence for a moment. "We come all the way out here, spending every ounce of time we have preparing, and yet I," Iruka glared, pausing long enough to say, "still haven't completed my mission." "That was not what you were going to say," the brash Junin retorted, "and I'll say it for you because you're too much of a baby to say it yourself. Even though you worked so hard, you were unable to see Naruto's face at the end." "I'm not sure whether I still love Naruto or hate him," Iruka said, putting down the mask and leaning his head back against the tree. "We've always been so alike, but now he acts in this manner." Sighing, "And of course, you start to remember when you considered running away from Konoha." With a sideways head snap, he asked, "How do you know that?" "Iruka, it's much more common than you might imagine," she said, standing on the opposite side of the tree. "The majority of shinobi think about leaving at some point, and when someone does, the others fear that their allegiance may eventually waver. Naturally, I am the best example." Enko went on since there was a faint expression of interest on Iruka's face. "I was upset when Orochimaru first left, but not because he had created some illegal jutsus or betrayed the village. All that mattered to me was that he had left me, and I was devastated that he hadn't taken me with him. It has been many years since he left, and even with him dead, I feel no sense of closure," she continued after pausing for a moment to allow it to sink in. "Orochimaru used to carry me around Konoha on his shoulders, pointing out people and explaining how to learn about them based only on their actions. I will always remember that part of me. Even now, I follow his advice." "So basically what you're saying is that I'll be plagued by this for the rest of my life?" Iruka said sourly. "No, you'll likely be gloomy and depressed for a month or two, but things will quickly return to normal," Enko said, shaking her head. "Additionally, you may one day run into Naruto again on cordial terms. You talk of him as if you still like him, even after he mangled your leg," Iruka said with a small laugh. "After you've destroyed and murdered as many people as I have, you'll realize that harboring resentment has never benefited anyone," she said, letting out another sigh and placing a hand on Iruka's head. "Though I would like to see the brat try to fight me without his precious sword, stupid long weapons. It's like cheating," she muttered to herself as she got up and walked away, but Iruka didn't hear her. Iruka stood up as she was ready to leap into the trees. "So," he inquired, "did this really result in anything positive?" "Well, I will have a neat new battle scar," Enko said, smiling and forgetting her complaints. She winked at him and said, "If you're lucky, I might show it to you someday." She had been cut on her left side, from her inner thigh, up through her leg, and halfway up her side, so showing him the scar would require her to remove nearly all of her clothing. It took Iruka a few seconds to process the aforementioned statement. He turned red. It has been said that sometimes people lose sight of the wider picture because they are so focused on a single objective. Less than a day separated them from the hidden cloud, and Naruto lay on the ground, staring up at the sky, completely unsure of what he would do when he arrived. The best idea he had so far was to go around with a sign that said, "I'll do B-rank missions for food," but he thought that wouldn't sit well with the local authorities. Tamari was sitting a short distance away, studying the chessboard, and she was about to move a piece when she was distracted by a recurrent thumping sound. She concluded that Naruto had been telling the truth, and the bastard fox was good. Naruto was so frustrated that he was pounding his head against the ground, not even noticing his audience, until he heard laughter and looked up. He sounded mildly irritated as he said, "How about you try to come up with something yourself instead of amusing yourself at my expense?" With a chuckle, Tamari resumed his attempt to capture the Kyuubi queen. "Who says we have to begin mission work immediately? Why not just start off doing some odd jobs and getting a feel for the town?" Tamari asked absently while playing. Naruto sat there for a moment, trying to think of a response, but he was unsuccessful. Tamari turned to face him after observing his silence, saying, "See? You simply have too linear a mindset." As Tamari absently picked up one of her training water balloons and threw it at him, Naruto simply flopped back down and stared up at the sky, mumbling about no.it.all sand nins, realizing she was right, again. Since they didn't have passports and weren't really supposed to be there, they waited until the gate was completely closed before beginning to walk around the outside of the wall. The two reached the hidden cloud just as night was falling and the gate was being closed. After observing for 30 minutes, Naruto and Temari waited for a patrol to pass and leapt over the wall, landing silently on the other side because there were never enough guards to maintain a continuous vigil all along the wall. Finding a place to sleep was the first priority after they decided they didn't have the money for a hotel. Temari advised that they search for a training area inside the city walls, since these would typically be empty at night, and less than half an hour later they discovered just that. Naruto insisted that he needed new wrappings for his sword, so he set out to find a fabric shop while Temari went to buy food. The two Newtonans had only a moment to conceal their bag in some brush before they had to explore the entire village. It only took half an hour to get his wrappings and wrap up Seirei Kurite, so Naruto entertained himself by sitting on top of a building and surveying his surroundings as he wandered through the crowds, keeping his sword at his side and attempting to make it as subtle as a 9-foot sword can be. Hidden Cloud appeared to be just another village, with people wandering by, wearing or not wearing forehead protectors, as had been the case in Hidden Sound. After about 20 minutes of sitting and observing, he realized he had to leave and bounce back across the rooftops to their assigned sleeping area. As Naruto sat down beside Temari and picked up a cup of instant ramen, she hardly moved at all. "Water?" Grumpily, he asked. After he finished his ramen and Temari handed him a pot of warm water, she gave him a slow glance and asked, "What could have happened in the last hour to annoy you so much?" "I was just watching people," Naruto said, prodding at his still, hard ramen. "Why is it that those who are endowed with the most power are always envious of those who have no power at all?" Temari asked in a semi-rhetorical manner. Naruto snorted, "Let me give you an example. I'm in a bank when it's being robbed, and I have to choose whether or not to use my great power. My choice could potentially result in the deaths of people. By most people's standards, robbers are bad, but I'm also bad. Should I murder them? Do I assist them? What ought I to do?" Even though it was only a hypothetical scenario, Temari found herself making a concerted effort to think of a response. He watched her be perplexed for a few seconds. Whoever it was, Naruto went on, that said that power comes with responsibility wasn't talking about being spiritually bound to a demon, but the idea is still applicable. Although I didn't request my position of authority, I must make a choice under pressure and hope it's the right one. Then again, how do I even decide what right is? He asked, pausing for a moment and gazing off into space. After a brief pause, Temari shook her head slightly and said, "Well, that's enough philosophy for now. My brain hurts. How people like you and Gaara can think about these things all day and remain sane is beyond me." With a raised eyebrow, Naruto said, "Sane?" Temari suddenly realized that Naruto, who had a talking sword and played a mean game of chess, was a perfect gentleman when he wasn't killing things, while Gaara was best known for his random squishing of people and living sand. Muttering, "Never mind," Naruto began to eat his partially cooked ramen while grinning. As was customary, Naruto and Temari slept side by side. When Naruto was rudely awakened, he bumped into the slumbering sandgirl next to him, and both of them began to realize that the noise that had woken them up was actually someone talking, just very loudly. What is in this place? A young couple who are undoubtedly escaping oppression in order to elope and pursue their dreams. Oh, how inspired I am. The annoying man was still there, and it appeared that the fates genuinely detested him. Naruto closed his eyes, counted slowly to 5, and opened them again. Naruto laughed, "Who are you, and why the hell are you waking me up this early?" He and Temari were anticipating at least 4 more hours of sleep, having only been able to get a few hours earlier. "In order for my glorious students to train their bodies and minds to better burn with flaming passion," the man said, "I am Cirrus, and you must leave our field, young man. To give our great pursuit more time, we must begin before the sun rises." Temari, who was now completely awake as well, saw 3 kids standing behind the man, all of them with a slightly embarrassed and irritated expression. Naruto simply scowled. It was assumed that every village had its oddballs, but it was a mystery why they always managed to gather around him. Naruto ignored the blushing of onlookers as he climbed out of his bag and put on his vest, saying, "Fine." He gave Temari a sharp look, but she shook her head. "I don't care if this is their field, I'm not getting out of my bag with them watching." The 2 young girls were still flushed from Naruto's brash shirtless behavior when the 4 Cloud Nins, because it was clear that was what they were, instantly jumped and turned. As Temari hurried to change from her nightshirt into her normal clothes, she was struck by the surrealist effect. She was only relieved that she had taken off her forehead protector before going to bed, because only with Naruto would she be getting dressed at 4 in the morning next to the turned backs of unknown shinobi. Naruto hurriedly packed their sleeping bags after Temari was dressed, and for a brief moment, everyone just stood awkwardly. Cirrus, however, quickly banished the awkwardness with unadulterated enthusiasm, grabbing his pupils and pulling them in front of him. Unfortunately, I lose my manners. Pupils, without introducing ourselves, how could we force these people to leave their place of rest? The three of them let out a collective sigh, but the first girl came forward and exclaimed, "Nimbus, the silent rain." "Cumulus, the lightning fist," exclaimed the second girl, leaping up to accompany her. "Stratus, shinobi of 1,000 faces," the boy said after flipping and landing between them. It wasn't finished yet, though, as Naruto and Temari simply held their equipment and gazed blankly. With a sudden appearance behind his students, the obnoxious Junin pushed his finger into the air and exclaimed, "Cirrus, the human hurricane, and we are together." Cloud Team 5. The storm of righteous fury, they all cried at once. Despite the fact that Naruto had witnessed a lot in his life, he was standing there unsure of whether he wanted to remain in the hidden cloud. Following their introduction, the three pupils let out another sigh and hung their heads while their teacher joyfully applauded, saying, "Well done, you three. That's the kind of performance I'm expecting from your training today." Temari had now grabbed Naruto's arm, and the two were slowly retreating when Cirrus abruptly spun back to them, saying, "Ah, please don't leave just yet. I only ask that you share the stories of the numerous hardships that have led two driven young people like you to this point in exchange for the use of our field. Are you going to leave?" Temari pulled on Naruto's arm, attempting to pull him away as he froze for a minute, but then he had an idea, a fantastic, amazing, and evil one. "There is nothing more I would like than to share my story with future generations," Naruto grinned. Cirrus was practically beaming as he led the two Nukenin over to a log and sat down, but Temari looked at him as though he had grown another head. While Naruto and Temari sat with Cirrus on the log, Cumulus, Nimbus, and Stratus began some simple warm-up exercises. "Well," Naruto said thoughtfully at the beginning, "my story starts many years ago, when my older brother killed my whole family."
So that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel for more awesome stories like this. Thank you. See you all in my next video.